Chapter 351-375. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. I don't understand beast language. How about you try again? The only sound that could be heard was apparently Bai Zimin's voice. Those words traveled far and wide across the battlefield for all to hear, and silence reigned for several seconds. However, this silence did not last long, as it was soon broken. What Bai Zimin estimated to be approximately 120,000 goblins or more seemed to understand his words and the mocking intent behind them, as all of the small but evil green creatures began to growl and yell intangible words in his direction. Many of them even took a step forward while baring their long fangs at the same time as others slammed their weapons against the ground as if they wanted to show how angry they were. The expression on the faces of the 5 leaders of the goblin army also became contorted when they heard such words, and even the calm and seemingly always composed Gemender could not stop his aura from bursting outwards, causing all the goblins to unconsciously muffle their growls and look at him with reverence. Perhaps, Bai Zimin was unaware of how insulting his words were, since he was a human, and from his birth until only recently mankind was the only intelligent race on Earth, despite often committing stupid acts that even an ape would not commit. However, what he had just said was extremely humiliating for the goblins. This was because the goblins considered themselves to be a superior race due to their intelligence, and because from birth even the weakest goblin was already level 2. Therefore, being compared to beasts that were dumb and without any sense of intelligence, the goblins were naturally enraged beyond words. I'm trying to cooperate with you. But if you only know how to insult our goblin race, I'm afraid this place will become your graveyard, and this day next year will become the anniversary date of your death. Gemender's voice sounded extremely calm. However, in the middle of the silent battlefield his voice was clear enough for most of the living beings present to hear. Moreover, Bai Zimin could sense the hidden anger in his voice, which showed that the main goblin leader was making a great effort to restrain himself. Won't you reconsider? Gemender asked with narrowed eyes before waving his hand and letting out a strange shout towards the sky. Q. The goblins let out strange sounds from their mouths, sounds that seemed to be a battle cry before 30,000 of them charged towards the human convoy that was advancing at pitifully slow speeds. It did not take long for them to catch up, as the convoy had barely covered a little more than a kilometer. Apart from Shangguan Bingshuat, the people with the highest rank were Kong Lan and Fu Suifeng, being followed by Liu Yan, who temporarily held the position of captain. Since Liu Yan was the person with the most knowledge in operations of this kind due to the fact that he had spent his whole life as a high commander in the chain of police officers, he was usually the one who took charge. However, Shangguan Bingshuat proved that she could also command armies. Every team leader, pay attention to my order. She looked at the green goblins a little over 200 meters away, and her blue eyes flashed coldly as she calmly directed, form a star formation around the vehicles with passengers and supplies, ignore the vehicles with beast bodies and forging materials. Focus entirely on defense. I want every soul evolver to position themselves back to back and protect each other. Because there were many new recruits who still needed more military training, it was a bit chaotic at first and many panicked when they were surrounded by what seemed to be a sea of enemies. However, the calmness in the voice of the woman standing bravely over the dead body of a huge scaled rhinoceros made them unconsciously relax a bit, and they slowly began to adhere to the orders they had just received. The muzzles of the light machine guns and assault rifles were pointed at the goblins, while the several soul evolvers at the front held on to their weapons tightly. Many of the soldiers and soul evolvers could not help but tremble when they saw the clear difference in numbers. However, after what happened 2 nights ago, they all unconsciously believed that somehow or other, numbers were no longer so important, at least not when next to them stood monsters capable of annihilating entire armies with their attacks. Therefore, they all had determined looks even though their hands were sweating tremendously. Inside what was once a human base, Bai Zimin looked at Gemender indifferently. He did not stop the movement of the 30,000 plus goblins at all, and instead decided that it was time to get started and end this farce once and for all. Reconsider. He repeated with coldness and then replied, what am I supposed to reconsider? I have absolutely nothing to consider to begin with. On the contrary, I have a proposal to make to you, goblin. The audacity. Krier, the blue-skinned goblin who had split the building back of Bai Zimin in 2, shouted angrily. You want to offer a proposal? Don't you realize the position you're in? You fucking stupid human. Bai Zimin's eyes suddenly shifted at lightning speed towards Krier's position, and with a thought, he directly spent 70 mana points to activate blood manipulation and send a magical attack towards him. Krier's face changed as he felt the invading power causing the blood inside him to go wild and out of control. He hastily began to consume his own mana in an attempt to undercut the internal magical attack, but to his horror, he found that it was not as easy as he thought it would be. PFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFffff. Krier took 2 steps back, and his mouth opened at the same time as a strong spurt of blood flew uncontrollably from within. His eyes widened in shock as he stared in disbelief at his own blood, unable to believe what he was experiencing at this moment. Krier's magic stat was 570 points, which he figured was enough to deal with anyone below the 2nd order. Unfortunately to him, Bai Zimin's magic stat added to the treasures he carried in his body was close to 800 points. With such a large difference, it was no wonder Krier met a miserable fate despite putting up a resistance. Krier. Hey, you useless dick. Are you okay? The other 4 leaders of the goblin race had different kinds of reactions when they saw the miserable condition of their companion. Krier was in no condition to care about the reactions of his fellow goblins, let alone respond to them. He raised his head and looked at the human he initially thought was a weakling in disbelief. Who told you that you can speak? Bai Zimin looked at Krier with wide eyes like those of a person who had gone mad with rage and said in a chilling voice, I'm already lowering myself by talking to you, filthy beasts. Since it is like this, I want only the leader of the apes to speak, not some random ape like you. Do you understand my words, goblin? You. Krier felt anger bubbling up inside him. Since when had he, a glorious 2nd order goblin who could have whatever he wanted whenever he wanted, ever received a humiliation of such magnitude in his life? Even when he had been defeated by Germinder in the past for the position of the main leader, he had not felt so humiliated as he did now. If I hear a single more word come out of your filthy mouth, then I swear to you by the most precious in the world to me, which is my family, that I will rip your head off before you can even utter a second one. Bai Zimin cut him off, and the murderous intent in his heart reached its peak. The faint crimson aura around him suddenly burst out completely and in an instant reached Gemender's level, even tending to surpass him in no time if it kept going like this. Creer's expression froze and the next words he had planned to say due to his anger got stuck in his throat. Even with his arrogant personality and need to express everything loudly, he didn't dare say anything more when his bulging eyes met the human's seemingly crazed gaze a few hundred meters away. Unconsciously, Creer felt that if he said one more word his life would truly end here. How about you listen to my offer now? Bai Zeman decided to completely ignore all the goblins and focused on the main one. As he looked at Germinder, who was obviously the strongest goblin among all those present, he said in a calm tone of voice, you and the 4 beside you can leave together with the First Order goblins. In return, the unclassified goblin army must surrender and become slaves to my human race. How's that? That's not a bad deal, hey. The reason why Bai Zeman was willing to let the 5 Second Order goblins go was not out of fear, he was confident that sooner rather than later they would all end up falling at his feet. The problem and the real reason he proposed something like this was because while he had no problems, the same could not be said for the convoy a kilometer outside the base. How many would die in this confrontation? Bai Zeman did not know the exact number, but he knew clearly that they would probably not be few. As for the reason why he proposed that the unclassified goblins become slaves was because he had witnessed with his own eyes how the lower goblins obeyed the orders of those higher up unconditionally. This also meant that if Germinder, who was the strongest among them, ordered to obey Bai Zeman, there was at least a 60 to 70% chance that they would do so despite their unwillingness. Even if Bai Zeman did not like goblins because of all the things they had probably done to many humans so far and the things they would do in the future, a cannon fodder army of over 100,000 goblins was not something he could overlook. Many things would become enormously easier for him if he could control these goblins in one way or another. Unfortunately, just like Bai Zeman, Germinder was also an extremely proud leader and fighter. Germinder had endured several times, tolerated the insolence of the human in front of him and had even proposed an extremely generous deal. However, the human in front of him not only did not appreciate his kindness, but also showed open disdain and challenged his authority again and again. Bang! A strange yellow-colored aura burst outward with Germinder's body as its core and the ground around him cracked before splitting into hundreds of fragments. The massive pressure not only caused the concrete to crack and shatter but also caused the surrounding area to start sinking bit by bit as the eyes of the main leader of the North China Goblin Army filled with anger. Last chance, human. He barked loudly, losing all previously displayed calmness. Last chance, low-life goblin. Bai Zeman retorted and his lips curved upward slightly, looking carefree. Bang. Germinder finally lost it completely and with a loud bang destroyed the entire area 10 meters around him with a mighty stomp, launching himself towards Bai Zeman like a cannonball as he slashed with his claymore ferociously. What a great pity. Bai Zeman shook his head even though his words and the wild rude grin on his face did not express the same. On the contrary, he even seemed satisfied with the goblin leader's frank reply. Germinder was not only a second-order existence, he was an extremely powerful one at that. Having reached level 87, Germinder could proudly consider himself as an existence that was at the top of the second order. Goblins belonged to a race that had a high birth rate and whose growth speed could only be considered frighteningly fast. Among them, 70% of goblins did not have much chance of even reaching the first order, forget about advancing beyond it. Therefore, the geniuses of the goblin race was something that the universe could rarely see from its birth. Let's take Germinder as an example. He was a second-order goblin level 87, only 13 levels away from reaching level 100, which was the milestone to break into the third order. This alone was impressive enough and he was probably one of the few goblins in history to have made it that far. Of course, to all this had to be added the lightning-fast speed at which all living things on planet Earth were evolving as well as the innate advantage of birth. However, there was one big problem. This problem was that even if Germinder was extremely talented and grew at surprisingly fast speeds, in reality, it was extremely improbable that he would ever make it beyond the third order. Goblins were born, developed, and evolved at much higher speeds than most humans. However, everything that had advantages also had disadvantages and the soul record was a universal existence or system that was so far considered fair. Therefore, the goblins faced a milestone that was basically impossible to overcome once they set foot in the third order. Still, considering the current Earth stage of evolution, the 5 leaders of the goblin army were undoubtedly supreme existences, this was especially so for Germinder. Unfortunately, Bai Zeman was an anomaly that should not exist, an existence that had broken all the parameters envisioned by a sixth-order existence like Lilith, the world he was born into, and even the soul record itself as it took hours to find a suitable path for him. Bang! While Germinder was moving very fast, in Bai Zeman's eyes it was actually a movement speed that he did not need to fear. However, instead of dodging the enemy's fierce incoming attack, a mysterious smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The first reveal of this chapter happened through N0v3 Albion. Germinder felt that something was wrong at the sight of Bai Zeman's smile, however, by the time this premonition appeared inside him he had already arrived right in front of the human and there was no turning back. Moreover, the bubbling anger burning inside him made it difficult to reason clearly and adhere to such reasoning. Jaaaa. Germinder bellowed at the top of his lungs and his arm muscles bulged to the max as he slashed his sword furiously downward. Bang! The ground beneath Bai Zeman's feet was crushed even before the attack landed successfully and the atmospheric pressure seemed to disappear for an instant as proof of how furious Germinder's attack was. Boom! The earth shook and without any hindrance or impediment, the huge bone claymore struck Bai Zeman's body hard and smashed him to the ground. Rumble! As he felt the earth tremble beneath his feet, Germinder's pupils constricted to the size of a needle when he heard the unmistakable sound of lightning flashing beyond him. Not good. Germinder soon realized the reason why he had previously felt that something was off. He had been tricked by the enemy. A thought flashed in his mind and without even looking back for lack of time he shouted, Creer, behind you. Creer might be arrogant but he was definitely not a mental retard incapable of comprehending what was happening before his eyes. Watching as the body of the human he hated to the marrow of his bones decomposed into nothingness, he had already realized that Germinder had failed to restrain the first-order human and his animal instinct warned him that his life might be in mortal danger. Hearing Germinder's warning cry, Creer hastily raised his bone sword and slashed without looking back. The powerful wind energy shot out from the blade of the sword like an unstoppable whirlwind and swept everything in its path. Bang! 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 Bang. 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 Hundreds and thousands of goblins behind it were immediately torn to shreds. Greenish blood splattered everywhere as cries of pain filled the chaotic battlefield. However, Krier was not attacked as most expected. Although he was confused, he was inadvertently glad he was not targeted. Krier was sure that if he and that human exchanged places, he would definitely attack without hesitation, as the hatred between the two could be said to be greater. What Krier did not know was that Bai Zeman did not hate him more than the rest. In his eyes, all goblins were the same, despicable rapists and murderers who only hunted for no apparent sense or reason. Even so, Bai Zeman made use of his previous discussion with Krier to confuse the enemy for a brief moment. Swoosh. Abil, the mage and priest of the goblin race as well as the royal advisor and strategist of the army, suddenly felt the atmosphere around him shudder for a brief moment. This small movement could go unnoticed in most cases and everyone would think that an irregular breeze of wind passed by. However, only one thought was born in Abil's head when he felt that small movement. Shit. Boom. A thunderous explosion shook the timpani of all the goblins 500 meters around the blast, and those within a 100-meter area directly fainted due to the shock. The upper half of Abil's body exploded into a mess of flesh, blood, and bones, flying up into the sky and then raining everywhere in a messy manner, and even the staff was not spared from the total destruction. The lower half remained on its feet for a brief moment before slowly collapsing to the ground. Some of Abil's blood landed on the body of the female goblin named Kurno as she was relatively close of him. She was forced back several steps due to the remaining shockwave, but her mind was in a daze as she felt the warm blood slowly raining down her cheek. Abil. Abil just died. The female goblin muttered in shock. Kurno's purple eyes looked at the handsome human 100 meters away and saw that this human whom she planned to make into her trophy and doll upon which she could unleash her unbridled lust was now holding the great sword that was previously sealed in the scabbard on his back. You have absorbed the soul power of second order Albo level 69. You cannot gain extra stats by being in the course of an evolution trial. Green letters flashed in Bai Zeman's retina, and as he swung his great sword with a loud swish that made the air burst outward, the fragments of flesh that had been stuck on the sword flew everywhere. Even though he had just ended the life of a second order existence, Bai Zeman's expression remained unchanged. One needed to know that despite the difference between Bai Zeman and Abil being only 19 levels, the true difference between the two was like comparing the highest floor of a building to the lowest floor of that building. They were completely different levels due to the stage they were both at. Bastard. Bai Zeman heard the enraged roar of the goblin army's main leader, followed by a loud bang, and judging by the atmospheric pressure increasing more and more, it became all too evident that Jemender was approaching at thunderous speeds. Bang. Bai Zeman stomped the ground and launched himself like a whirlwind of explosive wind towards the female goblin. The distance of a few tens of meters closed in a mere instant, and he raised his sword high as the murderous intent in his gaze bubbled to the brim. Kurno was startled to see the expression on the human's face before her. Hastily she lifted both hands, and both of her hands seemed to transform into two strange curved blades. Seeing the female goblin dare to take the blow of his great sword with what appeared to be two weak blades, Bai Zeman secretly sneered and could already imagine the creature's arms bursting into a bloody mess. However, to his surprise, such a thing did not happen. As if his blow had met with a huge cotton ball, most of Bai Zeman's attack was repelled by a strange force. Kurno had been completely unharmed. The remaining force behind the blow was not enough to cause Kurno to get hurt. Moreover, with surprising agility she masterfully harnessed the remaining force to send herself flying in the opposite direction, increasing the distance between her and the human by tens of meters in less than a second. Unfortunately, Bai Zeman had already made up his mind to claim her life. Shadow blink. Kurno's eyes widened as in mid-flight she realized that less than a meter away the human she had left behind just a moment ago suddenly appeared. How could this be possible? She couldn't believe it, and her expression of disbelief exposed it. Bai Zeman didn't even give her time to react as he clenched his left fist tightly and punched fiercely towards Kurno's chest. Stop. Bai Zeman ignored Jemender's shout again, and contrary to what the goblin demanded, he added even more strength to his fist. Bang. From a distance of less than a meter and after being taken by surprise, Kurno couldn't even respond in time when Bai Zeman's fist went straight through her chest, crushing her heart and destroying her lungs before she was sent flying tens of meters while blood splattered all over the ground. Kurno, no. Jemender shouted in fright and terror at the sight of Kurno taking such a heavy hit directly in a vital area. He hastily stopped his enraged charge and ran to her to check her condition. Kurno was a goblin who had been born on the same day, in the same place, and at the same instant as Jemender. After fighting countless battles together and evolving shoulder to shoulder, the relationship between the two was not different from the one of blood siblings. While holding her in his arms, Kurno opened her mouth to say something while her tired eyes looked at Jemender's as if trying to communicate with her gaze. Unfortunately, the only thing that came out of her mouth was a large mouthful of fresh blood along with fragments of internal organs and broken bones. Finally, her eyes lost all light and her head fell weakly. She had died. Jemender's lips trembled as he witnessed this. In less than 5 seconds, the proud and ever arrogant him had lost an old battle comrade with whom he had experienced many things and had also lost someone he treasured as a family member. Jemender's body trembled as he remained on his left knee, still holding Kurno's lifeless body. No one knew what this great goblin leader was thinking or feeling at this moment. You have absorbed the soul power of second order Kurno level 73. Bai Zeman ignored Jemender's bizarre reaction and finally relaxed a bit. Having taken off 2 second order beings, and 2 of whom he had the least information about their abilities, he felt as if a heavy burden was lifted from his heart. Although he was secretly surprised at how terrifyingly powerful he had become in such a short time, he was aware that this was not the right time to act with surprise, since regardless of how overwhelming it seemed, the truth was that at this point he had activated lightning movement, invisibility and shadow blink to perform surprise attacks at the speed of light. If it wasn't thanks to these powerful skills, Bai Zeman wasn't so confident that he could take out 2 second order existences with such ease. As Krier looked at Abil's mutilated body, his whole being, and even his own soul and will to fight trembled uncontrollably. He was well aware that if that fierce attack had been directed at him, if that giant sword that did not miss at all with Jemender's weapon struck his body, then his fate would most probably not have been any better than becoming a pile of meat paste just like his goblin companion. On the other hand, Inak, the second-order goblin archer, stared wide-eyed at Kurano's lifeless body. Then, as if thinking on something, he looked at Jeminder, and seeing him seemingly calm, he realized that he might soon see the main leader of the goblin race angry again as he had only seen him once in his short life. Meanwhile, Bai Zeman completely ignored any fear, suffering, or surprise the goblins might be feeling. He took the opportunity where even the unclassified goblins seemed to be stunned due to the surprise of seeing two of their leaders falling like flies and turned to stare into the distance. How long do you think you can hold out? He asked as he picked up his radio. In the distance, Shang Guanbingshue's communicator lit up and Bai Zeman's voice came out of it a moment later. She looked at the army of approximately 30,000 goblins that seemed to have frozen and after thinking quickly for a moment she replied, if it were only me, I have absolute confidence that sooner or later I can annihilate them all. But the problem is that if I want to protect the people here, that won't be possible. What about the barrier of Nangong Lingzin? Bai Zeman asked hurriedly. Wait a moment, Shang Guanbingshue replied and after a few seconds turned back to the communicator, Nangong Lingzin can extend her barrier in a straight line up to a maximum of 100 meters at present but she can only keep it up for 1 minute at most since the larger the size of her barrier the greater the mana consumption to maintain it up. Bai Zeman's mind was racing at lightning speed as he considered every possible solution to the current problem. Letting just over 700 armed men of which about one-third did not even have a 50% chance of hitting the enemy's head from 100 meters away fight against an army of over 30,000 enemies was no different than sending them all to die. Even with the support of approximately 300 soul revolvers, things would not change much as the goblin level was too high despite being unclassified. Even if 1,000 humans somehow managed to resist a rain of thousands of bone arrows in the melee attack of the goblins, the survivors in the middle of the defensive formation would definitely be slaughtered. What Bai Zeman needed was time for his troops to mature even a little more, enough to stand and fight for themselves. Only then would all his efforts be worthwhile. However, with all the things that were happening in such a short time it was basically impossible for the humans to grow up quietly. After thinking about it for a moment, Bai Zeman remembered something and hurriedly asked, Bing Shuet, now that your main skill evolved to second order, do you think you can set up an ice barrier big enough to enclose everyone and protect them? In the end, Bai Zeman could only rely on Shang Guanbingshui for this, there was no way he could divert his attention while facing 3 second-order existences of which one of them was capable of launching ranged attacks. After a moment of silence, Shang Guanbingshui's reply reached his ears. If it were 2 nights ago, I'm afraid that doing such a thing would not be possible. But the mana consumption of my skill was greatly reduced after evolving to second order, and I acquired a second activation. Although I'm not 100% sure, I'm at least 90% confident that I can withstand the large-scale mana consumption of a giant defensive barrier for approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Bai Zeman muttered to himself as his eyes glittered uncannily. Do you think you can beat those 3 in 10 minutes? Shang Guanbingshui asked through the transmitter with some insecurity in her voice. Although she was quite far away from the center of the actual battlefield, the truth was that even from her position she could sense 5 terrifying auras unknown just a moment ago. However, not long ago 2 of those 5 powerful auras disappeared without a trace leaving only 3 remaining. Shang Guanbingshui soon realized that Bai Zeman must have used some powerful skills and mysterious methods to wipe out 2 enemies in such a short time. However, such powerful skills usually had a long cooldown span or high mana consumption so it was impossible to use them continuously and could usually only be used once per fight. I'm afraid that 10 minutes later or it might even be a little earlier depending on the enemy's attack intensity I will run out of mana. Shang Guanbingshui said in a serious manner, by that time, even though I will be able to stay alive without any problems thanks to my melee ability and stats, my overall battle ability will fall tremendously. I definitely won't be able to protect the rest. Bai Zeman's reply was not long in coming from the other side of the communicator. That's fine. 10 minutes is more than enough and even if it was half that will do as well. Shang Guanbingshui blinked her beautiful eyelashes in amazement upon hearing Bai Zeman's extremely confident tone and wondered if he was planning to make some kind of suicide attack. Otherwise she could not understand how he could finish such a difficult battle as the one he was about to experience in such a short time. However, so far Bai Zeman had never been arrogant to the point of blindness so she finally decided to trust him without hesitation. Okay. I'll do my best then. Immediately after the communication was closed, Shang Guanbingshui activated her ice maker skill. The frost mist gathered in her palm swiftly and under her exquisite control, it solidified to make what appeared to be small ice stakes. In just an instant, she had formed dozens and dozens of small ice stakes. However, Shang Guanbingshui did not stop here as her work was not yet finished and these ice stakes were no more than useless creations without the next step she was about to take. After taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and activated the second ability of her ice maker skill, the ability to create traps and activate them at will. She focused all her will and a small frown that did not diminish her beauty in the slightest appeared on her face automatically, this being proof enough to show how much effort she was putting into this. After all, this was Shang Guanbingshui's first time using the second activation of her ice maker skill. Even if she knew the theory of how to use this second activation thanks to the rune engraved inside her soul, it did not mean that she would immediately become an expert just because she had the knowledge. It was similar to driving, even if you know the theory of how the pedals and gears work, theory and practice were 2 completely different things. After several seconds, she finally finished and slowly opened her eyes to look at her creation. The ice stakes were the same as any ice stake Shang Guanbingshui had created before to claim the lives of her enemies. However, if one looked with careful eyes one would easily notice that inside the slightly bluish ice there was a strange white-colored mist hovering constantly. After finishing, Shang Guanbingshui approached several soul evolvers and instructed them gravely to very carefully begin staking the stakes around the grounds they were currently occupying. Less than a minute later, she received confirmation that all the ice stakes had been placed as she instructed. Now all that was left was to wait for the bang that would most likely herald the beginning of the end. At the base, Bai Zeman decided not to immediately attack Jeminder or any of the other 2 goblins. He even decided not to attack the army of approximately 100,000 goblins surrounding him and instead waited patiently. Of course, the reason he did not attack was not out of kindness to the enemy by any stretch of the imagination. The real reason he didn't attack was to wait until his shadow blink skill was off cooldown again. Shadow Blink had become one of Bai Zemin's most powerful and deadly skills from the moment it evolved and mutated from its previous weakened version. Furthermore, this skill only had a short cooldown time of 60 seconds, which while not making it too practical for non-stop combat, given the current circumstances, Bai Zemin couldn't help but thank the goblins in his heart for being so generous. Approximately 50 seconds after Kurano's death, Jeminder slowly stood up. His expression was extremely serious and the goblin's eyes seemed to spit fire as he looked at the human from a short distance as if he wanted nothing more than to eat him alive. Bai Zemin sensed his gaze and naturally looked at him. However, his expression was indifferent and cold, as if Jeminder's anger was nothing more than a joke in his eyes, something unworthy of even mentioning, let alone something to pay attention to. You killed a Bill in Kurano. Jeminder spat under his breath and seemed to be doing his best to contain the volcano of anger inside him about to erupt. Kurano and a Bill? Bai Zemin looked confused before he realized what Jeminder was saying thanks to the records he had just absorbed not too long ago. Kurano? A Bill. Bai Zemin sneered with a playful smile. I didn't know that you, foul beasts, are also brave enough to name yourselves. Bai Zemin absolutely detested the goblin's behavior. He abhorred this race of greenskins who raped as if it was something fun and was willing to do anything to annihilate them until there was not even a trace of their existence left. If his words could make Jeminder suffer, he would gladly do so. In the process, he would also make the enemy lose their ability to reason, which would make things easier for him sooner or later. Kakik. Jeminder laughed oddly, as did all the goblins. He glared at Bai Zemin as he spat out viciously word by word, I swear that I will peel your skin millimeter by millimeter. Then I will do my best to keep you alive while I let even the lowliest soldier have his fun with your loved ones before finally taking their lives with my own hands in front of your eyes. I want you to feel what I felt then and what I feel right now. The playful smile on Bai Zemin's face slowly faded, bit by bit, until all that remained on his face was the very representation of indifference. Without words, without warning, his feet erupted with over 700 strength points and the ground exploded into countless pieces that flew everywhere uncontrollably. However, Bai Zemin's body was no longer there. As if by prior agreement, Jeminder also disappeared from his previous position, and an instant later the ground exploded just as it did with Bai Zemin an instant before. Jeminder's silhouette became bigger and bigger in Bai Zemin's eyes. Without hesitation and without thinking too much, he swung his great sword backward and then stopped dead in his tracks as he used centrifugal force to slash forward with all his might. Jeminder also slashed furiously with his claymore while gritting his teeth, and the hatred in his eyes seemed capable of piercing all defenses. When the two swords that were 2 or more meters long and whose width was enough to compare to half the body of a grown man collided with each other, the whole world seemed to have fallen silent for a brief moment. The wind stagnated, the breeze from the forest trees seemed to stop blowing, the roars of the goblins were silenced, and even the clouds in the distant sky seemed to have stopped for a moment. During that brief instant that a normal person could quite possibly not detect, Bai Zemin's black eyes met Jeminder's strange greenish eyes. One gaze was indifferent and ice-cold while the other gaze was filled with hatred as flames burned within. Rumble. The earth began to rumble and the sound became louder and louder with each passing fraction of a second. Before any of the creatures present could react, the raging hell that seemed to be being contained by unseen hands finally broke out. Boom! A massive shockwave shot out in the form of a sphere with Bai Zemin and Jeminder at its center, extending hundreds of meters in just a second. Inak and Krier covered their faces with both arms as they did their best to fight against the fierce pressure that pushed them further and further back regardless of how much they struggled. Their feet dug firmly into the ground, leaving deep grooves and destroying the concrete as if it were mud instead of stone. Both of them were proud and powerful second-order existences, but just a mere resulting shockwave was enough to force them back several meters. Inak and Krier sweated at the thought of what would happen if one of those swords fell on their bodies, and when they remembered Abil's miserable fate, the two goblin leaders finally began to feel fear, realizing the reason why even Jeminder didn't want to face the human before them and going so far as to be willing to let him and his family go, something unheard of until now. But the two of them suffered the least thanks to their tremendously powerful physiques. Those who suffered the most from the clash between Bai Zemin's blazing scale greatsword and Jeminder's bone claymore were those unclassified goblins who were approximately 500 meters near the center. Hundreds of goblins that were hit by the shockwave exploded and turned directly into blood mists that soon joined each other to form a dense red cloud. Fragmented bones and small pieces of flesh flew everywhere, staining the bodies of their fellow race mates who were fortunately out of range of the shockwave. In the center of the bloody battlefield, the red sword and the white sword firmly joined with each other as if they wanted to merge. Bang! After the initial explosion passed, a powerful bang awakened all the goblins from their shock. However, all they did was fall into even greater shock when they saw the reason for the bang. PFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFFF His bone claymore was pressed down with even greater power than before and the body of the main leader of the northern goblin race was sent flying like a kite whose string had been cut. The veins in Geminder's arm seemed to have broken out as his muscles exploded. Blood spurted uncontrollably from his mouth and as he flew backward unable to control his own body, Geminder left a trail of blood wherever his body passed. Boom. The building that had previously been cut in two by Krier's attack in a moment of showing his arrogance was now completely demolished as Geminder's body slammed into one of the walls. Geminder continued to fly for another 200 meters, killing several goblins that were in his path in the process before finally falling heavily to the ground, leaving a thick trail of dirt and debris. Gee, Geminder. Inak's eyes went wide as he stared in utter shock at the goblin and the existence he most respected since gaining a sense of self. Krier couldn't believe what he was seeing either. The origin of this chapter's debut can be traced to N0/V3LB1N. In the past, he had experienced how terrifying Geminder was firsthand and had also seen it once, in a burst of rage, annihilate a large human force at the edge of China's territory. However, that same Geminder had been sent flying like a rag doll and harmed to such an extent for not being able to take a blow from the human before them. Krier felt as if his senses had shut down as he watched the scene before his eyes. Slowly, Krier turned his head and looked at the human he had earlier taunted and even dared to threaten. He shuddered as he realized that in stark contrast to Geminder's miserable appearance, that human wearing black armor and carrying a huge sword had actually not even moved an inch from his original position. How can this be possible? Inak muttered again in shock. How great the difference in strength between the two of them had to be for Gemender to be sent flying like that. Even now, Inak and Krier could only sense the power of a first-order existence from Bai Zemin's body. The front of Bai Zemin's hair was considerably long after not receiving a good cut in quite some time. At this moment, several strands of hair partially covered his eyes, so it was not easy to discover what kind of expression his gaze had. Without saying a single word, he lowered his blazing scale greatsword and let it fall to the ground before starting to walk towards Gemender with leisurely steps. The heavy but at the same time sharp sword crafted from hundreds of hard and tough scales left a ridge with every step he took, and the sound of the ground being pierced was the only sound that could be heard. Gemender felt as if his head had been struck by a huge hammer weighing several tons, and his brain seemed to have turned to mush. With extremely unsteady steps, he struggled to get to his feet. This caused the injuries on his arms and most of his body to widen, spurting blood at faster rates than before as his monstrous natural regeneration struggled to counteract this. The main leader of the goblin race shook his head to shake off the dizziness that assaulted him, and an involuntary grimace of pain appeared on his face as his greenish eyes looked with slight surprise at the human walking ever closer. Kakik. Gemender chuckled as he felt the incredible murderous intent of the human before him released despite his seemingly casual appearance. In the end, you are a human after all. Before Gemender had a chance to utter another word, Bai Zemin raised his head slightly and looked at him with his right eye. His mouth moved softly and he muttered words that the top leader of the goblin race failed to make out or hear. But what happened next reminded Gemender that the human being in front of his eyes not only had incredible physical capabilities, but also possessed strange magical abilities. Gemender suddenly felt an enormous amount of mana and magical power assaulting the inside of his body, aimed directly at his heart. The anger he felt at Kurno and Abil's death was forced to subside as fear set in. Hastily he sent most of his mana to fight off the invading attack. Unfortunately, Gemender was a pure warrior and his active skills were all to boost physical attacks, which he had practically activated all of them in his previous attack. Just as Lilith had said before, 99% of melee warriors had no talent or great magical abilities. Gemender was not one of those rarities who managed to enter that meager 1%. Cough. 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 Gemender managed to deflect the internal magical attack from his heart to other parts of his body after consuming basically 95% of his mana reserve. However, although he avoided immediate death, he was unable to prevent several of his internal organs from receiving critical damage. As a consequence, the proud goblin could not help but stagger backward while continuously coughing up several mouthfuls of blood along with small pieces of flesh belonging to those damaged organs. The unclassified goblins went berserk with fear and roared before rushing forward. However, Bai Zemin didn't even look at them, and with a fierce swing of his hand backward along with the consumption of another 300 points of mana, he created over 1,000 blood threads extremely thin and hard to notice with the naked eye. Swoosh. 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 The blood strands streaked across the skies and danced across the battlefield as if they were arrogant and powerful dragons. All the goblins that crossed their paths could not even comprehend what was happening before their bodies were ripped to shreds. Some were decapitated on the spot, other goblins were cut straight from the waist down, and when their upper halves fell to the ground the beasts cried out in pain, others were simply cut diagonally while others lost their limbs and could only fall to the ground writhing in pain. As he walked closer and closer to a collapsed Gemender, Bai Zemin's face turned as pale as a sheet. However, his steps did not falter at all and he continued to manipulate the blood to make his enemies' lives become their own hell and to make them wish they had never shown themselves in his presence. At this point, Bai Zemin's mana had now fallen to just over 100 points. This was the consequence of using around 400 points to cause fatal damage to Gemender's internal organs, added to the previous consumption of the skills he had activated to kill the two goblins named Kurno and Abil, as well as the creation of that huge blood sword. Previously, Bai Zemin had planned to kill all the goblins slowly, taking several minutes to perform this feat. That way, he could save at least 60 to 50% of his mana for emergencies. However, after hearing Gemender's words earlier, all those spare thoughts flew out the window without a trace. Angry like he had never felt before in his entire life, Bai Zemin completely unleashed himself without any intention of holding anything back. His only desire was to wipe out all the creatures around him, but before that he had to do something about the anger bubbling up inside him or he might end up suffocating to death. Gemender slowly raised his head as he felt a shadow looming over him. His beastly eyes met the eyes of the human who was currently looking down at him without even lowering his head. Before Gemender could even say anything or plot an attack that would bring him back into the ring, Bai Zemin fiercely struck with his right leg, directly impacting the burly goblin's jaw. Bang! Gemender felt as if hundreds of stars twinkled in his vision. Indistinctly, he felt his body flying out of control as well as the sound of lightning and thunder, but at this point the pain he felt had made it too difficult for him to think normally. With second-order lightning movement still active, Bai Zemin transformed into a black shadow, and with the 900+ temporary agility points he currently enjoyed, he appeared behind Gemender's body flying backward. Bai Zemin released his sword and dropped it heavily on the ground. Then, he nimbly caught Gemender's body with both hands and mercilessly increased the gravity x15 as he slammed his knee upwards and forced Gemender's body to fall. If this attack connected, it would be a miracle if Gemender's spine didn't snap into two pieces. Stop! Inak finally snapped out of his daze and bellowed loudly. Perhaps, the goblin archer was aware that the human would not stop his movements at all, as despite his earlier shout, Inak still fiercely pulled the string made of beast tendons rearward. A strange bone arrow similar to a drill was waiting to be released as Inak's hands trembled slightly due to the strength he was exerting to pull the string of his weapon to its maximum. However, his movements were still a lot slower than those of Bai Zemin. Krayok! Crack! Crack! The sound of bones breaking seemed to be even more terrifying than the miserable cries and screams of the unclassified goblins and first-order ones that were being slaughtered by the 1,000+ blood threads that Bai Zemin was mentally controlling. Still trapped by Bai Zemin's hands, Gemender's eyes widened and opened as much as possible as if threatening to pop out of their sockets at any moment. Tears quickly accumulated as a piercing scream automatically escaped from his mouth along with a gush of blood. Gemender's scream was heard even by Shangguan Bingshui and the rest of the survivors in the distance outside the base. That's how terrifying it was. Everyone shuddered in fear at the scream that seemed to be the cry of a ghost in grief. Enhanced drill. Enhanced speed. Triple arrow. Enact shouted the name of 3 skills at the same time, and the strange arrow in his hand took on a slight sandy yellow hue before shooting off at full speed as his grip on the bowstring relaxed. The arrow traveled at a speed that completely broke the sound barrier, and the tip spun continuously in the process of flight. A war tank would be turned into a pile of scrap metal immediately if this kind of attack hit. Bai Zeman coldly snorted and without saying a single word kicked his blazing scale great sword without looking back. The great sword was hit with all of Bai Zeman's strength and shot out with the tip pointed in a particular direction. There didn't seem to be anything in its trajectory when it suddenly stopped in mid-flight before a powerful explosion sent it flying. Boom. The bone arrow shaped like a drill as well as Enact's most powerful attack was stopped in its tracks. The great sword flew through the air before landing far away somewhere in the sea of goblins, out of Bai Zeman's reach and sight. Whether it was whole or not was still unknown. What? Krier cried out in shock. Even Gemender could not take Enact's best attack the way the human before him had done. On the other hand, Enact felt as if his soul had left his body and his grip on his weapon hesitated for the first time since birth. Of course, the reason why Bai Zeman managed to suppress such a powerful attack was because he not only used his 750 plus strength points but also used gravity manipulation to lighten the weight of the sword and propel the speed at which it flew, which consequently also increased the power behind it. In the distance, the goblins surrounding the army of mankind finally could no longer wait for any kind of command. With fear overcoming them and taking possession, the beasts roared and charged forward with their swords and spears held high. The goblin archers raised their bows and fired immeasurable numbers of bone arrows that momentarily obscured a patch of the azure sky. With thousands of arrows falling from the clouds at the same time, there was no doubt that at least half of the gunmen would die while many soul evolvers would also fall without life. For an instant, it seemed that the roars of the beasts in the forests were silenced as they sensed a second battlefield being unleashed. The humans were not idle about it either, and despite their fear, they bared their own fangs. Fire! The several team leaders roared practically at the same time, and the hundreds of armed men shouted at the top of their lungs as they pulled the trigger of their guns relentlessly. Bang! 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 The goblins were fast, and so were the arrows that fell quickly as they were drawn to the ground again by the gravity of the world. However, no matter how fast they were, it was impossible for unclassified existences to go faster than the speed of a bullet. Thus, by the time it seemed that everything was within their grasp, the goblins had to pay a heavy price in order to cover a few hundred meters of distance. Hundreds of goblins collapsed per second. Because of how many and densely packed they were, even a blind man could easily hit a goblin's body with each shot by simply aiming and firing straight ahead. Goblins fell to the ground on their own blood or that of their fellow goblins. Some lost their lives immediately after taking a bullet hit to the head, while those less fortunate received different numbers of bullet wounds in varied parts of their bodies before falling to the ground and screaming in pain as they felt their lives gradually leaving their bodies alongside the blood loss. It was only about 10 seconds before the front line of the army of now less than 30,000 goblins reached the first defensive line of the human army formation. By that time, the number of goblins that had been killed exceeded 5,000. Moreover, the most surprising thing was that the arrows had been stopped by Nangang Lingzhen, Sheng Guanbing Shuet, and other soul evolvers with active defensive skills, so the humans did not suffer any real casualties except for some light injuries. To have defeated 5,000 enemies with 0 casualties was quite a feat considering the difference in numbers. However, this only happened thanks to the humans taking advantage of the distance and firepower disadvantage of the enemy. The real problem would start now, when the remaining 25,000 or so goblins reached the human defensive perimeter. How were about 1,000 humans going to defend themselves against 25,000 goblins that not only had an average level equivalent to that of human soul evolvers, but the advantage of using firearms would immediately disappear when goblins with swords and spears or knives arrived to engage in close combat? Such a thing was not possible no matter how much one thought about it. Fear and despair were visible in the looks of every human present as the survivors sobbed or screamed in terror inside the various modified vehicles. Many of them cursed Bai Zeman and the other leaders like Sheng Guanbing Shui for wanting to leave the base, while others took the opportunity of what seemed to be the last second before death to embrace their loved ones while apologizing for their own lack of power to do anything about it. Just when all seemed lost, an incredibly cold celestial voice like that of an ice fairy echoed far and wide. Ice Bastion. Sheng Guanbing Shui called out the words that identified what she wanted to create as she crafted the various ice stakes and raised her delicate hand towards the sky. A large wave of mana burst outward with her as the center, coming into contact with the several tens of ice stakes an instant later. Flash. 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 A faint blue flash shone on each ice stake, and when the melee goblins reached the distance of 50 meters, Sheng Guanbing Shui's multiple traps activated at the same time to form a massive array. Swoosh. 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 Huge walls of ice rose into the sky, curving after reaching the height of 20 meters before they began to merge with the ice walls growing from the ice stakes located in the rear. In addition, the ice walls also widened, merging with the ice walls of the ice stakes that had been placed on the different sides. Several goblins jumped in an attempt to attack the humans, but their bodies only hit the ice wall hard before being rejected. A number of bone arrows struck what appeared to be an impenetrable turtle shell, leaving only tiny marks that did not even serve to weaken the defense of the ice barrier. From the inside, the soldiers, soul evolvers, and survivors watched in amazement as a huge fortress magically rose above and around them all, protecting them from the ferocious attacks of the malicious goblins. This chapter was originally shared via Webnovel by J.N. The ice was transparent from inside the bastion, so everyone could see the enraged and vile expressions of the small green creatures. Those with bone swords slashed without any skill in an attempt to break through the defenses that impeded their steps, and those with spears stabbed again and again unsuccessfully in an attempt to break through the thick layer of ice that blocked them from their targets and prey. The nearly 4,000 humans automatically looked up at the position on which the woman who rightfully occupied not only the position of the woman most longed for and dreamed of by countless men of the faction, but also the position of the second most powerful and authoritative existence right after the supreme leader. Still standing on the body of the 10-meter-tall scaled rhinoceros, Sheng Guanbing Shui looked like an ice goddess in her sky blue armor. Her silver hair danced gently as her beautiful face turned slightly pale, making her look extremely pitiful and evoking everyone's desire for protection. Great. We're alive. Thank God. Thank God. We should be thanking her instead of God. It is not known who started it, but the survivors who had already given up began to shout Shang Guanbingshue's name out loud, worshipping her as if she were the true goddess of their faith. They even forgot that a moment before many of them had cursed her and all the high commanders of the base for leaving to the south. As she was showered with cheers and praise, Shang Guanbingshue secretly gritted her teeth. She couldn't care less about the stupid things the survivors were doing at the moment, nor was she in a position to give any kind of order. All her attention was focused not only on providing constant mana to the ice bastion to keep it standing and to repair the openings created by the countless goblin attacks, she also needed to focus on controlling the temperature of the place as much as possible. With so much ice, the humans were currently locked in an ice chamber capable of freezing them to death in a matter of minutes. If not for the fact that Shang Guanbingshue's ice maker skill had evolved to second order 2 nights ago, which gave her more information and knowledge as well as control over the skill, she would not have been able to control the temperature of the ice she created by herself. Shang Guanbingshue realized that she underestimated mana's consumption of creating a castle over 20 meters high and almost half a kilometer long and wide a little too much. At first, she thought that she could withstand 10 minutes even with the goblins attacking, but now she realized that she could barely resist 6 at most, and it wouldn't be much of a surprise if that amount was reduced by a couple of minutes depending on the circumstances. Her increasingly exhausted blue eyes looked in the direction of the main battlefield. Even though she couldn't see what was going on there, the frequent explosions, screams and curses, as well as the strange behavior of the goblin race were enough to tell her that Bai Zimin had already started his own battle. Moreover, he seemed to have the upper hand at the moment. Shang Guanbingshuε could only secretly pray that he would finish as soon as possible and hurry up before she was running out of every drop of mana. Shang Guanbingshue could only secretly pray that he would finish as soon as possible and hurry up before she was running out of every drop of mana. Bai Zimin felt the temperature in the area plummet. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a huge ice structure in the distance rising steadily. He also glimpsed what appeared to be countless ant-like goblins doing their best to climb the ice walls in search of an opening. So she's already made her move. Not bad. He muttered to himself as he nodded calmly. His voice was cold and indifferent, like that of a demon from hell out for blood rather than the voice someone usually used to praise somebody. At his feet, Geminder's body lay limp, and if it weren't for the groans that escaped from his mouth occasionally or his tear-filled eyes informing that he was still alive, anyone would have thought he was a corpse lying in the middle of the road. Geminder used both his hands in an attempt to stand up, but his legs would not respond no matter how much he ordered them to move. He couldn't even muster the slightest amount of strength to stand up, let alone walk. No, instead of saying that he failed to muster the necessary strength, it would probably be more correct to say that Geminder couldn't even feel the existence of his legs. The entire lower half of his body was completely cut off from the sensory nerves of his brain. He had lost all sensibility completely, and even pain was no longer something to worry about. What did you do to me? Geminder asked in what could only be described as a terrified and almost meek voice. That high and mighty voice he had used in the beginning, when he met Bai Zimin face to face for the first time, could no longer be felt anymore, and even his anger-filled voice had completely disappeared. The current Geminder was like the polar opposite of his past self and did not seem to have the same pride he enjoyed and brimmed with before. Bai Zimin looked at him with his eyes looking down, not even bothering to lower his head a millimeter. Geminder's body was curved into a peculiar angle, impossible to reach unless one's body was literally invertebrate. Blood was constantly pouring out of his back, staining the ground on which he lay red. Furthermore, the thorn protruding from Bai Zimin's deep black armor on the knee was stained with blood, and his right leg also had a large gush of blood running freely down to his boot. He didn't even bother to answer back to Geminder. In Bai Zimin's eyes, Geminder was no different from a corpse at this moment. If previously he was willing to let him go to avoid major losses and for the long-term good, the current Bai Zimin would not let the goblin in front of him go alive even if the world collapsed before his eyes. Geminder had said words that Bai Zimin could not tolerate, let alone forgive. If what the main leader of the goblin army in the northern area of China had done was just insult him or threaten his life, then Bai Zimin would have simply scoffed just as he had done with all the enemies who eventually ended up falling to their knees in front of him. But what Geminder did was threaten the safety of his family, the ones most precious to Bai Zimin and the very reason he fought in the first place. His family was the motive why Bai Zimin did not collapse even now despite the great burdens his seemingly formidable but in reality extremely fragile back bore. They were the reason why despite being only 20 years old he was acting like a mature old man most of the time. Therefore, anyone who threatened the safety of those important to him, even if it was just empty words that Bai Zimin believed would never be carried out, was something he could not tolerate. However small the possibility, Bai Zimin would not let go of any uncertainty of such magnitude. Slowly, he turned and faced the gazes of Anak and Krier. The last two leaders of the goblin race standing stared at him as if they were looking at a monster. Neither of them dared to attack Bai Zimin at all. If even Geminder, who was twice as powerful as them, was crushed as if he was an insignificant ant, then it was clear to both Anak and Krier that they would not be able to change anything even if they tried. Anak's most powerful attack proved it, being casually parried by a kick from Bai Zimin. The human didn't even turn his face and simply kicked his weapon. As if that wasn't enough, it was still controlling those strange but lethal blood threads to take the lives of hundreds of goblins per second. Even now, the goblins were still dying one after another, and the army of previously close to 100,000 that had stayed here had now been reduced to less than 60,000. You two. Just leave. Bai Zimin waved his hand impatiently as he looked at Anak and Krier before saying casually, by the way, and just in case. Take these filthy beasts with you and run as far away as you can before I change my mind. Anak's eyes flashed strangely when he heard this, and he secretly exchanged glances with Krier. The goblin archer seemed to have thought about something when he suddenly raised his bow and activated his skills to power up his attacks before launching without warning an extremely powerful arrow that didn't miss at all with the previous one. His target was, of course, Bai Zimin. Anak was sure that the reason why the human before him had uttered those words was because after demonstrating superior and overwhelming power on such a scale, he had most likely exhausted himself completely and could no longer fight. Ugh. Anak suddenly frowned as he felt a huge amount of sharp pain from his chest. He lowered his head in confusion, but a moment later he figured it was better not to have done it. The powerful arrow struck Bai Zimin, causing his body to explode into pieces. However, it wasn't blood and flesh nor was it bone fragments that flew everywhere, it was only tiny flashes of lightning that flickered for an instant before disappearing. At the end of the day, a beast is still a beast no matter how smart they look. Like the voice of the demon, Bai Zeman spoke indifferently from behind a neck. His fist had completely pierced through the skin of the goblin archer. Not only did it pierce the skin on the back, it also completely destroyed the left shoulder blade and went even deeper, destroying an X heart and smashing past the lungs exiting through the front area of the body. By activating the second ability of lightning movement and creating a perfect clone of himself in conjunction with the skill invisibility, Bai Zeman had switched places with his clone after he said those words. Then, he used shadow blink to blink at the shadow of the goblin farthest away from him but closest to a neck before finally taking advantage of the goblin's roars and cries to camouflage the sound of the lightning flashing on his body. Inak didn't even notice when Bai Zeman had appeared at his back, and by the time he launched his arrow, it was too late for regrets. You have absorbed the soul power of second order Inak level 74. Bai Zeman waved his hand casually, sending Inak's lifeless body flying and finally freeing his arm stuck in the goblin's chest cavity. Without a word, Bai Zeman's indifferent gaze fell back on Krier several dozen meters away, a distance that for beings with the high agility they possessed could be closed or extended in just an instant. I'm leaving. I'm getting the hell out right now. Krier shouted anxiously as his fear-filled eyes met Bai Zeman's, and for the first time in his life he wished to never meet with someone ever again. Just get the hell out of here, you scumbag. Bai Zeman replied calmly. Krier didn't dare to challenge the patience of the demon in front of him and hurriedly let out a shrill howl towards the sky. The goblins that were being slaughtered stopped stupidly trying to charge forward and paused at the leader's call. As if it was foreseen, the more than 1,000 blood threads also stopped and ceased slaughtering the green-skinned creatures. These blood threads had cut the bodies of so many enemies that blood was constantly dripping from them, which made them visible to everyone, and they had already lost the surprise factor a long time ago. Even those goblins that were a kilometer outside the base and more than 3 kilometers away from the central battle site stopped their assault on the ice bastion erected by Shangguan Bingshui after hearing Krier's call. They all looked towards the base with their ugly faces and mouths slightly open before they began to run quickly in that direction, completely abandoning the mission they seemed so determined to complete no matter what. Bai Zeman watched all this from the side and his heart trembled with lingering fear as well as envy. Fear because if a goblin of the third or even fourth order were born among the goblins, then that supreme existence would immediately obtain an army that would listen to it and carry out its commands without hesitation. Envy because he longed for an army as orderly as that of the goblins. Obedient to the point of ignoring their own wills. Even though he knew that such a thing was not possible for mankind, it did not stop Bai Zeman from wanting such a thing. Krier took a last sidelong glance at Gemender, who grunted on the ground and looked at him with bloodshot eyes as if he wanted to swallow him alive for being a traitor. Then, ignoring the gaze of the former main leader of the goblin race, he looked at the corpses of the 3 goblins who less than 10 minutes ago were standing and enjoying overwhelming strength just like his own. After doing so, Krier once again howled towards the sky before running off into the forest in the distance without even looking back. The unclassified goblins and the less than 10 first-order goblins that managed to survive from the blood threads hunt looked at Gemender for a second before following in Krier's footsteps. Because Gemender had been terribly weakened by Bai Zeman's relentless attacks, his soul power had been suppressed accordingly. Therefore, and as a consequence of this, Krier's soul power seemed to be much higher so that all the lower goblins followed him and obeyed without hesitation. It did not take more than 2 minutes for the goblin army to completely disappear from Bai Zeman's line of sight. They had arrived in a mighty and ostentatious manner with numbers approaching 150,000, which included dozens of first-order and even 5 second-order beings. However, less than 10 minutes later, that huge army left again, except that not all of those who arrived left. Most of the first-order goblins had been slaughtered like flies, the unclassified goblins were destroyed and would have been wiped out in their entirety in a couple more minutes. Even 4 of the 5 leaders leading the goblin race, 4 of the 5 most powerful second-order existences had fallen like dogs. Among them, the main goblin leader had even been captured alive by the enemy. Bai Zeman surveyed the chaotic battlefield that was finally silent once again, and a sigh of relief escaped from his mouth, letting out all the heavy air in his lungs. The first large-scale confrontation between Bai Zeman's faction and the goblin race had finally concluded. The final result had been the overwhelming victory of the humans, achieving a perfect record of 0 deaths. All this was achieved only with the perfect union and synchronization of 2 people, a man and a woman. In the area outside the base, on the main road to the south, Shangguan Bingshui watched with wondering eyes as the goblin army fled into the distance, and the first reason why the goblins were fleeing that came to her mind took the form of a young man who surprised her more and more every day and made her hopes in the male gender grow at least a bit. This person was naturally Bai Zeman. If it wasn't him who forced the goblins to retreat, then who else? Although Shangguan Bingshui had no idea how Bai Zeman was able to get an army of tens of thousands of goblins to flee in panic, she had her own conclusions about it. Of the 5 terrifying auras from before, 3 of them disappeared completely and another one fled north. The last one is in an extremely weakened state, to the point where it's hard to notice. She muttered quietly to herself. What do we do now? Kong Lan approached her while still keeping her vigilance up. Fu Suifeng and the rest were still leading the troops of gunmen and soul evolvers to hold the defenses as they didn't know if the goblins would return or not. If they were caught off guard, then the forces of mankind would be destroyed in an instant by the green-skinned creatures, and they were well aware of it. Shangguan Bingshui listened to Kong Lan's question and after a brief pause of consideration calmly instructed, let everyone keep their positions. I will hold this ice bastion for another 2 or 3 minutes, and if in that time nothing happens, then I will go check on Bai Zeman. All right. Kong Lan nodded hurriedly and did not discuss the matter. She was also worried about Bai Zeman, since even though they had a soul contract that bound them to each other and assured the other that they were both alive, it wasn't as if Kong Lan was able to know if Bai Zeman was critically injured or not. Shangguan Bingshui's thoughts were similar to Kong Lan's. Although she wanted to think that he had not been injured or suffered any mishaps, somehow she felt that it might not necessarily be the case. Time passed extremely slowly from the point of view of the survivors. Regardless of whether they were an armed human, soul evolver, or a normal citizen, they were all tense as they cautiously and vigilantly surveyed their surroundings for anything green that moved other than the leaves on the trees. Bushes in the distance would occasionally sway and a small wild beast would scurry off across the street before disappearing into the adjacent forest, scaring everyone to the marrow of their bones. It was obvious to anyone that the fear of the large number of goblins that had assaulted them not too long ago as well as the ferocity of these creatures that were barely about 3 feet tall had left a deep mark on the hearts of most. This was understandable considering that only a few moments ago they were just one step away from crossing the gates of the underworld without being able to return to the world of the living ever again. Fear was a rather complex and sometimes even a weird emotion. These battle troops feared the goblins even though some of them only received minor wounds during the fall of bone arrows, suffering 0 casualties in the entire confrontation. On the other hand, they did not fear the wild beasts as much even though many of their battle companions have already died before the claws and fangs of these beasts. The soldiers also feared the zombies horribly even though they were clearly slower and much weaker than the wild beasts. This was because the zombies not only had grotesque appearances as a result of the deterioration of their bodies due to the inability to control the mana that slowly corroded them but were also feared because of the factor that a mere scratch meant the end. Even now, Shang Guanbing Shui and Bai Zimin were not immune to the invasion of infectious mana. Approximately 3 minutes after the army of tens of thousands of goblins disappeared without a trace, Shang Guanbing Shui's mana reserve dropped directly below 10% and her pretty face was almost as white as a sheet, barely with some blush on her cheeks due to mental exhaustion. Finally, she deactivated her Ice Maker skill, and having lost the mana supplement, the big ice bastion slowly began to lose its firmness. The Soul Evolvers joined Shang Guanbing Shui to launch several powerful attacks and with Nangong Yi's final roar having activated his first order barbarian strength skill, one of the walls finally fell, revealing a hole large enough for 2 big vehicles to drive through side by side. You all wait here. Shang Guanbing Shui instructed Liu Yan and the rest earnestly, I will go check on Bai Zimin's situation. Leave the engines running and prepare to leave immediately. Roger. Liu Yan, Fu Suifeng, Nangong Yi, Nangong Lingzhen, Evangeline, Kong Lan, as well as the various soul evolvers with some power and prestige nodded in unison upon hearing her words. Shang Guanbing Shui didn't delay any longer after seeing everyone get to work and with a bit of vigor on the tip of her small foot she shot out towards the south gate of the former base, disappearing from everyone's sight in a few blinks of an eye. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Bang. 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 Shang Guanbing Shui slowed her steps as she drew closer and closer to what she judged for obvious reasons was the center of the battlefield on which Bai Zimin and the main forces of the goblin army had clashed not long ago. Her blue eyes looked casually and composedly at the surrounding mess. Hundreds of buildings, houses, huts, and other types of human constructions were now nothing but a pile of rubble. Although there were several others still standing, their condition was so pitiful that it would probably be better to tear them down completely and build a new one there. Red blood had stained the entire area and the putrid smell of iron filled the entire atmosphere. If not for the fact that Shang Guanbing Shui had already gotten used to this peculiar smell after experiencing so many things and going through so many battles from the beginning of the apocalypse, she would definitely not have been able to continue walking as casually and calmly as she was doing now. The mutilated bodies of tens and tens of thousands were piled up everywhere. No matter where her beautiful eyes fell, it was impossible not to see at least a few goblins torn into several pieces littering the ground in a disorderly manner. Although Shang Guanbing Shui was clearly aware that many of these goblins had been killed by the shockwaves resulting from the clash between powers far above them, her eyes could not help but glitter with a hint of surprise. Just how many goblins did he kill? She muttered in disbelief. Bai Zimin was powerful, there was no room for doubt. Shang Guanbing Shui had seen his power personally, it wasn't something someone else had told her. However, he was, at the end of the day, a human who as far as she knew had not yet broken through to the next stage of power on the rank of orders. A human, no matter how strong he or she might be, should have limits to what he or she can do alone. One must know that what Bai Zimin was facing was over 100,000 goblins that despite being unclassified existences were only one stage below him and he was also facing dozens of first-order goblins just like him. Finally, he was also facing 5 supreme second-order existences. But not only did he kill 4 of those 5 second-order creatures, since Shang Guanbing Shui could not sense the aura of the 4th one more now, he had also inflicted such losses on the goblin army. Only now did she finally understand how he had forced the goblins to retreat. She clenched her small white fists and gently bit her lower lip. Her sky-colored eyes shone with resolution, she was definitely not willing to be left behind. Even if she couldn't be as powerful as Bai Zimin was, her pride as a woman in her own self wouldn't allow it. Bang. 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 What's that? She muttered under her breath as she raised her guard a little more. Wasn't the battle already over? Then where were those constant explosions coming from? Soon, she arrived at the place where Bai Zimin fought the second-order goblins and understood the origin of those explosions. The body of a goblin that was clearly different from the others lay lifeless on the ground. Judging from the aura that the creature's body exuded, Shang Guanbing Shui did not take long to understand that this goblin was a second-order existence when it was still alive. Moreover, she could also see the corpses of 3 other goblins whose aura was somehow close or similar to that of the first goblin. The problem was this. Just over the dead body of the first and biggest goblin, a person wearing a full body armor as black as the starless night was shaking his fists at the speed of lightning. Bang. 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 The fists fell heavily on the face of the goblin corpse without pause. What was once a face, at this moment, was nothing more than an absolutely unrecognizable pile of pulp flesh and the once black gloves that the attacker wore were now completely bloodstained as was the front of the armor and some of the once jet black hair. Bai Zimin? What are you doing? Shang Guanbing Shui asked dumbfounded and was about to approach when a slightly cold voice made her footsteps stop dead in their tracks. Don't come closer. Wait a little longer, it will soon end. The voice was filled with warning as well as a bit of fear, surprise, and a hint of reluctance. Although it was extremely difficult to comprehend, Shang Guanbing Shui instinctively felt that it was better to obey and wait rather than approach carelessly. Bang. 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 Just like a machine that had been broken, Bai Zimin punched Geminder's corpse over and over again. Even though the head of the once main leader of the goblin race in the northern area of China had already exploded and the flesh turned into liquid after being crushed again and again, he continued. When the flesh that had turned into red liquid evaporated after being smashed by Bai Zimin's hot and powerful fists, about 10 minutes later, he stopped and slowly stood up. Finally, it's over. He sighed and his shoulders slumped as if he was exhausted. When Bai Zimin raised his head and his eyes met Shang Guanbing she could barely restrain herself from taking a step back and finally understood the reason why he had warned her earlier and why his voice sounded so foreign and distant. Bai Zimin's eyes, which had previously been black as gems, magically acquired a slight rim of crimson around the edges. It was just a flash and that crimson color disappeared so quickly that Shang Guanbing even believed for an instant that it was an optical illusion. However, she fully trusted what her eyes had just seen. N0v3lb1nnn hosted the first appearance of this chapter at N0vel.b1n. What? What happened to you? She asked with concern and a slight frown. Hearing the tone of the woman in front of him, Bai Zimin felt slightly moved. He was aware that a woman like Shang Guanbing, who was cold as ice to everyone, would definitely not fake her tone of voice just to act friendly. Since she sounded concerned about him, it meant that she really saw him as an important friend. In the end, he sighed and said exhaustedly, apparently, I just acquired another annoying skill. Another annoying skill. Shang Guanbing looked at him puzzled and tilted her head in a super cute way. Bai Zimin was in no mood to observe the beauty's behavior before him, on the contrary, he let out a bitter smile as he recalled the events that happened several minutes ago. While he was beating Gemender one-sidedly black and blue, Bai Zimin could slowly notice how his ability to reason things out with a level head as in most cases was beginning to become cloudy. All he wanted was to wipe out everything and every one of the goblins. The level of hatred he began to feel towards this race of small but vile green-skinned creatures was reaching such high levels that even Bai Zimin himself realized that it was not normal. Because he was currently slaughtering hundreds of goblins per second, it was naturally impossible for Bai Zimin to pay attention to every single record that was being engraved within his soul. As a consequence, he completely ignored any messages that appeared in his retina and focused entirely on the battle he was fighting at that moment. It was right at the instant he broke Gemender's spine that he finally realized that something was not right with his behavior. This was because while Bai Zimin had a savage and violent fighting style, making his enemy suffer in such a way was actually not something he would normally have thought of, since Bai Zimin's priority in a death fight was always to take the enemy's life before the enemy took his. This was a rule he had imposed on himself from the instant he killed that level 5 Big B. Such a rule was one that Bai Zimin had been following, until this day. Curious and a little worried about his own behavior unknown even to himself, Bai Zimin began to search through his most important records. Because he had always been looking at his records periodically with Lilith, he became quite good at it so that even when he had to split his focus he managed to find the source of the problem in no time. Because the user is in a state where anger threatens to blind him completely, one of the skills belonging to the one who walks the path of the blood berserker has been automatically unlocked. You have learned a unique skill. Anger. An emotion that all living beings feel at least once in their lives. However, there is a special kind of anger, anger in which reason completely disappears and all reason ceases. When anger reaches its peak, even the destruction of oneself to achieve a purpose is no longer madness. You have learned the passive skill Blood Berserker's Wrath. Blood Berserker's Wrath, unique passive skill. When the trigger switch is triggered, the user falls into Wrath mode. Resets the cooldown time of all skills on cooldown at the moment the user goes into Wrath mode and reduces stamina consumption by half. Increases the adrenaline flow and as a consequence increases strength by plus 400 points, increasing exponentially according to the user's anger level. The skill Blood Berserker's Wrath possesses 5 levels of Wrath, each level is activated automatically depending on the triggered switch. Side effect, depending on the Wrath step, the user's rationality will gradually begin to fade, with the 5th level being the most dangerous and lethal. This skill cannot level up. This skill cannot evolve. Switch of the first level of Wrath, threaten loved ones. Loss of rationality equivalent to 10%. Switch of the second level of Wrath, unknown. Loss of rationality equivalent to 15%. Switch of the third level of Wrath, unknown. Loss of rationality equivalent to 30%. Switch of the fourth level of Wrath, unknown. Loss of rationality equivalent to 50%. Switch of the fifth level of Wrath, unknown. The loss of rationality depends on the mental condition of the user, being able to recover 100% of consciousness at certain times but going completely insane at others. For the skill to be cancelled, the user must end and completely suppress the rage against the reason for which the skill was activated. Ignoring the fact that he had no idea what a unique skill was, when Bai Zimin can read the skill description, his first thought was that he had received a powerful skill. He was incredibly happy at first. However, as he read more and more, that happiness began to turn to concern when he realized that the skill he had just unlocked was not only powerful but also incredibly dangerous. Calling the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath a double-edged sword just like gravity manipulation was not an exaggeration at all, because while it granted the user a great deal of power, the reality was that in return the user also had to pay the consequences depending on the power received. For example, Bai Zimin could perform devastating attacks by multiplying the Earth's gravity x15 within a certain range along with his monstrous strength. However, the consequence was that even his own life was not guaranteed. The same was true for this newly acquired skill, only instead of putting his life on the line, the consequence was to lose degrees of rationality depending on the level of wrath triggered by the activation of the skill. This might seem insignificant, but the loss of rationality was extremely dangerous, as at the highest levels one would even fail to recognize even their loved ones. It was after realizing how dangerous the situation he was in even though his life was in no real danger that Bai Zimin made the decision to end the war. Even though he really had the desire to wipe out all the goblins that had come before him and that 10% loss of rationality had made his desire to completely wipe out the race of the one who threatened his loved ones, he fought against himself to restrain it. Was Bai Zimin kind? No. He was definitely not. While he did not consider himself evil, he by no means believed he was a saint. It was absolutely impossible that Bai Zimin decided to let Krier and the rest of the goblins go just because he suddenly received a glimmer of enlightenment. Bai Zimin realized that little by little he was starting to lose more and more rationality as well as control over his own actions, so scared he decided that it was better to put a stop before things got completely out of control. In the end, after Krier and the rest of the goblins disappeared from his sight, Bai Zimin stopped repressing the madness bubbling inside him and released himself completely. Gemender became an extremely pitiful existence under Bai Zimin's uninterrupted fists. After several tens of punches, the second-order goblin's head exploded and died, but even then, Bai Zimin did not stop and continued. This was because, as strange as it seemed, his anger had not yet been completely suppressed after taking the life of the one who released it. After Shang Guanbingshui heard Bai Zimin's brief but concise summary, she finally understood many things, and the strange behavior she had just seen in him finally became clear. While Bai Zimin had not told her in quality detail everything his new skill bestowed or how it worked, the fact that this skill had the side effect of taking part of the user's rationality as a consequence of its automatic activation was extremely frightening. The scariest thing about passive skills with automatic activations was that they could not be bypassed by the user. If the skill was good, then great. But if the skill was detrimental in some way, then that's where the problems began. To make matters worse, skills learned voluntarily or involuntarily could not be removed. After all, learned skills were runes that became part of one's soul. At the end of the day, it was not as if one could casually erase part of one's soul. Shang Guanbingshui knew that for Bai Zimin to have acquired such a skill, something extremely serious and important to him must have happened. Her eyes automatically moved to the lifeless body of the goblin he had been beating until recently, and despite her curiosity, she decided not to ask any questions. After all, she didn't want to make him feel sad, far from it, by remembering or thinking about bad memories. By the way, Shang Guanbingshui decided to change the topic of conversation a bit, and as her gaze fell on a shiny object in the distance, her pink lips curved slightly as she said cheerfully, "I see you've received more good items." Bai Zimin followed her gaze, and when he saw the object she was looking at, a small smile automatically appeared on his face which, despite being covered with several drops of blood, still looked handsome and added several points of heroic bravery. As Bai Zimin's soul power became purer and purer, his soul became stronger and stronger. As a consequence of this, Bai Zimin's body began to improve by leaps and bounds, as did his appearance. The current him was not aware, but Shang Guanbingshui was. That the current Bai Zimin did not lose in terms of appearance even to Chen He, who was the most attractive person in terms of face she had ever met. But this was also normal. Although Chen He's genes were somehow better than Bai Zimin's in terms of appearance, although he had suffered less from the deterioration of life due to his good family circumstances, Bai Zimin had killed no less than 100 first-order existences and 7 second-order existences. His genes had been improved to an incredibly high point after his own soul became purer and purer through absorbing and assimilating so much good quality soul power. Shang Guanbingshui couldn't help but think about Wu Yujin and what kind of reaction that girl would have when she sees him again once they arrive at the beginning village in a few days more. Naturally, Bai Zimin was not aware of the thoughts of the woman beside him. From his own point of view, matters such as his face was not something to be overly concerned about. All his attention was mainly focused on becoming more powerful as quickly as possible, and if he could become the ugliest man in the universe in exchange for being the most powerful, he would gladly and without hesitation accept the trade. His gaze was focused on the treasure orbs and other items he had received in this battle, his spoils of war. Considering how difficult and hard the battle he had just experienced was, the soul record naturally could not be stingy, or could it? Bai Zimin was no longer so sure of this after he gave it some thought. With a small frown, he walked around the grounds. His attention was mainly focused on the area where he had killed Abil, Gurino, Inak, and Gemender. Shang Guanbingshui also helped him in his search for the treasure, and with the teamwork of the two of them it took about 30 minutes. The two left no corpse unturned to make sure they were not missing anything. Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbingshui looked at the pile of objects in front of them and then looked into each other's eyes. As if they were mentally connected, they both said at the same time exactly the same words. "I think I now understand how people who hit the lottery feel." The two were stupefied, looking at each other as neither of them expected such a thing. In the end, the two could not help but burst out laughing, and Shang Guanbingshui's smile was so beautiful that fortunately there was no other human around other than Bai Zimin, whose heart was extremely difficult to be moved by beauty, otherwise, that unfortunate one might fall in love unilaterally only to end up heartbroken in the future. In front of Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbingshui's shining eyes, a large number of treasure orbs were stacked next to each other. The number might not be colossal nor enough to make those worlds that have been constantly evolving be surprised, however, for a world like Earth that had just started the evolution process less than 2 months ago, such a number of treasures appearing at the same time could be considered a rarity. I wonder if any other faction has obtained such a large amount of treasures in a single shot. Shang Guanbingshui casually inquired. There are definitely at least 200 normal treasure orbs and a few rare ones here. Bai Zimin nodded and added, in addition to the various skill scrolls, with this we will be able to build up a new troop of soul evolvers or empower the current ones even more. N0v3LTR0VE served as the original host for this chapter's release on N0v3LB1N. Because Bai Zimin's soul power was becoming purer and purer, his own soul seemed to be becoming picky as well. What did this mean? Put into simple and easy to understand words, a large amount of the unclassified soul power of the low-level goblins was rejected by his soul. What did this result in? Easy. Since the soul power was not absorbed, the soul record converted what it could into treasures or skills scrolls. Although there were no tens of thousands of treasure orbs, even though Bai Zimin killed tens of thousands of goblins, these few hundred were enough to make him happy. He even wished that the goblins would come back again so that he could obtain another few hundred of treasures more. Unconsciously, his hand moved to his leather bag and gave it a little pat. The movement was small but enough to attract Shang Guanbingshui's attention. She looked at him and chuckled as she said with a smile on her face, even though you only got a green-colored orb in this case, there were a few yellow orbs. I guess you'll be able to enjoy some extra magic-grade treasures soon. Yet. Bai Zimin nodded with a faint smile. Besides, I also got a good stuff. I'll show it to you later. Shang Guanbingshui's curiosity piqued upon hearing this. However, seeing that Bai Zimin was acting mysterious, she didn't ask further and simply nodded, deciding to wait and see. After finishing collecting all the treasure orbs, skill scrolls, and any other drops the goblins might have dropped, Bai Zimin decided it was safe to let a group of survivors enter the base now. It had been quite a while and the goblins showed no signs of returning, which meant they really wouldn't be coming back. At least, the odds of such a thing happening were extremely low, and Bai Zimin didn't think that second-order goblin named Krier would be such an idiot as to return after they encountered the incarnation of annihilation either. Approximately 10 minutes later, a large group of survivors mounted on a few buses returned to the base. The faces of many turned pale at the sight of the carnage, and there were a few who could not help but vomit as the putrid smell of death assaulted them. The few soldiers who accompanied these survivors to make sure nothing bad happened looked at Bai Zeman as if they were looking at a true god. How could they not be revering him? The young man before their eyes was the physical representation of a man with the power to destroy an army by himself. Many felt their hearts pounding fiercely, and the blood of several of them began to bubble to the brim. With this kind of leader, what did they have to worry about? Who was there to fear? The ones they should fear were those who pointed their spears and swords against them. Those who should be worried were those who dared to oppose their steps. They, as members of the faction of such a monster with human skin, would naturally benefit greatly not only now but also in the future. After a brief moment when things got slightly out of control in the presence of so many corpses, more than 300 survivors began to pierce the goblin heads in search of soul stones. Fortunately, goblin skin was not too tough, and from a certain point of view was only slightly tougher than human skin. On top of that, the survivors were using knives forged from the bones of wild beasts, so it was not a challenge to pierce their skulls at all. Still, Bai Zeman underestimated the number of slaughtered goblins too much, or perhaps he forgot that the reason why he and Shang Guan Bingshui were able to go through every single body in search of treasures was thanks to the incredibly high agility they had. Even after 2 hours, the 300-plus survivors had barely covered a little over 10,000 corpses, of which they found over 2,000 unclassified soul stones and a few first-order soul stones. In the end, another group of 600 survivors had to be called in and mobilized to help the previous one. Otherwise, even after 10 hours, it was not certain that the job would be completed, and Bai Zeman did not feel like staying another day in this place. Approximately after another 3 hours, around noontime, the more than 60,000 goblin corpses had gained another hole in their broken bodies. Those who had formed a soul stone within them were stripped of this valuable item, and those who had not were kicked aside by the survivors. While Bai Zeman could have taken all these corpses away, the truth was that the material of the unclassified goblins was not good for forging. Therefore, instead of bothering with it, he simply ordered to collect as many weapons as possible and load them into a separate truck. Even a broken bone arrow was not left behind. Of course, Bai Zeman sternly ordered to take the corpses of the first-order and second-order goblins apart. The quality of these bodies was incomparable to that of the unclassified goblins, and even if they were not as high quality as that of the beasts of the same stage, they were still good forging material. Liu Xiaoao approached Bai Zeman, and while looking at him with complicated eyes, quietly reported, "Leader, everything is ready. We can leave immediately." This young man in front of her had arrived at the North Camp a little over a week ago. He came out of nowhere and without warning, killing one of the former top leaders of the base and taking his father's position as if it was his own in the first place. At first, Liu Xiaoao was naturally upset, and in her eyes, Bai Zeman was nothing more than a barbarian who would sooner or later get his retribution. However, as the days passed, her mindset slowly began to transform. As she matured and observed the movements of this young man not much older than her, she realized that Bai Zeman was not a bad leader, and despite his imperfections as well as his vicious tendencies, everything he did was always based on the benefit of all, whether in the short term or in the long run. Therefore, her thoughts about him also began to change. Now, Liu Xiaoao felt that having such a leader was not so bad after all. Besides, with the strength demonstrated by Bai Zeman, no one in their right mind would ever dare to oppose him unless they wanted to die. Even an army of tens of thousands of soul evolvers of the goblin race was overwhelmed, while tens of thousands of other remnants were forced to flee like homeless dogs, all done by him alone. While looking at that straight back, Liu Xiaoao felt as if she was looking at an unreachable mountain. Bai Zeman stretched his hand forward, and the crimson pearl floated a few inches above it. A huge suction pole came out from inside the pearl as a strange wave of mana spread out in the distance. He activated blood manipulation, and under everyone's shocked gaze, thousands upon thousands of liters of blood floated through the air in his direction before being absorbed by the tiny pearl, disappearing without a trace. No matter how many times they saw it, they still did not cease to be amazed. The scene of seeing countless drops of blood floating down and filling the skies was by no means small enough not to be shocked. After absorbing as much blood as possible and separating it according to quality inside the liquid storage pearl, Bai Zeman pointed his right hand towards the mountain of corpses, and with a thought the skill of the blazing ring on his index finger was immediately activated. Crimson flames flew out to form what appeared to be a fire dragon, engulfing the corpses of the unclassified goblins. It was only a few seconds before a huge bonfire seemed to ignite in the middle of the now destroyed base, and the smell of death permeated the area. A few minutes later, the sound of engines echoed all around, and with the sun blazing high, a motorcade of over 200 large and small vehicles set off in a southerly direction. The vehicles soon disappeared further into the distant horizon, leaving behind as the only evidence that they were ever there a large mountain of corpses that seemed to weep in silence as they slowly turned into nothing but ashes, which the night breeze would spread across what not long ago was a terrifying and bloody battlefield. The journey back south had its pros and cons compared to when Bai Zeman, Shang Guan Bingshui, Nangong Yi, and Nangong Lingzhen had traveled north to take control over the North Camp. One of the clear advantages was that when the group of 4 led by Bai Zeman advanced northward, they had to clear a section of the road. This was improved even more when the large group led by Fu Suifeng and Kong Lan responded to Shang Guan Bingshui's call and also headed north. Basically, although there were some obstacles such as vehicles that were overturned by wild beasts, the entire road was clear, and except for worrying about some areas destroyed by some massive-sized creatures, the convoy of vehicles was able to progress smoothly at a much faster speed than before. However, this advantage was basically nullified by the 2 major disadvantages. 1. The number of vehicles was much larger due to the large number of survivors. In order to avoid getting separated and thus prevent possible deaths or straying, everyone's speed had no choice but to become more moderate than it actually could be. 2. The heavy weight of the corpses of many wild beasts that could not be dismantled in time due to Bai Zeman's rush to return to the beginning village as soon as possible. These giant corpses caused the speed at which the vehicles were moving to fall by default, and since no one wanted to push the engines any harder than they already did, the speed could only be kept to a reasonable maximum. 2 days later, Bai Zeman was sitting in the back seat of a very large military jeep. This military jeep was found in a village not far from their current position along with several dead bodies and bullet shells. Bai Zeman and the rest estimated that a small military group probably found some trouble in that place as there were several human corpses on the ground along with a big number of zombies. Beside him, Shang Guan Bingshui had her eyes closed, and judging by the slight movement of her upper body as well as her steady breathing, Bai Zimin could easily tell that she must be asleep. Even though it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it wasn't as if they had much to do but sit around bored, and sleeping was probably the best thing they could do since that way time would seem to fly faster and they could also keep their stamina points always at the maximum possible for any battle. While Bai Zimin was enjoying the silence riding near to the head of the convoy, news came from the front just in time as the survivor driving the jeep stopped the vehicle. "Leader, we've got some problems straight ahead." The voice of one of the team leaders leading the advance came from the vehicle's radio. Bai Zimin recognized the person's voice immediately, remembering that this was one of the few soldiers who decided to risk his life to become a soul evolver. In fact, this person was currently level 18 and was one of the most respected soul evolvers while being extremely loyal to Bai Zimin since thanks to him, this man named Lianju went from being a mere officer to someone with prestige and honor. "Lianju, report the situation." Bai Zimin calmly replied as he looked to his side and noticed that Shang Guanbing Shui was already fully awake and attentive. "Roger that." The person named Lianju immediately responded and began to narrate the events. About 1 minute later, Bai Zimin finally understood everything and calmly replied, "Got it. I'll be right over. You guys hold your positions and don't let the creature get close. If it gets too near, simply do what is necessary to stop it. I'll most likely get there first though." Lianju replied in the affirmative and soon the communication was closed. Bai Zimin looked at the woman sitting next to him and said calmly, "That's the way things are. I'll be right back." "Okay." Shang Guanbing Shui replied in a slightly lazy voice and without much worries. Seeing the usually stern Shang Guanbing Shui act like a sleepy little girl, Bai Zimin didn't know whether to laugh or cry while the driver almost couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Of course, Bai Zimin knew that the reason Shang Guanbing Shui was acting like this was because she had full confidence that he would be able to solve the problem that had arisen. Otherwise, she herself would be the first person to step forward. It was just that in this case there was no need. After opening the door of the military vehicle, Bai Zimin stepped out. "Leader, do you have orders for us?" Several team leaders of soldiers and soul evolvers leading 10-man squads approached as they saw him get out of the jeep. All of them had just received the report from the convoy's leading head, so several were hoping they could accumulate some merits even if they were small. "No need." Bai Zimin shook his head and waved his hand as he calmly said, "You guys keep the engines running, we are departing again soon." Without waiting for a reply and putting some power on his feet, Bai Zimin burst out with the speed of lightning and disappeared from everyone's line of sight in an instant just like a ghost. The various soldiers and soul evolvers who witnessed this were not surprised as they had seen how incredible their new leader was. However, the driver of the military jeep in which Bai Zimin was riding together with Shang Guanbing Shui could not help but gasp. Shang Guanbing Shui gave him a sidelong glance before completely ignoring his reaction. She turned her attention to the scenery outside and as her blue eyes mirrored in the glass no one knew what she was thinking. Bai Zimin's movement speed was surprisingly high even if he didn't use all of his agility to avoid consuming too much stamina. Moreover, since the vehicle he was riding in was a short distance from the front, it didn't even take more than 5 seconds to reach the front area. By the time he got to the front area, there were already several people outside the vehicles. All of these people were either soldiers with firearms or soul evolvers with swords, spears, maces, and other types of melee weapons. As for the normal survivors, to avoid problems they all traveled in the center of the vehicle formation, being protected from the front and from the rear. This way it would be much more difficult for any enemy to raise commotion in case one appeared, as even in the midst of the survivors there were some troops stationed to maintain order and security. "Leader." Fu Suifeng and Kong Lan immediately approached when they saw him arrive. Although their relationship with Bai Zimin was very good, enough to be allowed to address him more freely compared to the rest, they both treated him with respect when there were more people around. After all, Bai Zimin had to maintain a certain status and prestige in the eyes of the masses to avoid being treated too casually. Bai Zimin nodded and looked at Kong Lan before asking, "How are your injuries?" Kong Lan smiled slightly as she heard his question and noticed the slight concern in his voice. She answered honestly, "Thank you for asking, leader. But don't worry. My shoulder is completely healed now and my hand will be as good as new by tomorrow." As if to prove her point, she moved her back and shoulder muscles so that Bai Zimin could see that she was really a lot better. She even waved her hand gently as proof that the fractures were almost completely healed after being treated with magic for 3 days counting today. "That's good." Bai Zimin sighed and nodded with a faint smile towards her. Even though his faction now had another healer, Kong Lan was by far a lot more powerful than Wang Ji. After all, Kong Lan's mana and magic stats were the stats of a genius in contrast to Wang Ji's average stats. After making sure that Kong Lan was alright, Bai Zimin walked to the front, calmly crossing the thick defensive line that had been formed by several armed officers and soul evolvers. All of them were looking forward with a bit of tension. Approximately 300 meters ahead there was a bridge connecting a sub-district to another sub-district and it was necessary to pass through there to get to the other side. The other way was to cross the deep water river that ran below, which was clearly not feasible as terrifying beasts could occasionally be seen looming out of the water for brief moments. If a human fell into the water by accident there was no doubt that they would be devoured in an instant, and even a powerful soul evolver could not resist too long before falling in. After all, humans were land creatures not sea creatures. Another way to reach the south was by the road that Nanggong Yi and Nanggong Lingzhen had traveled when they fled from Kong Rong's son back then. It was just that this road had several deviations that made it more difficult to travel. It was precisely for this reason that the Nanggong siblings traveled through this area, as it was good for losing their pursuers. Seeing the bridge, Bai Zimin sighed wearily as he realized that they would lose more time here. Previously, all the vehicles blocking the road had been moved aside so the passage was supposed to be completely unobstructed. However, forget about encountering a clear path as it was supposed to be. Bai Zimin estimated that were it not for the existence of the soul evolvers, even a day's work carried out by 100 people might not be enough to clean up the mess in front of his eyes. The bridge was extremely long, at least 3,000 to 4,000 meters. As far as the eye could see, a large number of different-sized creatures lay lifeless on the bridge along with several overturned or wrecked vehicles. There were even some parts of the bridge that had been destroyed and were currently collapsed onto the structure. But this was not the only problem. Moving vehicles and dead creatures were not the only obstacles present. Bang! 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 A strange creature approximately 5 meters tall was making the ground vibrate with every step it took, and the bridge seemed to be struggling to support it. The strange creature's body was covered in a thick layer of slightly purple skin, its swollen muscles were the size of a truck and its legs were as thick as a small house. In the strange creature's right hand was the body of a giant wild boar of about 2 meters. It was just that in comparison, the boar's size was insignificant and unworthy of mention. The creature seemed to notice the humans in the distance as it used its large red eyes to look at them, causing the gunmen to unconsciously step back and only the soul evolvers to barely stand their ground. But what happened next made even the evolved humans shudder in fear. The strange creature raised its right hand into the level of its mouth before taking a ferocious bite on the giant boar's back, causing hot blood to splash on its body and face, which gave it an extremely ferocious appearance. Fu Suifeng swallowed saliva and said, a little unsure of himself, "Big BR leader. That thing. Is that thing a zombie?" Bai Ziman nodded and said indifferently, "It seems to be a first-order zombie whose evolutionary path is brute force." When the others heard his words of confirmation, they all trembled at the same time as their eyes flashed with worry. Like all other conscious living beings, zombies had also been evolving non-stop. While so far the strongest enemies that Bai Ziman's faction had encountered were the wild beasts, this was because the district they were in was mainly plagued by forests. However, the most dangerous and terrifying enemies for humans were actually the zombies. Zombies were the main enemy that mankind had to worry about the most at this time, as they plagued the world with their overwhelmingly higher numbers. Moreover, zombies were the only creatures that had infinite stamina, as they did not need rest or sleep. They could attack endlessly and even ignore any kind of pain. "Do any of you wish to fight against this zombie?" Bai Ziman asked casually as he looked around. Bai Ziman had no interest in the giant zombie. To him, these first-order existences did not represent the slightest of challenges, and although the soul power was tempting, he preferred to let his troops train. After all, first-order existences were not cabbages that grew everywhere and were still rarities. This could be seen by the fact that even after going deep into one of the district's forests for a whole night, Bai Ziman had barely managed to hunt down 2 or 3 of them. His words had not finished falling when a voice immediately rose up. "Let me do it." Bai Ziman turned slightly and looked at the person who had just spoken. It was Nangang Lingzhen. "Are you sure?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. From Bai Ziman's point of view, Nangang Lingzhen was a powerful soul evolver. It was just that she was mainly focused on defense rather than offense. "Don't worry, I'm sure." Nangang Lingzhen nodded confidently and stepped forward. "After finishing off all the beasts the other night, I got a good skill that I've been wanting to try, but the opportunity hadn't presented itself until now. Let me do it, please." "It's fine with me." Bai Ziman nodded but then frowned as he said in a serious voice, "The problem is that you can't let the bridge fall. Do you think you can do that?" N0v3lb1nnn hosted the first appearance of this chapter at N0vel.b1n. Nangang Lingzhen used her 2 beautiful honey-colored eyes to look at him and nodded firmly as she said in a confident voice, "Believe me. With my barrier, even if that zombie wants to take down the bridge, it won't be able to do that." Those words were a bit arrogant. This was especially the case because Nangang Lingzhen was still an unclassified existence, while the giant zombie 300 meters away was clearly a high-level first-order creature. After thinking about it for a brief moment, Bai Ziman finally nodded and calmly said, "All right. You can have it yourself in that case." Even if problems arose, wasn't he there to solve them? Besides improving himself, Bai Ziman really needed Nangang Lingzhen to become as strong as possible in the shortest possible amount of time. Her energy barrier skill was very valuable to Bai Ziman, as her defense was even greater than Shang Guanbing Shui's Ice creations. The more powerful Nangang Lingzhen became, her usefulness to him and the amount of help she would be able to give him in the future would increase accordingly, so no matter how Bai Ziman looked at it, there was nothing to lose. Nangang Lingzhen's eyes sparkled with gratitude as she looked at the young man in front of her. She was fully aware of how important this bridge was to Bai Ziman. A single mistake meant that they would all have to turn around to go back the way they came and thus find another way. If that happened, not only would the 2 days of travel so far be wasted as well as fuel and food, but they would also have to travel another 2 days to retrace their previous steps. After finding another road, they would have to slowly clear the route, as unlike this one, probably no large group had passed by there to have the need to move vehicles and other obstacles. In the end, they would probably lose about a week of time before finally reaching the beginning village. To say that the bridge before them was a treasure was not an exaggeration from a certain point of view. At least, it would be one until all the vehicles crossed to the other side. Therefore, Nangang Lingzhen felt a little touched by the trust Bai Ziman was placing in her. Of course, she was aware that with him present, major mishaps were unlikely to arise. But this did not diminish her inner joy at all. N0v3lb1nnn hosted the first appearance of this chapter at N0vel.b1n. "Be careful." Nangang Yi approached and said in a deep voice as he looked at his younger sister. Other than his father in beginning village, his sister was the only thing he had in this life, and losing her would leave him devastated. Nangang Lingzhen said nothing and simply nodded firmly. She was aware that if she received even the slightest scratch from the giant zombie, it would be all over for her, although considering the power that monstrous beast was demonstrating, it was likely that one slap would be enough to crush her small body. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, she advanced with firm steps while maintaining her head up and looking at the giant zombie that was still tasting its food without worrying at all about the army in the distance. She wore leather armor that clenched every curve of her body tightly and clung to her figure perfectly, exposing part of her white thighs and her waist along with the junction of her limbs to prevent her movements from being obstructed to a great extent. Her extremely hot body, especially the bust area, continually attracted the gaze of countless men no matter where she went. In fact, were it not for the fact that it was widely known that Nangang Lingzhen was not only a powerful soul evolver on the verge of breaking through the barrier to the first stage of real evolution, as well as one of the 3 people who came alongside the supreme leader to conquer the North Camp, it was highly likely that some powerful official would have tried to do something to obtain her. Although using strength was firmly forbidden and was punishable with death, if it was not exposed, no one had anything to worry about, and a woman with a seductive beauty like Nangang Lingzhen's was enough to tempt and cloud the thoughts of most men. Naturally, so far there had been a number of men with prestige and some power who had approached Nangang Lingzhen in an attempt to woo her or to gradually get closer. However, she did not seem interested in romance. This led many to believe that, perhaps, she was only interested in a one-night relationship, which was also fine with them. After all, A young 27-year-old woman like Nangang Lingzhen should also have her own physical needs in the bedroom. Unfortunately, this did not seem to be the case either, since the last time someone dared to make an indecent proposal to her without the slightest tact was beaten black and blue by her own hands. In the end, Nangang Lingzhen became a sun-like existence. She was beautiful and extremely hot, but if anyone tried to get close to her, they would definitely get burned. Ignoring the heated gazes she felt pricking her back, Nangang Lingzhen advanced with her head held high like a proud and arrogant swan. She wasn't worried at all, even though she knew that the difference in power between the giant zombie and her was definitely great enough to die in an instant if she was hit. The reason behind her confidence came from the fact that she precisely needed to be attacked. The giant zombie noticed a tiny human approaching its area and stopped its movements, ceasing to eat the body of the mutant boar it had killed and captured earlier. Roar. A terrifying roar came out of the beast's mouth, and just when everyone thought it was a warning sign, the giant zombie raised its right arm high in the sky and extended it backward. Then, under the stupefied and scared gaze of everyone, the creature swung its arm fiercely forward and released its grip on the mutant boar's corpse. The 2-meter-tall but incomplete body literally flew like a cannonball towards Nangang Lingzhen. The different soldiers and soul evolvers were terrified to witness this, and many of them even closed their eyes as if they did not want to see the scene of such a beautiful flower being crushed. Even Nangang Yi could not help but worry for the safety of his beloved sister. The strength with which that giant zombie had thrown that animal's body was enough to compete with him after activating all of his power-up skills. This did not mean that Nangang Yi could compete against the giant zombie at all. After all, a scratch meant the end. It was precisely because of this that he did not dare to step forward when Bai Ziman suggested that one of them deal with the beast. Nangang Lingzhen did not panic and instead hurriedly extended both hands forward. Her mature voice rang out. Barrier. Flash. Multicolored light flashed in her soft palm, and in an instant, the light spread out to form a 3-meter-wide barrier whose thickness was comparable to that of a normal concrete wall. Bang. The mutant boar's corpse powerfully impacted against the barrier erected by Nangang Lingzhen, causing the barrier to shudder fiercely and even tiny cracks to appear. Nangang Lingzhen's curvy body shuddered for a second before she gritted her teeth and expended a small portion of her mana to repair the damage on the barrier. She could not afford to have her barrier destroyed, as the consequence would be to suffer a huge backlash. For a few seconds, the resulting strength after the throw made by the giant zombie caused Nangang Lingzhen to have trouble resisting. However, when this strength was completely nullified, all that remained was the natural weight of the mutant boar's corpse, and this no longer posed any challenge for her. The giant zombie roared again before beginning its forward charge. Although it was like a raging bull, its agility was only around 40 points. This, while enough to make a normal human despair and completely different from the slow movement of normal zombies, was no big deal in Nangang Lingzhen's eyes. Nangang Lingzhen reduced the size of her barrier to only 1 meter wide, which also caused the required mana consumption to be reduced to 1/3 compared to the previous 3-meter-wide barrier. Then, she activated the skill she was eager to test. Her thick red lips moved slightly and she whispered in a voice that only she could hear. Reflect. A huge wave of invisible mana burst outward and in an instant blasted the giant zombie's body. Bang. The beast was taken by surprise, and without even knowing what happened, its charge was stopped as it was forced to take several steps back. A bizarre roar escaped automatically from its bloodied mouth, while the right arm, the place that received the impact, bled continuously. Awesome. Nangang Yi relaxed as he shouted in joy and surprise. Even he didn't know that his sister had gotten her hands on a skill of such quality. The night the beasts attacked the North Camp's base, Bai Ziman had said that the scrolls and treasures everyone obtained from their hunt that night would belong exclusively to them. This caused many to become much more powerful overnight, and in return, Bai Ziman gained even more prestige among his troops and stronger soul evolvers. Bai Ziman was also slightly taken aback, as he could not even notice how it was that Nangang Lingzhen attacked at the first instant. He didn't expect her to acquire such a good skill, but he wasn't upset either, as he knew that if it was him who slew the beast she killed, which was probably first order, he definitely wouldn't have received anything due to the huge power difference. Nangang Lingzhen did not wait for the giant zombie to recover and instead leaned her body forward as she ran at full speed to begin what was a fierce melee combat. After all, despite the fact that she was a mage, her skills were focused on melee and ranged fighting equally. The giant zombie steadied its body and swung its fist downward with the intention of crushing the small ant-like human. Bang. The fist the size of a giant truck cab impacted harshly on Nangang Lingzhen's barrier, causing the cracks to reappear. However, the cracks were soon repaired and the same thing happened as before. Bang. The wounds on the giant zombie's right arm opened even wider and the beast let out a roar that sent chills down the spine of everyone watching the battle from a distance. Apparently, this first-order zombie was not immune to pain like the unclassified zombies. Nangang Lingzhen seized the opportunity and unsheathed her sword from her small waist. With a swift movement to the side, she jumped and slashed the zombie's arm. Although it was just a normal slash with no ability, her sword was a rank 1 weapon with over 400 physical attack damage. Surprisingly, when her sword struck the zombie's skin, a clanking sound echoed across the battlefield. She frowned as she felt the hardness transmitted from the blade of the sword to the hilt. Her frown deepened slightly as she noticed that she had barely managed to pierce 1 centimeter of skin. Considering how thick the beast's arm was before her, even 1,000 cuts would not be enough to pierce it completely. The giant zombie suddenly grabbed a nearby family-sized car and used it as a weapon to smash Nangang Lingzhen. She, fortunately, was counting on her barrier to save her life. Boom. The weight of the car, the weight of the giant zombie's arm, the gravitational force as well as the strength that the creature had used to defy the frictional force caused by the wind, all came together as one and caused dozens of cracks to appear on the magic barrier. Nangang Lingzhen's little mouth opened slightly and a small grunt of pain escaped from her half-open lips. She immediately gritted her teeth, and to prevent the cracks from spreading further she increased the supply of mana to the barrier. Flash. The multicolored glow over the barrier increased several folds and the cracks disappeared without a trace. Followed by this, Nangang Lingzhen's voice sounded again and only the zombie with 0 intelligence heard it. Reflect. Boom. The left arm with which the zombie was clinging to the car suddenly bent at an impossible angle backward, and a roar that shook the bridge caused the eardrums of several armed men 300 meters in the distance to start bleeding. Bang. The giant zombie's body fell to the ground and Nangang Lingzhen seized the opportunity as she activated another of her reserve skills. When Nangong Lingzhen arrived at the beginning village together with her older brother and her injured father, she decided to join without hesitation after hearing that apart from losing part of her freedom there were only benefits. Of course, all this downplaying the matter of a possible betrayal, but the her of that moment never thought of betrayal since no matter how powerful she or her brother were, they definitely could not survive alone for a long time and even less so with their father, who was just a normal man without any power. After Kong Lan healed her father, she and her brother Nangong Yi met Shang Guan Shui and shared their skills with her. Immediately after that, they both officially joined the faction that a young man named Bai Ziman was leading and began to team up with other soul evolvers and armed troops to gather supplies and expand the controlled area while searching for survivors. A week later, Nangong Lingzhen met Bai Ziman. Since she was new into the faction and it was the first time she had met him, she naturally had to talk about her skills as well. It was just that Bai Ziman's attention had mainly focused on her energy barrier, ignoring the skill that was then one of her two. As time passed, Nangong Lingzhen acquired the skill lightning movement after consuming the lightning fruit that Bai Ziman bestowed to her not long ago and the skill reflect after killing a first-order beast, so her active skill pool was 4 and would be only one away from the limit set by her power scale were it not for the fact that one of these skills had been obtained through the consumption of a natural treasure. Lightning movement, energy barrier, reflect, and her fourth active skill was a not too flashy one but still useful in certain circumstances. For example, this skill was very useful in the current situation. Seeing the giant zombie fall, Nangong Lingzhen didn't even hesitate for an instant as she hurriedly sent out a mental thought along with a mana wave to stimulate the rune that had a strange drawing engraved on the surface. Cat's eyes. She muttered and immediately felt a slight stinging in her eyes that for an instant forced her to blink. When her eyes opened a moment later, the world before her did not seem to have changed at all and for an instant, she even went so far as to think that the skill had not been properly activated. However, when Nangong Lingzhen looked at the giant zombie that was struggling to stand up with some difficulty due to its size and weight, she noticed that there were several fluorescent green dots marked on the giant zombie's body, dots that previously she could not see with her honey-colored eyes but with her current light green eyes she could. Cat's eyes, first order active skill, level 2, consumes 20 mana points to activate and 1 point every 3 seconds to keep the skill active. Effect, increases the user's vision range by 50% and increases perception by 15%. When fighting against enemies whose size is at least 3 times that of the user and whose strength exceeds the user will be able to see the weak points of an enemy that does not exceed the user's level by more than 30, thus pointing out places where the defense is especially low. After deactivation, Cat's Eyes goes into cooldown for 3 hours. N0vel_Bien hosted the premiere release of this chapter. The sword in Nangong Lingzhen's hands flashed under her sharp and swift movements. Rays of sunlight reflected off the blade of the sword constantly and with each swing of her wrist it was as if countless sword slashes were sent towards different parts of the giant zombie's body. The giant zombie roared in pain as it received several attacks in sync on areas that were not only its weak points but were also in poor condition due to the injuries it had suffered earlier. Nangong Lingzhen's attacks were fierce and precise. She not only attacked the giant zombie's arms but also attacked its eyes, throat, legs, etc. It was only a few seconds but in that brief moment, the giant beast's body was bathed in its own blood. Nangong Lingzhen's sword, which previously could barely break through the giant zombie's defense, now seemed to have been transformed into a legendary sword as it easily pierced through the skin and flesh of the mutant creature. Swoosh! As she focused on attacking, a breeze of wind from one of her sides snapped her out of her murderous frenzy and without even looking hurriedly moved the defensive barrier to that side. Bang! The giant zombie had swung one of its legs like a whip and the blow had been so strong that Nangong Lingzhen was forced back a dozen meters even though her body had not been hit directly. A thick crack appeared on the magic barrier and even though Nangong Lingzhen was constantly supplying mana, that crack was only slightly repaired but did not disappear completely. This was proof that she was running out of mana and draining fast. Ugh! A small whimper escaped from her lips as she used her sword to stop her body. Maintaining 3 active skills was by no means a simple task for an unclassified existence like her. Even less so when all of these skills were of first order. Realizing that she had to end this quickly, Nangong Lingzhen did not give the giant zombie a chance to stand up and ignoring the pain she felt in her chest charged forward like a fearless and brave tigress. The giant zombie evidently could not move with complete freedom due to its exaggerated muscles obstructing its own movements. However, its power was undeniable. Seeing that the hateful human was coming back for more, the giant zombie's red eyes glowed viciously and with a ferocious roar, it smashed its hand up and down. The air pulsed and the atmosphere seemed to freeze as a result of the beast's strength. What was worse was that with the magic barrier damaged, Nangong Lingzhen knew instinctively that it would not be able to withstand this attack. All or nothing. Nangong Lingzhen gritted her teeth and deactivated her defensive skill, completely giving up on defense since it was of no use at this point. However, even though she deactivated one active skill, she used her remaining mana to activate the only active skill in her arsenal that had not been used by her in this day so far. Lightning movement. Lightning crackled over her leather armor, illuminating her flawless skin and sending chills up and down her body. Only a few inches from being struck, her limber waist swayed tantalizingly and an instant later she seemed to disappear from her previous position. Boom. The zombie's giant hand struck the bridge, causing it to shudder and under everyone's startled eyes, the part that had just taken the impact broke away from the rest. The bridge was about 100 meters wide, but now, a large amount of concrete flew straight down and hit the waters below hard. A huge wave rose high in the sky and as the river water swirled fiercely, several creatures appeared near the surface, baring their sharp teeth menacingly. There was even a small goldfish that had mutated and was now comparable in size to a shark before the apocalypse. It was clearly a powerful first-order beast. Seeing approximately 10 meters of the initial part of the bridge being ripped away by the giant zombie's ferocious swipe, Bai Ziman did not panic at all. As long as there was room for the caravan to pass it was enough even if they had to pass that part of the bridge one by one. Swoosh! Nangong Lingzhen appeared right above the chest of the huge beast. Her size was completely disproportionate compared to the creature beneath her feet, similar to an ant next to the walls of a house. When her now green eyes due to her cat eye skill met the beast's red eyes, all Nangong Lingzhen saw in that gaze was murderous intent without the slightest sign of intelligence. But even if there was, the creature before her eyes had long since stopped being human and the condition of its body was proof of that. A tiny fluorescent dot that would normally be impossible to reach due to the size difference entered Nangang Lingzhen's eyes as she stared right at the center of the monster's forehead. With barely a couple of seconds remaining before her mana was completely consumed, she stepped forward and stabbed ahead with her sword. Puchi. The tip of the sword's blade easily pierced the creature's forehead, burying itself beyond the skull as if it were a hot knife cutting through butter. Nangang Lingzhen's body bowed and she made use of her own weight to plunge the entire blade of her sword all the way to the hilt into the monster's head. The giant zombie shuddered for a moment before its mouth let out a strange sound and its movements froze completely. Nangang Lingzhen put a foot on the beast's face and then pulled her sword back. Blood slowly flowed from the small hole along with small fragments of what appeared to be brain matter, giving the already hideous creature an even more horrifying appearance. You have absorbed the soul power of First Order Brutal Zombie level 42. You have obtained Strength plus 67, Agility plus 7, Health plus 42, Stamina plus 64, Mana plus 19, Magic plus 18. Nangang Lingzhen gasped heavily and needed to make use of her sword to steady herself without falling. Her body was bathed in sweat. Some strands of her lustrous dark hair had stuck to her lovely pale face while her chest rose and fell repeatedly as proof of how desperately her lungs were searching for air. Not bad. A slightly lazy but with a hint of praise voice came from somewhere, attracting her attention. Nangang Lingzhen raised her head and used her tired eyes to look up at the top of one of the columns supporting several decorative bars on the bridge. There, sitting on the edge of the column, the shadow of a person was vaguely distinguishable under the bright sun behind its back. Although she could not see him, she knew that this person was Bai Zeman as his voice was unmistakable. That self-confidence was clear as day and as big as the sun. A happy smile automatically appeared on her face, causing many men in the distance who saw this to feel their throats go dry. Nangang Lingzhen was happy, how could she not be? Even though she was only a level 25 unclassified existence, she had just defeated and killed a first-order existence higher than level 40 with her own hands. Even if all the conditions had been set before her to win, a victory was a victory. However, the exhaustion of not only stamina but also mana made Nangang Lingzhen finally unable to take it anymore. Unable to help herself, her eyes closed and her body weakened, slowly losing her grip on her sword. Swoosh! A large glowing red hand caught her body before she fell while another smaller hand grabbed the sword and returned it to its sheath. Bai Zeman waved his hand casually and the red hand flew into the distance. As Nangang Lingzhen was slowly lowered by the giant blood hand under everyone's surprised eyes, Bai Zeman's voice rang out. Nangang Yi, you take care of her. The rest of you, prepare to move. We are leaving immediately. Bai Zeman confirmed that there was no soul stone in the giant zombie's head, and by the time everyone raised their heads, he was nowhere to be seen. He had disappeared like a ghost, as quickly as he had appeared. Nangang Yi hurriedly took his sister's body in his arms and retreated from the front, entering a vehicle and personally taking care of her until the moment she woke up. Nangang Lingzhen's heroic bravery along with her strength and fighting ability had been demonstrated before all. Many men felt ashamed of themselves and those who had previously had the idea of wooing her could not help but feel unworthy. Nangang Lingzhen's heroic bravery along with her strength and fighting ability had been demonstrated before all. Many men felt ashamed of themselves and those who had previously had the idea of wooing her could not help but feel unworthy. With the death of the First Order brutal zombie that was blocking the road, now all that was left was to slowly start moving the vehicles at the front that had been overturned or sent flying into the middle of the bridge by the sudden movements of the beast or some battle that may have broken out there. After Bai Zeman retreated from the front lines, several soul evolvers and armed soldiers carefully advanced and began to move out the troublesome vehicles cautiously to clear the way. On the other hand, Fu Suifeng stepped forward and aimed Infinite Reduction, the epic grade treasure, and pulled the trigger in the direction of the brutal zombie's corpse. The energy beam immediately began to work and in a matter of seconds, the creature's body had been reduced to a small miniature. Then, with the teamwork of several soul evolvers, the body was moved to one of the modified trucks. Most of the soul evolvers had followed the advice of the veterans, focusing mainly on 3 stats, strength, agility, and finally stamina. These 3 were the main stats to ensure minimum safety in combat against zombies and other enemy creatures. Regardless of whether it was in movies or books, Bai Zeman had always seen or read that raising a mage was much more difficult than raising a warrior. Now, he was experiencing it in real life. Anyone could be a warrior, but not everyone could be a mage. This was because not everyone had a high magic stat at the beginning of evolution like Kong Lan, and distributing points to that stat at the beginning of the apocalypse was not a good idea unless someone powerful protected you until the time you got big enough. This was precisely what happened with Kong Lan, since at the beginning she was the weakest by far, needing everyone's protection until several days later when her investment in mana and magic began to show its fruits. You took longer than I thought. Any problems? Shang Guanbing Shui looked at Bai Zeman curiously as she watched him return to the interior of the vehicle. He ordered the driver to start the engine again and then looked at her before replying, "It's nothing important. It was just a giant first-order zombie blocking the road to the south. Nangang Lingzhen took care of the creature splendidly." "Oh." Shang Guanbing Shui raised an eyebrow in surprise and said lightly, "That's quite surprising. I think other than the past you, Chen He, and myself, probably only XIETIAN has the ability to fight against a first-order existence despite being only an unclassified existence. To think that Nangang Lingzhen would also become so powerful. Fighting against an existence one stage higher was a bit odd but not too surprising either. There were always several beings in every world capable of accomplishing such a thing. On the other hand, killing a higher stage existence was considered an amazing feat in the entire universe. Relatively speaking, very few existences had the ability to do such a thing, each and every one of them were geniuses among geniuses, beings capable of becoming higher existences if they did not fall before reaching the necessary requirement. Even though Nangang Lingzhen's enemy was exactly the kind of enemy she did not fear thanks to her skills that were perfectly suited to combat strength but slow type existences, a victory was indeed a victory. You, Evangeline, XIETIAN, Nangang Lingzhen, Chen He. Bai Zeman calmly reviewed aloud, for now, you 5 can be said to be the central pillars of the faction. Although Fu Suifeng, Kong Lan, Zhongde, and Nangang Yi are extremely powerful, they still need a signature skill, something that becomes their fatal moves to take the life of someone who surpasses them in terms of power. Shang Guanbing Shui was silent for a brief moment, and after some thought, she realized that Bai Zeman's words made a lot of sense. Leaving aside Bai Zimin himself and Shang Guanbing Shui herself, Evangeline, Cai Jing'ai, Nangong Lingzhen and Chen He had their specialties that somehow made them stand out from the rest. For example, Evangeline's whole body was a lethal weapon. Cai Jing'ai was not only fast and quick to learn the use of different weapons but also extremely cunning like a fox. Nangong Lingzhen possessed a powerful defensive skill capable of withstanding the blows of a being in a higher order, which served to buy time and seek a path to victory. Chen He possessed a very high talent for melee and ranged combat, which if not for monsters like Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbing Shui would probably make him the most powerful of the faction. All of the aforementioned had in some way or another the ability to oppose beings that surpassed them. They were true geniuses, some of them were born privileged as was the case with Chen He while others had to work hard to get where they were, as was the case with Evangeline. I think you also forget one person. Shang Guanbing Shui suddenly thought of something and pointed. Bai Zimin looked at her puzzled, and after a moment, he asked, Who? It's Yu Jun. She said earnestly. Yu Jun? Bai Zimin blinked blankly before the image of a beautiful young woman appeared in his mind. Even though it had been little more than a week, for an instant he had even forgotten Wu Yujun's existence. After all, a lot had happened during this period of time. Even though her skill plant empowerment allows her to fight several hundred enemies and even thousands at the same time, I don't think the current her possesses the ability to fight a first-order being while she is an unclassified existence. Bai Zimin reasoned calmly. Wu Yujun was undoubtedly powerful. In the entire faction led by Bai Zimin, apart from Shang Guanbing Shui, Wu Yujun was the only one with the ability to be able to kill hundreds of enemies in an instant as long as she had plants or seeds around her. However, this was not enough to consider her a genius, at least, not from Bai Zimin's point of view. N0vel_Bien hosted the premiere release of this chapter. As the vehicles began to move again, indicating that the march had resumed, Shang Guanbing Shui gently shook her head and said something that greatly surprised Bai Zimin. Currently, Yu Jun has already become a first-order existence 3 days ago. Oh. That's great. Bai Zimin was naturally pleased. A first-order existence might be nothing in his eyes, but for a faction as it was, a first-order existence was no different from a powerful guardian in general. But Shang Guanbing Shui was still not finished. She continued. Do you know what was one of the requirements Yu Jun had to complete for the soul record to allow her to break through? Bai Zimin narrowed his eyes slightly as an idea flashed in his heart. Looking at him silently, she stared at him to study his expression before slowly saying. To advance to first order, Yu Jun had to defeat a first-order plant-type creature and obtain a first-order soul stone by herself to then evolve her plant empowerment skill to the next stage. Bai Zimin's eyes lit up upon hearing this, realizing what those words represented. After a moment of silence, he chuckled and said quietly, I guess you can count her too then. MHM. Shang Guanbing Shui nodded in satisfaction and didn't say much more. She just hoped that her best friend's efforts would not go unnoticed by the person she was trying to surprise to catch his attention. Time passed very slowly, especially since the trip was extremely tiring and boring. Since no one had anything to do, 90% of the time was spent inside the different vehicles, the only reason they got out was to prepare food and eat. Except for meal times, all the survivors spent all their time in the vehicles and even slept in them. While many were anxious to get off, no one said anything, much less dared to complain. They were all people who had already seen with their own eyes how cruel the outside world was and were aware of how blessed they were to have people willing to protect them. The various drivers of the vehicles rotated every 6-hour turn, allowing the others to rest and spend time with their loved ones. Throughout the ride, while the caravan encountered a few zombies or mutant beast attacks, nothing too major happened. All problems were solved before they grew to become headaches for the soldiers or soul evolvers. There was not even one instance where Bai Zimin's strength required presence so he was able to relax. Although it was not much, the fruits of his efforts were slowly beginning to show. Although these fruits were still small and unripe, at least he began to see and understand the reason why Lilith always tried to make him build an army that would follow his commands. If everything required his presence in act, Bai Zimin might fall due to exhaustion or neglect important things due to lack of time. *****. 3 days later. A huge caravan composed of more than 300 large vehicles was moving at a steady speed along one of the main roads leading to Baikwin Sub-District, the sub-district bordering Yanqing District and Chongping District. In the distance, the drivers of the first vehicles in the caravan caught sight of a large lineup ahead, which caused them to unconsciously slow down. A large troop of armed men consisting of 200 soldiers neatly dressed in military uniforms and another 200 men dressed in light armor and swords were firmly guarding the passing road, and anyone who wanted to force their way through this area would definitely have to pay a huge price. As apart from this troop of 400 men, there were also several vehicles with mounted weapons and some heavy machine guns on top of what appeared to be a large wooden wall. The first vehicle leading the caravan stopped 100 meters away and little by little the rest of the vehicles following the lead vehicle slowed down until finally coming to a complete stop. A modified military jeep came out from inside the base, stopping 50 meters away from the caravan. The doors opened almost simultaneously, and 4 people got out, 2 men and 2 women. All 4 appeared to be young enough to be college students. One of the males was burly and tall with a serious look, the other was handsome like an elf from the legends and his bright eyes sparkled with excitement as he stared at the vehicle from a short distance away. As for the women, one of them had a small and lithe body along with a witty smile on her face, the other had an incredibly sexy body coupled with an angelic face and pure eyes that stared at the vehicle from a short distance with the same intensity as the aforementioned man. The lead vehicle started up again, moving forward and stopping 10 meters away from the modified military jeep. The doors of the lead vehicle opened in unison and slowly, 4 people descended. As in the previous case, those who descended were 2 men and 2 women. The 8 people looked at each other in silence for a few moments, each one of them with different thoughts. Although they had not seen each other for several days in the midst of this chaotic world, being far from each other by a distance of several days' travel, the 8 did not feel in any way strange when they met again. After all, these 8 had fought countless battles together since the first day the world changed with the appearance of the soul record and the activation of the world's mana. The 8 of them had been part of the initial team that, after much effort, not only managed to escape from the university that had then become a prison but also managed to form together what was now a large faction with almost 10,000 survivors and a powerful army of armed and evolved men. The four people who descended from the modified military jeep were Zhong Dai, Chen He, Cai Jing and Wu Yuzhen. On the other hand, those who had descended from the lead vehicle of the huge caravan were Fu Suifeng, Bai Zimin, Shang Guanbing Shuat, and Kong Lan. None of them knew if they would still be alive tomorrow. Safety was not a guaranteed thing for anyone, and each of them was aware that perhaps a moment later it would all end. However, as they had done in the past and as they had done to this day, they would fight. They would fight together. After all, for better or worse, the 8 of them were a team. Bai Zimin's thoughts were probably the most indifferent. He was using his sharp eyes to see if he could get anything from the aura of the people before him to understand what level of power they were at. However, he didn't have too much free time to think or to analyze things, as one of the women on the other side did something that shocked him. Wu Yuzhen looked at the 4 people in front of her for an instant. However, this instant was so brief that she even forgot the presence of her best friend after half of a blink of an eye. All her attention was automatically focused on a single person, as if her eyes were attracted by a great and powerful magnet whose attraction was so great that it could not be avoided, but she also did not fight against that attraction and let herself be deeply drawn in. As she looked at the face from 5 meters away, Wu Yuzhen noticed how her heart began to beat erratically and her emotions that had been running wild for almost half a month threatened to go out of control. This was a familiar face to her, but at the same time different, a face she had not seen for almost 2 weeks. He had become even more handsome than before. Such a thought flashed in her heart and a complex light shone in her eyes. How many handsome men had Wu Yuzhen met in her life? Too many to count. How many of these men had tried to woo her favor either by their family backing or by her natural beauty? Too many to count. Yet, in the face of the man before her eyes and the one person reflected in her gaze, they were all as insignificant as a small wooden boat in the middle of a stormy sea. None of them were worthy of raising waves, let alone fighting the storm that was capable of deciding when a wave would rise. When was it that she began to feel attracted to the young man before her? Wu Yuzhen knew the answer to this question. The moment when her emotions began to change and when this young man began to attract her eyes wherever he went was precisely that fateful day. That day when despair weighed on her weak but firm heart, when with the eyes of a wild beast he faced a large number of zombies and even battled with what was then a supreme existence at the university. It was at that time that Bai Zimin somehow gained the attention of a proud woman like Wu Yuzhen, and she, who was like a swan that never gave a second glance to a man, did not notice how slowly that slight curiosity periodically turned into attraction until it became what it was today. Was what she felt for Bai Zimin love? Wu Yuzhen did not know. It was impossible to know. After all, what was love to begin with? There was no clear answer to this question, just as there was no single, absolute description for the word that this emotion represented. However, if what she felt was not love, then what was it? On the first day that Bai Zimin left for the north to conquer mankind in that area, Wu Yuzhen slept peacefully and did not think too much about it. However, when she woke up the next day, the first thing she did was to look for him unconsciously, only to later remember that he was no longer at the base. It was from the second day that the problems began for her. Sleeping became challenging, the taste of the mutated beast meat that was a treasure began to be tasteless and graceless, her queen-sized bed no longer felt as comfortable as in the past, the cozy nights in the mansion she shared with her friends became cold, etc. Chen He often visited her, after all, they were friends since childhood and could practically be considered siblings. He had told her many times that she had lost weight, that her face was beginning to lose its color and brightness. But Wu Yuzhen could do nothing despite being aware of these facts, she could do nothing, she could not fight the wild longing that burned in her heart, more and more anxious to see the face of that person once again and to hear his confident and firm voice. Several days ago, Wu Yuzhen asked Chen He if he did not miss Bing Shuat, the way they both called her. Chen He replied that of course, he missed her madly and could not wait for the days to pass faster to see her as soon as possible. At that time, Wu Yuzhen did not continue with the topic and simply nodded, however, her heart was filled with doubts. If Chen He was just like her and longed so madly to see the person he loved, then why were they so different in their behavior and attitudes? Why was it that while she could not sleep or eat properly, he could still rest comfortably and enjoy delicacies even more delicious than those of the past? Was Wu Yuzhen wrong? Was Chen He wrong? Was she really in love as she thought she was? Was Chen He as much in love as everyone thought he was? In the end, she could not find a precise answer to any of these questions. However, she did find an answer that in one way or another left her satisfied. If she cared enough about a man to lie awake at night, lose her appetite because she didn't know if he was eating properly, and not be able to enjoy the warmth of her home because she was unaware if he was getting cold. So this had to be love. There was no other option. If what she felt wasn't love, then what was it? Obsession? Wu Yuzhen did not believe that the emotion called obsession was capable of taking away the sleep of a woman like her who always had everything and with such a proud personality. If she wasn't as proud as she was, maybe it could be. However, such a thing was not possible because Wu Yuzhen loved herself too much to become senselessly obsessed with a man. Now that the person guilty of her difficulties appeared before her once again, she unconsciously wanted to cry and shout out her grievances. Even though the man she was looking at could not really be blamed, Wu Yuzhen felt as if she was a little child being bullied, and it was exceedingly difficult to hold back the tears that threatened to fall at any moment. With thousands of eyes watching, she could not afford such a thing. After all, her position was too important, and showing weakness at such a time could cause some instability in the masses. As she stared at that pair of black eyes looking forward with calm and even a touch of indifference, Wu Yuzhen did not notice at what moment, but before she knew it her small steps had brought her to be at a distance close enough to be able to smell the scent that belonged only to him. The scene of him was peculiar, but if Wu Yuzhen had to describe it, it would be in 2 words, Lycoris radiata. This was a very peculiar blood-red flower native from Asia, also known as flower of hell or flower of the underworld. Such a unique type of scent and fragrance, the representation of danger. A kind of danger from which there was no escape. It somehow suited the type of person the man before her was. Bai Zimin looked at the beautiful woman in front of him, dumbfounded. What was she approaching him for? Somehow, he believed Wu Yuzhen would run to Shangguan Bingshui like in many movies when friends close enough to be sisters met again. Even more so considering how dangerous the current earth was. However, before he could inquire about it, Wu Yuzhen reached one of her small hands forward and clutched at his shirt. Then, under the surprised gaze of the other 7 people nearby, she brought her face close to his firm chest and took a deep breath. Then another. And then another. And another. Wu Yujun, who felt lost, seemed to have finally found her place in the world. While delicately holding the border of his shirt, she began to take deep breaths, completely ignoring people's gaze and forgetting for a moment any feelings of embarrassment. Ah! This kind of scent is really intoxicating. She thought as she unconsciously took a step forward, wanting to feel more of the warmth emanating from his body and wanting to be embraced by the male hormones that surrounded him. Bai Zimin was at a loss for words and for an instant didn't know how to react. As if he was looking for answers, he looked at Shang Guanbing Shui waiting for some kind of explanation. Shang Guanbing Shui completely ignored Bai Zimin's gaze and instead looked at her best friend who seemed to have completely lost herself in her own world. Her beautiful sky-colored eyes flashed with a complicated light at the same time as her heart realized that the woman she considered as close as a sister might have fallen too deep into the river of love to emerge to the surface again. Seeing Shang Guanbing Shui say nothing but noticing the complicated light in her eyes, Bai Zimin finally realized one thing he had been ignoring. This chapter made its debut appearance via N-O-V-E-L-B-I-N. Even if he was inexperienced with the opposite sex, he was not an idiot. He wasn't a dense guy incapable of noticing something so obvious. Apparently, Wu Yujun had really started to truly love him. This truth hit Bai Zimin very hard and for an instant he could only stand there, not knowing what to do. He would be lying if he said that he did not feel flattered that a beautiful woman of the highest level like Wu Yujun was attracted to him. However, nothing was simple. Leaving aside the fact that the current Bai Zimin had first to find his family before he entertained the idea of any kind of romance, the matter of love was one he preferred to avoid even though he was fully aware that he could not avoid it forever. After being bitten by a snake, you will be afraid of ropes for 10 years. In the past, Bai Zimin suffered and it was only by good fortune that he managed to get back on his feet. Even though he had already overcome what happened at that time, the fear of the memories he had experienced was not something that could be erased just like that. Therefore, he could only stand there, frozen, letting the beautiful woman do whatever she wanted while he tried to find answers to his questions. Zhongde, Cai Jingii, Kong Lan, and Fu Suifeng looked at each other with complicated smiles as they watched the scene unfold before their eyes. The 4 of them were fully aware that Wu Yujun was hugely interested in their leader, it was just that they did not expect her to do something so daring in front of so many eyes. On the other hand, Chen He sighed in his heart at the sight of this. However, his attention refocused on the beautiful silver-haired woman a short distance away and his heart that had been quiet during this time jumped back like a crazy horse. Shang Guanbing Shui was looking at Bai Zimin and Wu Yujun when she suddenly sensed a person approaching and even without looking, just based on the other party's aura, she immediately recognized who it was. After all, she and this person had known each other for a long time. I'm glad you're okay. Although he had so many things to say to her before, Chen He felt stuck when he was in front of her. In the end, he could only say the first thing that came to his mind and the first thing he thought of when he saw her. Shang Guanbing Shui smiled slightly and nodded as she calmly said, I'm also glad you're well. Chen He looked at Wu Yujun and Bai Zimin out of the corner of his eye before saying in a low voice, looks like Yujun finally couldn't hold it in anymore. Shang Guanbing Shui looked to her side and nodded without saying a word. She didn't want to talk too much now as she still had to think carefully about what to do with Chen He. After what seemed like an eternity, Bai Zimin finally regained control over himself. Slowly, he put his hands on the small shoulders of the woman who clung to him tenderly, and gently pushed her back. After what seemed like an eternity, Bai Zimin finally regained control over himself. Slowly, he put his hands on the small shoulders of the woman who clung to him tenderly and gently pushed her back. Wu Yujun was shocked and for an instant felt like crying as she felt that her confession had just been rejected even though she had not said a single word, which was not necessary, as it was difficult to be more direct than she was being. Fortunately or not, just as Wu Yujun felt as if everything was crumbling before her and within herself, Bai Zimin's words pacified her. We should go inside. We have a lot of work to delegate. We'll have time for warm moments, it's just that this isn't a good time. His voice was calm and his eyes were as relaxed as a lake that had been silent for countless years as he looked at everyone. Even the way he looked at Wu Yujun was not awkward at all despite what had just happened. Why yes. Wu Yujun hurriedly nodded as she looked into his eyes with a slight blush on her baby face. With so many survivors joining the base, the change in the overall structure will be huge. Besides, a lot of things also happened during this time that needs urgent checking. Seeing the woman in front of him leave it at that, Bai Zimin was secretly relieved. He would already find time in the near future to settle this matter, it was just that currently, it was not the right time. Shang Guanbing Shui also nodded and before Chen He could say what he had in mind she entered the vehicle from which she had exited a moment ago. Then, from the outside, her image could be seen beyond the front glass of the vehicle as she gave orders to the several leaders waiting in the caravan. Chen He secretly smiled bitterly and forced a smile as he watched this. In the end, he also shook his head and walked towards the military jeep after greeting Bai Zimin and the rest. The union of approximately 5,000 survivors was not a simple task for the beginning village. Things could be much simpler if these 5,000 joined gradually and slowly, but when they all joined at the same time everything became a little too complicated. The new survivors needed houses according to their different statuses within the faction, the spaces where relief food was distributed on a daily basis needed to expand, those who had power and prestige in the North Camp needed to adapt to the change as they slowly began to get to know the upper echelons of the beginning village, etc. There were too many things that required time and it was not something that could be taken care of in just 1 or 2 days. Fortunately, Bai Zimin had the help of people like Cai Jingii, who not only led a powerful army of soul evolvers but also possessed great authority when it came to politics. With Cai Jingii, Luxiao, Wu Yujun, and several other people working as a team, everything slowly began to take shape. The only thing Bai Zimin had to do was to delegate orders from behind the scenes and make slight changes to some things that had been dealt with in a manner not too appealing to him. Another 4 days passed in an instant and the beginning village was extremely noisy. Bai Zimin walked through the streets of his establishment and as he observed the situation around him, a feeling of pride was naturally born in his heart. During his absence, the other leaders were not slacking off as although the process of conquests had slowed down, the number of lands controlled and surviving under his faction had been steadily increasing. At this point, Bai Zemin's faction had over 8,000 survivors, which meant that in the span of his absence beginning village had received the arrival of approximately 2,000 more survivors. However, the person who had worked the hardest while he conquered the North Camp was undoubtedly Wu Yujun. Thanks to her, many things had changed for the better. Big brother, I want to eat that. A cute and sweet voice reached Bai Zemin's ears, pulling him out of his inner thoughts for an instant. Bai Zemin's body was dragged away and when he looked beside him he saw the pretty Luoning pulling his hand in the direction of a stand where a woman was selling some candied fruits. Thanks to Wu Yujun, who invested not only a lot of time but also part of her own resources obtained to boost trade, the various survivors began to cheer up and try to start a new life in this new world. Mankind needed to start adapting and moving forward. They could not stay stagnant forever. While it was temporarily impossible to implement a new currency, a simpler method of payment had been created where there were different colored tickets that represented a certain amount of food of different types. With this type of method, employees in different types of jobs began to receive tickets in the form of payment that they could use to buy whatever they wanted instead of receiving a fixed rate of food. In addition, these colored tickets had been created using a special paper that only grew from a mutant plant that Wu Yujun was sure no normal person could have since she could only cultivate it thanks to her own skill as well as a huge amount of luck. There were even some soul evolvers who started hunting wild beasts and then selling the meat or setting up their own businesses. After all, while every soul evolver was in some way or another tied to the army, in their free time they were free to hunt and do whatever they wanted with their spoils of war. Bai Zemin looked at the woman on the other side of the candied fruit stand and then asked, "Little Ning, choose whatever you want." Luo Ning nodded with a big smile and then began to look at the products with sparkling eyes. The current Luo Ning had already reached level 24 and was a powerful warrior despite her young age. Even if she was young and small, the pay she received was very high to the point where she could be considered a rich young miss within the Bai Zemin faction, making her the major supporter of her home and surpassing her elder brother Luo Cheng with ease. However, Luo Ning still loved to make others buy sweets to her as during these 4 days she took advantage of any instance when Bai Zemin was free to drag him around with her to the different stands, using her charm to force him to buy delicious delicacies to her. While waiting for Luo Ning to make her decision, Bai Zemin felt a gentle tug on his left sleeve and looking beside him saw another little loli looking at him with spoiled kitten eyes. "Xiang Feng, is there anything you like? Big brother will buy it for you," he said with a small smile. Xiang Feng's eyes sparkled at these words and then she did not hesitate as she pointed to a caramel apple. Although she was a year older than Luo Ning, Xiang Feng was just an ordinary girl who would shortly start her schooling again. Still, Bai Zemin did not push her away just because of this and when the girl wanted to and he had time, he would also take her out for a walk. Soon, Luo Ning had also made her decision. She had chosen a banana with chocolate. "And, how much for these two? I see you have two cute little sisters here." The woman at the stand smiled gently as she took what Bai Zemin asked for. The thought of him being a pervert never crossed the woman's mind as everyone in the establishment was fully aware that the high command punished such behavior with death regardless of who the offender was. Bai Zemin did not know whether to laugh or cry upon hearing this. If not for the fact that he was waiting for some people to arrive, where could he be here wasting his time? 2 chocolate bananas and 2 caramel apples. A red ticket will do it. The woman finally handed the candy to the girls with a smile, not worried that they wouldn't pay her at all since not far away there were several officers patrolling the area. This was another proof that security was considerably good in beginning village, another reason why the eyes of the survivors no longer looked hollow and lifeless. A red ticket was equivalent to 200 grams in food and was the ticket whose value was the smallest of the 7 food tickets introduced. While this was not a good measure, at least it was better than nothing until a new currency was intruded, a currency that the survivors would not be afraid to use for fear that the faction would fall, but that would take more time, power, and gaining everyone's trust. Bai Zemin took out a bundle of papers of various colors and the woman's expression changed noticeably when she noticed several violet tickets. The violet-colored ticket was the most precious and a single one was equivalent to 100,000 kilograms worth of food. The person in front of her had several of them. Who is this person? The woman almost died of shock and could barely calm down a bit when she finally realized that fortunately she did not disrespect the young man in front of her in any way or she could get into big troubles. The initial instance of this chapter being available happened at N0, Val, B, J, N. Someone with such wealth definitely could not be someone common. When this thought popped into the woman's mind, she didn't dare to act as casual as before and immediately said in a trembling voice, "This. You don't need to pay." Although this was her livelihood, she knew that she could not offend people with great power or even if the rules were strict for everyone some people might find ways to make her life miserable. Bai Zemin was confused at first, but soon realized his mistake and could not help but smile bitterly. These tickets were handed to him by Wu Yujun a couple of days ago while he, she, and some other people were having dinner together. As Bai Zemin was the highest leader of the establishment, naturally he could basically do as he pleased so these tickets were just useless paper in his eyes. However, in other people's eyes, these tickets were symbolic of status and power, something he had unconsciously overlooked. And, that's not how it works. Bai Zemin shook his head and placed a red ticket on the counter. You work and therefore you will receive your payment accordingly. Those are the rules and everyone must follow them. This. The woman looked at the red ticket and hesitated. However, before she could say anything else the young man in front of her had already turned and carried the 2 little girls away, disappearing into the crowd in an instant. Bai Zemin spent approximately 2 hours together with Luoning and Xiang Feng before the relaxation hour was over. Xiang Feng was handed over to her mother by Bai Zemin while Luoning clung to him as they were heading to the same place. While holding the girl's hand, Bai Zemin made his way to the building where the important meetings were being held, moving further and further away from the masses. By the time he reached the area near the building, except for a few armed troops no survivors could be seen roaming around. After all, this was a private area and only a few were allowed access. Inside the building, in the meeting room, approximately 100 people were gathered in small teams, muttering quietly to each other. If it were in the past, it would be impossible for so many people to fit into just one room. However, a few days earlier, several walls of the building had been knocked down and the hall had been enlarged, so now even if the number of people doubled compared to today, there would still be enough space to accommodate them all. Sheng Guan Bing Xuet, Chen He, Wu Yuzhen, Cai Jing Fu Suifeng, Zhongde, Xiaoming, Yan Tu, Lu Xiaoao, Lu Yan, Luo Cheng, Gu Tao, Old Ji, and many more. Each and every one of them was either powerful soul evolvers, leaders of a team of at least 50 armed men, or were in high positions among the pyramid of power. It looks like the king will make some changes. Xiaoming spoke quietly to Luo Cheng. Luo Cheng nodded and muttered, from what I understand, he finally thought of a power scale to differentiate us all. I heard Miss Wu Yuzhen say that the structure of the army will change now that our troops number is close to 2,000. So far, the casual army structure that Bai Zeman had set up with Chen He's help had no problems, and launching small-scale attacks on some surrounding villages or forming teams to go in search of supplies or survivors was not a drawback. However, a couple of days ago, Fu Qigong, who was an experienced ex-military man, raised problems that Bai Zeman had not realized before. After all, Bai Zeman was just an ordinary young man before the apocalypse. Regardless of how powerful he had become after constantly evolving by absorbing soul power, things like establishing an army or organizing troops were not something he was experienced in. Even with the passive skill Special Forces soldier, all Bai Zeman gained was the combat experience and weapons knowledge of humanity's best soldiers before the apocalypse. As far as army organization was concerned, he was basically a blank slate. One of the problems with the current situation of the army was that the highest level the men could reach so far was the position of team leader. With this kind of crude setup, it would be extremely difficult for others to rise through the ranks and therefore it would be difficult for everyone to give their best. No one would try too hard if, at the end of the day, there were no juicy rewards waiting behind all that effort. Only people like Fu Suifeng, Kong Lan, and a few others had different positions comparable to those of a commander or captain, but even then these positions were not very clear as the teams were too dispersed, which made it difficult to mobilize the troops in times of urgency, needing too much time to respond in times of crisis. After discussing the matter with Fu Qigong for almost an hour, Bai Zeman finally realized that he had to make some changes. Even more so after Wu Yuzhen informed him that the Beiquan camp and the team led by Zhongde had some differences of opinion that although they did not lead to fatalities, several evolvers from both sides were injured. The Beiquan camp and Bai Zeman's faction were destined to be enemies. After all, Bai Zeman needed to rule China's mankind in less than a year's time, so, such great powers with the ability to oppose his rule could not be allowed to stand. In addition, he needed to pass through the area covered by the Beiquan camp if he wanted to reach the neighboring district where his family was located. According to Wu Yuzhen, some people from the Beiquan camp came to request their surrender and hand over all power, or else they would be branded as traitors of the country and the people. Of course, Wu Yuzhen simply scoffed at this and sent them back where they came from. What a joke. She was the granddaughter of the second most politically powerful person in all of China, but a small mayor and a platoon commander armed with a few tanks wanted to brand her and the faction she had worked hard to slowly shape together with many trusted friends as traitors. Wu Yuzhen barely restrained the urge to laugh in the face of Camp Beiquan's envoy at that time. However, that encounter basically sealed any possible friendship. Unless something big happened, Bai Zeman could not imagine how his faction and the enemy camp could come together on good terms. In the end, Wu Yuzhen, Chen He, Sheng Guan Bing Xuet, and Fu Qigong along with Bai Zeman worked for almost a full day to form a very simple but extremely useful new scale of military power. Although the positions to be filled were not many because the current army was only around 2,000 men, in the future many would have the opportunity for advancement and a goal to fight for. 4 days after Bai Zeman's return to Beginning Village and after the survivors of the North Camp began to adapt to their new lives, Bai Zeman had called each team leader to the government and military building. A huge table had been set up along with several chairs. As more than 100 people chatted with each other, the status of the past did not matter at all. Before the arrival of the soul record on Earth, some were mechanics, others were farmers, businessmen, soldiers, police officers, students, and so on. Although the past of each of them was different, due to the change of the world they were forced to fight to survive and adapt, finally being gathered under the command of a young man. Leader Xiaoming, you have been following the king from the beginning. I am sure you will get a good position, said a soldier named Rong Tao. Xiaoming shook his head and while looking at a couple of people, he pointed out, that's not necessarily so. Zhongde, Fu Suifeng, Kong Lan, Cai Jing and several others have followed the king even before me. Even Luo Cheng, despite not being a soul evolver, his little sister Luoning is a brave and fierce little tigress whom his majesty holds in high esteem. I'm afraid the competition is not easy at all. The same kind of conversation but with minor differences could be heard everywhere. Just at that moment, Bai Zeman walked into the room wearing casual clothes next to little Luoning, who was clinging to his hand while looking at the surroundings of the great hall with curious eyes. As soon as Bai Zeman made his appearance, the gaze of all the team leaders focused on him. They all looked at him with glittering eyes and the murmurs and whispers disappeared practically in an instant. Bai Zeman walked to the main seat and calmly sat down before taking a calm look at the faces of those present. Although there were many people inside the hall, some of whom were from the beginning village and others who had come from the North Camp as was the case with Lu Yan, Bai Zeman could recognize each and every one of them. After all, these people were chosen by him or recommended by his trusted men to occupy the position they were currently in. We will officially begin the meeting. Wu Yuzhen, please. Bai Zeman said in a deep voice, releasing just a hint of his extremely pure soul power. The reverence in the gaze of most grew while others were greatly shocked. Among them, Chen He seemed to be looking at a ghost as it was hard for him to imagine how someone's soul power could become as impressive and heavy as Bai Zeman's as even though he clearly wasn't aiming to hurt anyone, Chen He felt his soul shudder for a split second. Wu Yuzhen slowly stood up and everyone's gaze instantly changed focus, focusing on her immediately. The current Wu Yuzhen had a small smile at the corner of her lips, and it was obvious that this smile was not only a professional smile but it was a smile of real happiness. The twinkle in her eyes when her gaze met Bai Zeman's caused some people to start whispering quietly for a moment before the room fell silent again. Her entire body seemed to radiate an aura of confidence that while it was always there now seemed to have increased in several folds. This confidence did not come from her strength, nor from her intelligence, much less was it the result of her high birth, it was confidence born from her existence as a woman. During the last few days, although Bai Zeman had not given her a clear answer and none of them had mentioned what had happened before, Wu Yujun had noticed that he did not reject her in any way in the days when they were working as a team. She sometimes noticed that he was deep in his own thoughts while looking at her. At the very least, Wu Yujun knew that Bai Zimin was no longer completely indifferent to her, and that was a big step from her point of view. Shang Guanbing Xuet, who was sitting just to the right of Bai Zimin, noticed this change in her friend. Her blue eyes shifted between the two's faces and a peculiar glint in her gaze masked her inner thoughts. We will now announce the appointments settled by His Majesty. Effective from today, the military teams formed before are completely dissolved and the governmental positions will cease to exist. 2 different columns of power were created, being one for the fighters and one for those who are part of the tactical team supporting the front lines from the back. Wu Yujun took some documents and began to slowly announce in a clear voice. From now on, regardless of whether you are military, soul evolver, or logistics personnel, everyone will stop receiving food as a pay basis and will be paid with different colored food tickets depending on each person's rank. This chapter made its debut appearance via N-O-V-E-L-B-I-N. I will begin by first explaining the power distributions. Wu Yujun paused and looked at Bai Zimin. Seeing him nod, she continued. As had been mentioned several weeks ago, a nobility system will be implemented and will begin to go into immediate effect. However, there have been some changes compared to the past. Starting from today, our faction will be called Transcendence and the government will be divided into 7 noble levels. Level 7 nobles the lowest of the echelons within the nobility and level 1 nobles the highest. As far as the army is concerned, the division will remain the same regardless of the future number of troops. However, in the future, as our faction's army grows, the scale will increase. Now, I will announce the army structure chosen by His Majesty. From largest to smallest, the division will be Legion, Brigade, Battalion, Team. At present, the total number of armed troops our Transcendent faction possesses leaving aside the Soul Evolvers is 1,597 soldiers. Each team will be composed by 100 soldiers, each battalion will be composed by 2 teams, each brigade will be composed by 2 battalions, and finally, each legion will be composed by 2 brigades. Wu Yujun paused for a moment to look at the report in her hands and could not help but feel proud of Bai Zimin, unconsciously also feeling proud of herself as if he was her man. With the arrival of the North Camp and the unification of both factions after his conquest, the number of troops shot up by more than 100% and that number was continuing to grow with the applications of survivors to join the army. At the present time, due to the limited number of armed troops, only 2 legions of armed troops will be formed, but this number will grow in the future. However, there will be a 3rd legion composed exclusively by soul evolvers. Wu Yujun announced calmly and ignoring everyone's stare, she continued. Our Transcendent faction currently has 712 soul evolvers, which will be immediately integrated into the 3rd legion whose name will be Blood Spear Legion. This 3rd legion will be under the direct command of a single person, His Majesty. Except when His Majesty is not present and the situation warrants it, no one will be able to command or mobilize the troops of the Blood Spear Legion. Wu Yujun paused and looked at the faces of the people in the room, causing everyone to hold their breath. Now that the new structure had been announced, it was clear that there was only one thing left to do. Now, I will announce who will be the leaders of each team, battalion, brigade, and legion. Along with this, the person designated will also be given a level of nobility consistent with their position, and from that point on, the person who will manage their respective position will go on to receive a monthly payment in accordance with that position within the faction. Everyone's breathing stagnated for a moment and many could not help but clench their fists, especially those with the greatest chance of obtaining high positions. After all, this was a crucial moment as many would rise and others would fall. No one wanted to fall. No one wanted to be overtaken by those in a position similar to theirs. However, in times of change, it was impossible to avoid such things. Now, I will proceed to announce the positions of everyone according to the new power structure. Wu Yujun announced and while reading the document in her hands continued, before I continue, I would like to clarify that the top positions for each major position will all be soul evolvers. Please keep that in mind. Many people were excited, some were relieved, and others smiled bitterly as they shook their heads after hearing Wu Yujun's last words. While many of those present were soul evolvers, there were others who were not. After all, not everyone had the courage to face strange beings that mutated in foreign ways. According to the current armed forces of our Transcendent faction, the 1st Legion will be composed of, as mentioned prior, 2 brigades, totaling 800 armed men. The name of the 1st Armed Legion will be Bloodsword and the commander of the Bloodsword Legion will be Zhongde, who at the same time will receive the title of Noble Level 2. The vice commander of the Bloodsword Legion will be Nanggong Yi and he will receive the title of Noble Level 3. The captain of the 1st Brigade of the Bloodsword Legion will be Xiaoming and will receive the title Noble Level 4. The vice captain of the 1st Brigade will be Liu Yan and will similarly receive the title Noble Level 4. The captain of the 2nd Brigade of the Bloodsword Legion will be. The lieutenant of the 1st Battalion of the 1st Brigade will be. The lieutenant of the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Brigade will be. The sergeant of the 1st Team of the 1st Battalion will be. The sergeant of the 2nd Team of the 1st Battalion will be. Wu Yujun paused for everyone to finish comprehending what had just happened and noticed that the people who were named looked incredibly happy. Although Zhongde's expression did not change, it was clear that he was satisfied with the treatment he was receiving and felt that showing loyalty to Bai Zimin in the early stages of the apocalypse was worth it. On the other hand, Liu Yan smiled bitterly as he realized that in the span of almost 2 weeks he had gone from being one of the top leaders of a faction to become the 2nd in command of a brigade that made up an even larger legion. However, after a moment's thought, he realized that it all made sense. Hadn't Bai Zimin told him that his position would be far less than what he could have gotten if he decided to join him 100% back then? Now, I will pass on to the naming of the 2nd Legion of our Transcendent faction. The name of the 2nd Legion will be Blood Whip Legion and its immediate commander will be Chen He, who will also receive the title Noble Level 2. The position of Vice Commander will be held by Fu Qigong at the same time he will be awarded with the title Noble Level 3. The captain of the 1st Brigade of the Blood Whip Legion will be. With this, the positions for the 2 legions, 4 brigades, 8 battalions, and of the 16 teams have been decided. Wu Yujun announced in an indifferent voice. In total, 30 military positions and 30 noble titles of different levels were conferred depending on the position and importance within each legion, which was not small. However, in this room, there were about 100 people waiting for an assignment. Realizing that it was all over, many were extremely disappointed while others were confused. Wu Yuzhen completely ignored whether some were sad or not and went on to explain, "Now, I will continue with the Blood Spear Legion and its structure. As mentioned earlier, the position of the main leader of the Blood Spear Legion will be held by His Majesty Bai Zeman and only he has the right to mobilize this unit in normal times. Under required circumstances, the command of the Blood Spear Legion will fall into the hands of Shangguan Bingshui, who will at the same time receive the title of Noble Level 1 and whose power goes into immediate effect." Saying this, Wu Yuzhen looked at her best friend out of the corner of her eye and could not help but smile, feeling joyful and proud of her accomplishments. Shangguan Bingshui's eyes also sparkled slightly and when she looked at Bai Zeman she couldn't help but let her cold eyes mellow a little. She was truly proud of herself, for this position that had just been conferred upon her had been achieved through her own efforts as well as her constant demonstration of self-worth. From a very early age, Shangguan Bingshui suffered from a deep trauma as she witnessed her mother suffer. Although she hated politics and all that went with it, she dreamed of one day occupying a high position, the higher the better, so that she could show her mother and the whole world that a woman did not need a man to reach high, to spread her wings and fly. Now, although the position she held was only of importance in the faction of Bai Zeman and to the outside world it was nothing more than a joke to laugh at, as she looked at the young man calmly observing everything from the main seat she felt extremely confident, sure that sooner rather than later her position would be big enough to shake the whole world. Everyone looked at Shangguan Bingshui, some of them with envy and others with flattering smiles. While many expected this kind of outcome in some way, hearing the verdict was something completely different from mere speculation. The current Shangguan Bingshui was literally above all and only below one. Then, let's continue. Wu Yuzhen was about to continue, but when she looked at the name below Shangguan Bingshui her expression froze for a moment. She looked at Bai Zeman with pleasant surprise, and as she saw him nod, a smile as beautiful as a flower bloomed on her face, lighting up the hall completely and making most men's hearts beat uncontrollably. Unconsciously, she straightened her back more, highlighting her assets even more than they already were as she announced in a cheerful voice, "While Shangguan Bingshui will be the second leader in charge of the Blood Spear Legion, I will be the assistant deputy leader and according to His Majesty's wish I will be granted the title of Noble Level 2, the effect of which begins to work immediately." Wu Yuzhen was incredibly happy. How could she not be? The position she had just been bestowed was incredibly high. It meant that the man she loved trusted her enough to give her such great benefit and power. As Bai Zeman looked at her, he sighed in his heart as he silently apologized. The real reason why he granted this position to Wu Yuzhen was not fair at all, and even he felt bad about what he was doing. With Wu Yuzhen in love with him, the chances of her betraying him were basically nil. Moreover, with her close to Shangguan Bingshui, in case the beautiful silver-haired woman decided to do something against him it was very likely that Wu Yuzhen would do her best to stop her and there was even some chance that she would report it to him. Even with his passive skill Stoneheart in continued effect, Bai Zeman couldn't help but feel a little bad about what he was doing. While he wasn't playing with a woman's emotions before him, it also wasn't fair to give her hope that he honestly didn't know if he could ever reciprocate. However, what choice did he have? At the moment he was basically alone, surrounded by strangers whom he had just met a little less than 2 months ago. He needed people to confide in. No, more accurately, Bai Zeman needed people he didn't need to worry about a possible betrayal. With no one in which he could trust completely, scared of being betrayed and not only dying but also suffering emotional pain, the lives of thousands on his shoulders, the possible fate of his race, etc. There were too many burdens on Bai Zeman's back. Any other young man his age would have collapsed long ago. Perhaps he did not realize it, but the fact that he was showing guilt towards Wu Yuzhen for what he believed he was doing wrong was incredible in itself. This was because his emotions were constantly affected by a powerful third-order skill. Unbeknownst to Bai Zeman himself, his personality and character were slowly being molded into the shape of a new him. Cai Jing II will receive the title Noble Level 2 and will be the leader of the 1st Brigade of the Blood Spear Legion. Kong Lan will receive the title Noble Level 2 and will be the deputy leader of the 1st Brigade of the Blood Spear Legion. Fu Suifeng will receive the title Noble Level 2 and will be the leader of the 2nd Brigade while Evangeline will receive the title Noble Level 3 and will be the deputy leader. The leader of the 1st Battalion of the 1st Brigade belonging to the Blood Spear Legion will be. The deputy leader will be. The leader of the 2nd Battalion. Wu Yuzhen paused to drink a cup of water as her throat felt a little dry after speaking practically without rest for so long. After announcing the structural order of the Blood Spear Legion, which would be solely composed of soul evolvers, she finished. This concludes the military and social restructuring of our faction. In all, a total of 48 noble titles of level 4 and higher have been granted, which gives the appointees plenty of privileges. All those who were not named among those present will receive the title Noble Level 5 and depending on whether you are a soul evolver or not you will go on to join one of the newly established legions. After saying those words, Wu Yuzhen sat down and laid the papers on the wooden table before finally looking at Bai Zeman. Even when she tried to mask it, it was quite difficult to hide her emotions after what she did several days ago. Wu Yuzhen felt extremely fearless at this moment. Bai Zeman silently observed the rejoicing expression of some as well as the bitter or dissatisfied expression of others. He knew that even though many might not be happy with the treatment that was bestowed upon them, no one would say anything. There is one thing I would like to clarify before we conclude today's meeting. He said with a deep voice and sharp eyes, those with a higher level of noble titles should not be too complacent. The reason you were granted this title is purely based on your contributions made to the faction up to today, but your noble level could fall in an instant the next day and your position snatched away by someone else. Those who did not receive a clear position or who are not satisfied with the level of their titles need not worry too much either. There are many ways to raise the level of your title, for example, become a powerful soul evolver, demonstrate great leadership ability, make a great discovery, etc. Everyone can fall and everyone can rise. Absolutely nothing is set in stone. The eyes of those who received high-level titles became serious when they heard this and the eyes of those who were still not satisfied with the treatment they had just been granted flashed brightly. They all realized that while they were comrades, brothers in arms, friends, etc., they were also rivals. Who did not want to live a better life? Who did not want to leave their name engraved in the records of history? Who among those present did not want to honor their fathers, siblings, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, who had died when the apocalypse suddenly broke out. They all wanted to enjoy the highest level of privilege and give their families the best treatment. With this new structure of military power and levels of nobility, they now all had a target to aim at and fight for. If Bai Zeman succeeded in conquering the country, then they would be heroes. They would be the ones who would write the history books that future generations would read and glorify. After the conclusion of the meeting, all those inside the big hall left one after another. Although there were many who hoped for something better after this meeting, the last words spoken by Bai Zeman served to raise the courage and fighting spirit of all those with great ambitions. The ambition was dangerous, and Bai Zeman was aware of that. After all, when a character was ambitious they were highly likely to be willing to do anything for power, which in turn could lead to a possible betrayal or takeover. However, he didn't care too much about this. If someone was brave enough to attempt something against him, then what awaited them was an extremely miserable fate. Bai Zeman believed that, at least, most of his men were aware of this fact, and if they were not then he would simply have to use the first ones to go astray to show the rest of them the consequences of going off the course he had set. Just as Bai Zeman was about to leave, Shang Guanbing Shui approached him and stared at him for a moment. What's happening? Bai Zeman asked without looking at her, finishing putting away some papers. She watched his appearance working and no one knew what she was thinking. After a moment of silence, she finally said calmly, I wanted to thank you for the position you gave me earlier. I know well what it means to hold a title of the highest level and also to have the power to mobilize the faction's most powerful legion in times of need. Bai Zeman chuckled and yet without looking at her he put the documents away in the small cabinet next to him. After that, he looked at her and said with a slight smile, don't overthink it. About 70% of the reason I gave you that title and position is because you earned it through your own efforts. Similar to Wu Yujun, you are the other person who has worked the hardest for the faction. As a leader, I think I can't be so stingy, can I? Shang Guanbing Shui's lips curved slightly upward and her eyes twinkled playfully. She looked at him like a mischievous little fox and said with amusement, Leader? Weren't you king? Cough. Bai Zeman cleared his throat and walked towards the exit. Without looking back, he said with a hint of mockery of his own, rather than king, considering that there are barely around 10,000 subdites under my kingdom, I think it might be more correct to call me bandit. That king had so few subdites? He was probably the first ever. Damn, even the number of territories he controlled was barely a couple of villages. Even if his skin was thick, he still felt ashamed of his current reign. Then, he simply disappeared beyond the large wooden door. Bandit. Ha ha ha, I think that title is also correct. She muttered and giggled softly even though she was alone inside the room. Her giggle was clear and soothing like the pure water of a river flowing gently among the colorful rocks while the smile on her usually cold face was as warm as the sun lighting up the world with a beautiful rainbow after a fierce storm. As she looked at the place where Bai Zeman had just disappeared with a dazed look for more than a minute, Shang Guanbing Shui was forced to return from the dream world when another person appeared. I wonder what happened to make our princess stunned looking at nothingness. Could it be that some gentleman just won your heart with honeyed words? In love. Wu Yujun entered the room with a small smile on her charming face and looked around. Not finding the person she was looking for, a glint of disillusionment flashed in her eyes before disappearing without a trace. She had left earlier and planned to wait until everyone left before returning to chat with Bai Zeman as she knew he had some paperwork to sort out before he could leave. However, she did not expect him to finish so soon. Shang Guanbing Shui looked at Wu Yujun and was surprised to hear her words. She opened her eyes wide and said dumbfounded, in love? Me? Are you sure you're feeling well, girl? Hee. Wu Yujun came over and gave her a hug while giggling like a happy baby. Shang Guanbing Shui didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she watched her best friend's behavior. If someone saw them at this moment they might even come to think that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. What's wrong? So cheerful all of a sudden? Shang Guanbing Shui asked in confusion. As if she had thought of something, she blurted out of nowhere, it may be that Bai Zeman. To be honest, even she herself was surprised when Wu Yujun announced that Bai Zeman would be conferring such a great position on her. Although Wu Yujun was currently a first-order existence, intelligent, and hardworking, the truth was that Shang Guanbing Shui knew that the merits her friend had gathered so far were not enough to sit in such a high position. Now, seeing Wu Yujun so happy, Shang Guanbing Shui naturally came to the conclusion that something must have happened without her knowledge. This made her feel a little odd, but she didn't know if it was because she didn't know what was going on in her good sister's life or any other reason. After all, Wu Yujun and she always told each other everything since they were little. No. It's not that. Wu Yujun blushed slightly as even though Shang Guanbing Shui had not finished her words it was extremely easy to understand what she meant. Her heart raced at the mere thought and this only helped to make her more sure of her feelings. This also made Wu Yujun determined to fight for what she felt no matter what. The debut release of this chapter happened at N0V3LB1N. Then where did all this happiness come from? Shang Guanbing Shui asked stupefied. Even if Wu Yujun was always cheerful and kind, at this moment she was exuding happiness and joy from every fiber of her body. Wu Yujun finally broke away from Shang Guanbing Shui's embrace and said with a small smile, it's no big deal. Well, it is to me. It's just that in the past few days that man and I have been spending a lot more time together. Even though most of the stuff we talk about is just work, faction, future, etc. It's very important to me and I really cherish those little moments. You're really in love, aren't you? Shang Guanbing Shui sighed and an intricate light flashed in her eyes as she looked at her best friend, who was as close to her as a blood sister. She had grown up together with Wu Yujun and even though there were many times when they could not see each other for different reasons, the two were always extremely close. Shang Guanbing Shui knew that the number of Wu Yujun's suitors were so many that they could form several rows a couple of kilometers long. Even in the university alone, the number of men courting her was easily a couple of tens of thousands. Isn't it ironic? Wu Yujun smiled with a hint of bitterness as she said quietly, I remember when I told you 2 years ago that I doubted I would ever fall in love with anyone. I was fine with my family's arrangements, you know. Marrying a man from a prominent family, giving birth, and that sort of stuff. Thousands of outstanding men pestered me tirelessly without receiving anything, but look at me now. Here I am, completely head over heels for a guy younger than me who doesn't even seem to care about me more than the normal. Shang Guanbing Shui looked at her without saying a word, however, she let out a small incomprehensible sigh. Even to her it was surprising. Not only what was happening to Wu Yuzhen, but also what was happening to herself. After a brief silence, Shang Guanbing Shui said in a somewhat awkward tone of voice. I don't think it's as ironic as it sounds. It's just that this guy, Bai Zimin. That man is. He's unusual. Some kind of anomaly. Wu Yuzhen looked at her with slightly widened eyes of surprise and said puzzled, did something happen while you were in the north? For someone with Shang Guanbing Shui's cold and indifferent personality to show an expression as complex and difficult to describe as the one she had at the moment, Wu Yuzhen felt it was extremely strange. Even more so considering that she was making that kind of expression for a man. With her intelligence, she naturally came to the immediate conclusion that something must have happened while Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbing Shui were conquering the north camp a couple of days ago. That's... Shang Guanbing Shui hesitated for a moment when she heard her friend's question and for a second she did not know what to say. Wu Yuzhen's eyes glittered uncannily as she noticed the hesitation in her good sister's eyes. Just as different thoughts popped into her head, Shang Guanbing Shui finally spoke. Indeed. A lot of things happened. Shang Guanbing Shui sighed and began to slowly narrate the events that happened since the first day they arrived at the North Camp. From the meeting of the mother and daughter pair starving and desperate almost beyond salvation to the surprise attack by the goblin army just as everyone was preparing to leave and when humanity's defenses were at their lowest point. Shang Guanbing Shui gave a fairly accurate summary of what happened during the nearly 10 days they were at the North Camp and only skipped the boring trip back south. Bing Shui, you. Wu Yuzhen looked at her with wide eyes and said in a reprimanding tone, why did you put yourself in that kind of situation if you didn't fully trust in him? What Wu Yuzhen was referring to was of course the event when Shang Guanbing Shui ate the lightning fruit and went into a state of coma for a full 24 hours. While Wu Yuzhen herself had full confidence in Bai Zimin as he was the man her heart cried out for, Shang Guanbing Shui's case was different from her case. I had to do it. Shang Guanbing Shui shook her head gently and slowly explained, Bai Zimin is a very, too powerful man. Besides, his personality is capable of making people unconsciously open up to him and trust him, even I was no exception. I had to check if that indifferent and cold but at the same time loyal and proud personality he showed before everyone was his true self. At most I would only have lost my purity. Although Shang Guanbing Shui said it with apparent indifference, Wu Yuzhen had known her for many years. It was impossible for her not to notice the slight changes in her eyes as she said those last words. She stepped forward and hugged her briefly before returning to her previous position. She looked into her eyes and said with a smile, so, it looks like Bai Zimin didn't disappoint you. Disappoint her? Shang Guanbing Shui forced a smile into her heart. Far from disappointing, he really amazed me. She said in a clear voice and glanced at the door to make sure no one was eavesdropping. That's why I said that this man is an anomaly. His personality may be far from perfect, he is arrogant, disdainful, often cold and to some extent cruel. However, he is also honorable and proud enough to keep his hands and eyes off my body. He was even capable of getting my friendship and trust to the extent that I told him about my past. Even if Shang Guanbing Shui did not express it openly, she was fully aware of how beautiful her face was and how tempting her curvy body was. The fact that a man was able to stand his ground regardless of the circumstances, more so when she was completely vulnerable, was a feat that so far only Bai Zimin had achieved. You told him about your past. Wu Yuzhen blinked with surprise shining in her dark eyes. You even told him about your father. Shang Guanbing Shui nodded calmly, not caring at all about the word father. Even if she hated that man to the marrow of her bones, she could not deny the fact that he was her father and that his blood ran through her veins. Not only that. Shang Guanbing Shui rested the weight of her body on one of the large columns supporting the roof of the building and noted, thanks to him, I even stopped hating that man so much. Although I still can't tolerate him and will make him suffer at least a portion of the pain that my mother and I suffered because of his irresponsibility, at least I have no more thoughts about taking his head. In the past, Shang Guanbing Shui aspired to the short-lived dream of claiming a position high enough within the government cabinet to make her father's rule a living hell and, if possible, take everything away from him. Something like killing him never crossed her mind since even if one set aside the great security Xian Yuan Wenchen had as president of one of the most powerful countries in the world, his own strength was nothing to scoff at. However, when the apocalypse broke out and the possibility of evolving rose before her eyes the moment the soul record appeared on Earth, Shang Guanbing Shui no longer restrained herself and her thoughts ran wild and unbound. If she acquired enough power in the midst of this chaotic world, she would be the dictator of life and death, therefore, she would be the one to hold that person's life in her hands. But her talk with Bai Zimin changed many things, among them, her way of thinking. No. Not anymore. Wu Yuzhen could not believe what she was hearing. She was aware of how great Shang Guanbing Shui's hatred for her father was. Her hatred for him was so great that the only real goal in Shang Guanbing Shui's life other than making her mother happy was to make her father's life as unhappy as possible. Wu Yuzhen many times tried to help her to let go of that hatred, tried countless times to make her live her own life, unfortunately, she could not. Therefore, now that she heard that a single talk with Bai Zimin made her good sister could at least leave some of that hatred behind, Wu Yuzhen felt incredulous and for a moment did not know how to react. Not anymore. Shang Guanbing Shui shook her head. Then, as if she was remembering something, she spoke as her clear sky blue eyes were lost in the view outside through the huge window at her right. He said words that made me reconsider many things. After thinking it over, I realized that there was no point in hating that man to such an extent. After all, it was partially his attitude that shaped my personality and my being to be what I am today. To hate him to the breaking point would be the same as rejecting my own personality and my own self. Wu Yuzhen fell silent and lowered her head, thinking carefully about what she had just heard. The scene was silent for a minute or two as none of the two women present said anything and it was only when a glimmer of understanding showed in Wu Yuzhen's bright eyes that the conversation resumed. I understand. She said with a very soft smile, and as she looked at the girl before her, who was basically like her family, she said in a gentle voice, I'm happy for you, Bing Shui. You finally started to walk your own path, leaving that thorny path where you were chasing the back of a person who didn't even turn once to look at you. Shang Guanbing Shui chuckled and said calmly, well, I wouldn't say it's a radical change. But, a change is a change at the end of the day. Even the tallest skyscraper was once small and even the most powerful existence was once weak. Everything starts small and even the white clouds in the sky were once drops of water on the earth. Wu Yuzhen nodded at the realization of this fact and looked at her silently. Shang Guanbing Shui also looked at her friend, and although she had not said anything, it was easy to notice that Wu Yuzhen looked hesitant about something. It was as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to go about it. Yuzhen? What's wrong? She asked with a slight frown. No. Wu Yuzhen was about to shake her head but stopped herself as she saw Shang Guanbing Shui's worried frown turn to one of anger. In the end, knowing that it was not good to hide things from someone who was always open with her, she said, I was wondering, what kind of life or experiences did he live to say such meaningful words even though he is so young? It is said that when one falls in love with another person even the smallest of details cannot slip away from one's attention. The current Wu Yuzhen was very curious about Bai Zimin, she longed to know more about him and to be able to close that seemingly small but actually incredibly large distance between the two of them. About that, Shang Guanbing Shui hesitated as to whether or not she should tell her what Bai Zimin had confided in her. While he didn't seem concerned at all about that past and also didn't seem to care about that girl who hurt him, Shang Guanbing Shui felt that it wasn't good of her to talk about something so private that someone else shared with her. She felt that if she did that, regardless of whether Bai Zimin would be upset or not, she would be betraying the trust he deposited in her. In the end, even though Wu Yuzhen was her best friend, she shook her head and said in an apologetic tone of voice, I'm sorry, Yuzhen. But I think it would be disrespectful if I talk about such a private topic just like that. Don't worry, don't worry. Wu Yuzhen hurriedly shook her head while waving her hands nervously. I'm just curious, that's all. Shang Guanbing Shui smiled faintly upon hearing this and did not continue with the previous matter. Instead, after thinking about it for a moment, she said with a hint of concern in her usually indifferent voice, Yuzhen. Are you sure it really must be him? It must be him. Wu Yuzhen didn't even hesitate for a second. She said in an extremely serious voice, he has been the only man who could make my heart beat like this. It is only him who makes me feel at peace and safe just by his presence. Any other man is no good. Shang Guanbing Shui sighed as she heard this and shook her head. After a slight hesitation, she said quietly, in that case, you'd better get ready. Getting Bai Zimin's heart will definitely not be easy. Wu Yuzhen's small mouth opened slightly, briefly showing a glimpse of her pearl-white set of teeth. She felt that she figured something out from her friend's words but even then the steadfastness in her gaze did not waver at all. Seeing her so determined, Shang Guanbing Shui finally chuckled and said in a somewhat uncanny voice, well, in return for your efforts, if you manage to get his love, I'm sure you will be an extremely happy woman in the future. All the sadness and hardship you have to go through to get there will surely be richly rewarded when you reach the destination. After all, he is an anomaly. A consensus was reached between the two ladies that, regardless of his faults that every human being had, Bai Zimin was indeed a great man. This conversation ended here, at least for today. But who knows, a similar discussion with the same subject as the core might take place in the future between the two friends. Achoo. On his way to his village, Bai Zimin suddenly stopped and sneezed. Am I catching a cold? Such a thought flashed in his mind for a second before he immediately dismissed it. Even if the nights were cold he shouldn't have caught a cold, right? Considering his current evolutionary level, a normal cold was impossible for it to break through the defenses of his current immune system. Therefore, another idea popped into his head, one that was soon discarded as well. Bai Zimin did not give the matter much thought and continued walking. Due to everything that had happened in the previous 4 days, he did not even have time to check his spoils of war obtained after slaughtering tens of thousands of goblins. After all, as the leader of a growing faction whose boundaries were expanding day by day, Bai Zimin didn't just need to worry about leveling up or searching for survivors. Just like any leader, he needed to read many documents, listen to ideas, approve some and disapprove others, and so on. The amount of work Bai Zimin had to do during the 4 days when the North Camp survivors were adjusting to life in beginning village was immense. If not for the fact that there were people like Lu Xiaoao, Cai Jing'ai, Wu Yuzhen, Lu Yan, and others there to help him, even now he would be immersed in paperwork. Suddenly, he felt his nose itch and before he could do anything, the unthinkable happened. Achoo. Bai Zimin stopped dead in his tracks and muttered under his breath, damn it, is someone talking bad about this elder? This father will beat your ass a couple of times if I find out who you are. Then, he proceeded on his way as he looked at his surroundings cautiously. Walking out of the building where the meeting had been held, Shang Guanbing Shui suddenly took a hand to cover her mouth and nose before a small, delicate sneeze escaped her. N0v3L Realm was the platform where this chapter was initially revealed on N0v3L.B1N. Are you okay? Wu Yuzhen, who was standing next to her, asked with wide eyes. Shang Guanbing Shui looked behind her and then to her sides before shaking her head and saying, someone is probably talking bad about me. Oh, well. Considering our positions it's normal for people to talk bad about us. Even more so about you. Wu Yuzhen shrugged her shoulders. The two women soon disappeared from the scene after that. What kind of expression would Shang Guanbing Shui put on if she knew that the person who was talking bad of her and saying that he would give her a couple of smacks on the butt was actually none other than Bai Zimin, the great man she was talking about just a few moments ago? Surely her expression would be interesting to witness. An unknown place. The wind was blowing strongly, strong enough to turn the body of a normal first-order existence into a pile of chopped meat as the countless wind blades were too powerful and terrifying. This was a world without an earth-like sun, so the environment was considerably dark, even the leaves on the trees grew deep black. The whole atmosphere would be rather gloomy were it not for the two bright stars that dimly illuminated the world. On top of a mountain surrounded by huge forests, a giant castle of majestic appearance stood proudly. The tallest tower surpassed the clouds and the dark-colored walls were surrounded by mighty futuristic-looking cannons with the power to wipe out high existence of the Fifth Order with ease. Several groups of men and women could be seen patrolling the surroundings, walking on the wall while keeping serious faces on constant alert. Clearly, they were all taking their vigilance very seriously even though the odds of an attack on this place were as low as the odds of the universe suddenly exploding. Two handsome men dressed in heavy armor and carrying swords at their waists guarded the main entrance. Both as straight as spears and with extremely solemn expressions. However, the solemn expression on the two handsome men's faces practically collapsed in an instant when a beautiful beyond words woman appeared in the distance. The two guards who protected the entrance to the magnificent castle were two supreme fifth-order existences. The power of both of them was enough to wipe out people like Bai Zeman and all life on earth with ease as long as they were given enough time. Both were heroes of their respective worlds and before evolving into fifth order, joining a faction of higher existences, the two men were worshipped and revered by their race. However, when the two men saw the woman approaching with slow steps from the bottom of the path connecting the mountaintop to the forest, it was as if they were two small mice who saw a big mountain cat. As they blushed and their hearts pounded, they both hurriedly lowered their heads and looked at the toe of their combat boots as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. The woman's black hair swayed gently and gracefully despite the great gusts of wind. The two bright stars acted like two small suns, illuminating her snow-white, flawless skin. As she passed by the two men guarding the gate to the castle, she completely ignored their existence, and even though she could feel the slightly altered breathing of the two males, she continued to move forward without worrying about them at all. After what seemed like an eternity, the two guards raised their heads and looked at each other at the same time. Are really scary. One of them gulped and swore he could feel his heart thumping against the chest plate covering his upper body. As expected from the only woman capable of rivaling the Archangel Uriel belonging to the army of those white pigeons in terms of beauty. The other soldier could feel his crotch in its peak state as he said bitterly, just her scent and a small glimpse was enough to turn me into a complete joke. Not for nothing is she a succubus. Her aura of charm is something else, said the first soldier. Then, as if thinking about something, he said in a low voice, recently, things have gotten a little out of hand. It seems that a world controlled by those pigeons was destroyed and the demonic energy makes them suspect that we were the cause. That's why His Majesty Lucifer summoned all the higher UPS. To even summon the bloody succubus, it has to be really bad, said the second soldier before silence reigned once more. The woman these two men were talking about was, of course, Lilith. The current Lilith looked completely different compared to when she hangs out next to Bai Zeman. The playful and kind smile that was always on her face naturally was nowhere to be seen, her red eyes that usually flashed with amusement whenever she teased him at this moment were indifferent and cold like two sharp blades ready to claim lives. On the way to the castle's meeting hall, Lilith met many fifth-order existences patrolling the surroundings. She also encountered several sixth-order existences heading towards the same place as her, however, when these sixth-order existences who were on her same scale of power saw her, they immediately decided to deviate and walk down another hallway, evading her as if she was the most terrifying evil in the creation. Unlike that aura similar to that of a protective and charming elder sister that always surrounded her when she was together with Bai Zeman, the current Lilith's aura was not only extremely charming but also exuded danger all around. No one dared to engage her in conversation despite her beauty. The debut release of this chapter happened at N0V3LB1N. As she reached the end of the long hallway, a door approximately 50 meters high appeared before her. The door appeared to be made of normal wood, but in reality, the wood it had been forged from was capable of withstanding the attacks of fourth-order existences for some time before collapsing. When Lilith approached the door, it opened on its own as if it had intelligence within itself. Bang! The double door slammed against the walls, causing a rumble that for a moment seemed to make the entire castle tremble. There were already several people inside the huge hall, so when Lilith made her appearance everyone's eyes automatically moved towards her. Some of them immediately looked away in fear and others looked at her with unhidden lust. Lilith walked elegantly towards the large table in the center of the room. Her signature black dress hugged her curvy body tightly, giving her an extremely seductive appearance that provoked gasps from a large number of beings regardless of gender or race. She did not need to show even a tiny bit of cleavage to become the instant focus, stealing the spotlight from all the demon women present. Even though there were other succubi present with great charm and beauty, they could not compete against her. Oh, Lilith, it's been about 2 years since we last saw each other. As Lilith sat down in her designated seat around the large circular table, where there were already approximately 50 beings before her, one of them was the first to greet her. He was a very handsome man, his beauty had reached the point where not the slightest imperfection could be seen on his face. Although he wore light silver armor, the muscles of his body made many of the women seated around the table and women who did not have the qualifications to sit there but were looking on standing up feel hot all over. Only those who had the strength of at least a sixth-order existence had the right to sit around the big table. Those fifth-order existences could only stand in the hall as a sign of respect. Lilith looked at the man for a moment before ignoring his existence again and looking at her delicately manicured nails with indifference. As cold as ever, eh? The handsome man chuckled without caring at all about the cold shoulder he had just received. On the contrary, when his demonic golden eyes met Lilith's ruby-colored eyes, the man was moved beyond words. This man was an existence of the 7th order and one of the 10 beings who possessed such power within the demonic army. His nickname was Crow. As for his real name, Lilith did not know nor did she care. The demonic army had the custom of calling its members by a nickname instead of the real name they had used when they were still lower existences. Only a few called the rest by their true names. Crow, you've been trying to woo the bloody succubus for a decade and you still haven't given up? At this point, you're starting to embarrass the hell out of me, said loudly a burly man with a giant sword on his back. Crow looked at the burly man and said with a graceful smile, Hellscar, long time no see. I heard you challenged Doom Roar of the Dragon God Kingdom. Why don't you tell us a bit about it? Hearing those words, everyone's eyes immediately moved towards Hellscar. Even Lilith slightly raised her head to look at him. Hellscar, one of the first generals of the demonic army and a powerful existence of 7th order. His physical strength was basically unsurpassed and the number of lives his sword had claimed in a single night caused an entire continent to be dyed red. Doom Roar, another 7th order existence and one of the most powerful dragons under the command of the Dragon Monarch. The reason behind his name came from the fact that one of the Heavenly Moon Army's fortresses collapsed with one of his roars, burying everyone inside forever. Battles between 7th order existences were extremely rare, so it was no wonder that even the indifferent and cold Lilith was curious about it. Hellscar snorted and his powerful voice made the atmosphere shiver as he said loudly, that coward Doom Roar should change his name to Bitch Cry. I was out of his world challenging him for a whole month but he didn't even dare to show his tail. Bored, Lilith shook her head and looked down at her hands again while ignoring everyone else. Ha ha ha. Crow burst out laughing, causing some of the demon ladies to give him flirtatious looks that he ignored. Hellscar, I'm sure while you were freezing to death in outer space, Doomroar was enjoying the warmth of his wives' bodies. Ha 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 ha. Crow, you bastard. Do you want to die? Hellscar was not a man of good temper to begin with, so when he heard Crow's taunt he immediately clutched the hilt of his massive sword. Crow raised both hands and said without losing the smile on his face, I surrender, I surrender. I don't want to look like a savage in front of Lilith, unlike you. Humph. Hellscar snorted loudly and his eyes flashed strangely as he said, I heard that the bloody succubus has spent the last 2 years looking for a person and that's why she was missing. Crow, probably while you were playing with your little worm, she was already enjoying the warmth that a real man can give instead of wasting her time listening to your bullshit. Ha 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 ha. Crow's face changed as he heard this and the smile on his face slowly faded away. Upon seeing this, a large grin appeared on Hellscar's face, which gave him an extremely frightening look due to the deep gashes on his face, gashes that he himself refused to let regenerate as he felt that these were his medals of honor after emerging victorious through defeating powerful opponents. There's no way such a thing is true, you battle-crazed bastard. Crow said viciously and his golden eyes suddenly turned completely black along with his sclera, leaving nothing but deep darkness in his gaze. Hellscar laughed out loud as he felt Crow's aura pressing the atmosphere around him. The other 7th Order existences also smiled as if they were about to see something funny. When one lived for a long time, long enough to forget when they were born and forget who their parents were, life could become very boring, especially when one reached a level of power where there were practically no challenges waiting for them. The members of the demonic army were quite savage and often even killed each other just out of boredom. Therefore, these 7th Order existences were more than interested in seeing Crow and Hellscar fight. Unfortunately, the 6th Order existences were not in good condition as they endured the insensible pressure released by Crow's aura. They all turned pale and only Lilith's expression remained impassive, being irrefutable proof of her power and thus gaining everyone's respect. Those 5th Order existences directly knelt down on their knees and some fainted while bleeding uncontrollably, unable to resist at all in the face of the pressure of someone so powerful. If it's true or not, why don't we ask her? Hellscar thundered and with a big smile looked at Lilith. Bloody succubus, why don't you tell us what you've been doing during these years? You've even skipped the annual meetings. Everyone's gaze focused on Lilith immediately. However, not many managed to withstand her charm and most simply stared at her in a daze, losing the ability to hear clearly. Lilith looked at Hellscar and Crow with indifferent eyes. She didn't seem to care at all about the difference of one order between her power and theirs as she said coldly, you two, who do you think you are? Hellscar, I don't have to explain to you what I do with my life. As for you, Crow, you really should stop wasting your time. Don't you already have over 10,000 women? Stop being an annoying eyesore around me or I'll freeze you to death. Ha 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 ha. Hellscar laughed out loud without caring at all about Lilith's harsh words, I really miss being on a battlefield next to you, bloody succubus Lilith. However, Crow didn't seem satisfied and pressed, Lilith, what were you doing? Lilith stared at him for several seconds before a charming smile bloomed on her face. Lilith's smile was truly beautiful. Her capacity of attraction and beauty was similar to that of a rainbow suddenly appearing in the midst of the clouds, surprising all sentient beings and attracting their eyes like a magnet. Many inside the great hall felt their breaths freeze for an instant and their senses blurred. At this time, if Lilith so wished, she could easily have claimed the lives of many of the higher existences present. In a battle between powerful existences, a split of second was enough to send one's head flying through the air, and Lilith had the ability to enchant her enemies with her natural beauty and succubus aura. Crow felt his breathing become heavy and as he stared at Lilith's black dress hugging every inch of her skin he couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. Even Hellscar, who usually cared for nothing but fighting against powerful enemies, couldn't help but gawk for a moment before looking away as he muttered something under his breath. Crow, do you really want to know what I've been doing? Lilith's voice was as sweet as sugar and as gentle as a spring breeze. Everyone present unconsciously relaxed when they heard her miraculous voice. Crow nodded as his eyes that had now returned to normal stared dazedly at the wonderful woman before him. From the moment that Lilith had joined the demonic army, he had been trying to woo her over and over again but always failed. In fact, the number of words Lilith had directed at him this night added together amounted more than all the words she had ever directed at him in the past. Crow did not give up, however. A woman of such quality who was not only incredibly beautiful but also incredibly powerful and whose arrogant pride seeped from deep within her soul. Only such a challenging woman was capable of igniting his primal desire. While Crow was weakly falling under Lilith's spell due to his excessive self-confidence, she gladly seized the opportunity that he himself granted her. Lilith did not attack or anything similar. On the contrary, she smiled charmingly and looked off into the distance as if she was remembering good times while saying in a dreamy voice. Just as Hellscar stated a moment ago, I was looking for a person. A man to be precise. At first, my search was just for fun, but as the days went by I was very surprised at how charming this man was. Unlike the rest, he has the ability to look me in the face without losing control of his head and without his little brother going wild. This man unknowingly brought up a challenge that I couldn't refuse. These words snapped Crow out of his slight daze and as he circled his own mana to resist the charm Lilith exuded with every word and with every gesture, his expression slowly grew uglier and uglier. I teased him in many ways, I jumped on top of his body, questioned his manhood, raised the most erotic scenarios leaving not much to the imagination, and many other stuff like that. However, that man turned out to be more magnificent and capable than I initially estimated as he managed to resist against my temptation over and over again. Lilith sighed dreamily as she played with her deep jet hair while suppressing her charm and deactivating one of her active skills called speech proficiency. Murmurs spread around the room as everyone finally came to their senses. The males could not believe what they had just heard and the curiosity of the females itched tremendously, especially the curiosity of those female existences that had focused on a path based on charm, illusions, and other beauty-based skills. To these types of females, men were comparable to toys, they could have practically anyone they wanted whenever they wanted and the appearance of a being capable of challenging them was a rarity. However, if there really was a man of the magnitude Lilith had just described, then many curious and bored women would probably want to try to test him. Even more so when this man even managed to resist the temptation of the most beautiful woman of the demon race. Hat. Crow suddenly scoffed and shook his head as he calmly said, such a thing is not possible, Lilith. Both you and I know that. Oh, but I really don't lie, little crow. Lilith blinked her eyes innocently and then finished off, even when I lay on his bed in revealing and wildly sexy lingerie, that guy bit his lip to keep from jumping on me. That man was brave enough to give me a strong slap on my backside that just remembering it makes me want to get back into his embrace immediately to feel his big hands and firm grip on me once again. Bang. Crow finally couldn't stay sane any longer and unwilling to listen any longer released his aura completely. The floor capable of withstanding the attacks of fifth-order beings cracked almost immediately and the stone table began to creak as if it would crack at any moment. Those sixth-order existences that had just broken through the threshold not too many years ago were directly sent flying several hundred meters before impacting hard against the metallic rocky-looking walls of the castle. Oh, Crow finally lost it, haha. A woman with an incredibly seductive body chuckled softly and waved her hand as she created a barrier to protect the fifth-order existences and thus prevent some of them from dying. This woman was called Fire Sorrow by everyone. She wore a luxurious purple robe to match the color of her hair, her lips were also colored deep purple, and her violet eyes undoubtedly made her an extremely beautiful belle that in tandem with her explosive body immediately turned her into a dangerous bombshell for males. However, no one dared to disrespect her and those who dared were probably not alive to tell how it happened. This was because Fire Sorrow was one of the most powerful and talented mages in the history of the universe, her power had reached the stage of the seventh order. Fire Sorrow was highly valued by the leader of the demonic army. This was because mages possessed unparalleled destructive power and their importance in large-scale wars was several times higher than that of warriors because with a single spell they were capable of wiping out entire troops. Enough of this nonsense, Lilith. You will be my woman and I am the only man who will embrace you. Crow said through teeth clenched to the point where his jaw was clearly outlined. His soft eyes were gone and only anger was left on the verge of exploding out of control, making the previously elegant man turn into a murderous devil in just a few blinks of an eye. Embrace me? You? I'm afraid that's for me to decide, and guess what? There's a man who's slowly earning that right. Did you hear? A man, not a little crow like you. Lilith said with a smile that wasn't a smile. Her ruby eyes glowed and the aura of her body also burst outward stronger and stronger as she spoke word by word slowly. Unlike the black aura surrounding Crow's body, the aura surrounding Lilith's body was deep blue with small specks of white. Both auras converged at a midpoint and lightning began to crackle as if they were battling each other to see who would devour the other. Oh. Battle of the Soul. Hellscare laughed as he clapped his hands, it's been a while since I've seen one. Fire Sorrow and the rest of the seventh order existences frowned as they saw that things were getting out of hand as none of them expected Crow to overreact in such an exaggerated manner. Although Lilith was undoubtedly powerful, no one believed that she had the power to actually challenge Crow. Little did they expect her to actually have the courage to enter a battle of the soul against someone clearly stronger. As Lilith's aura and Crow's aura clashed relentlessly, small black lightning flashes with golden edges crackled in the middle as a warning of space on the verge of collapsing. The entire castle shook fiercely and fragments of rocks began to slowly detach from the ceiling and walls. Even if the castle was built with the best possible building materials, two beings with the power of the seventh order colliding inside was not something this castle could withstand. If it was on the outside, maybe, but inside was a big no. Hey. If something happens to the castle. Hellscar swallowed heavily as he looked at Fire Sorrow. The beautiful, hot mage rolled her eyes as she said with obvious discomfort in her voice, why didn't you think about it before you opened your mouth? You damned ape. Hellscare shut his mouth as despite being somewhat hard-headed at least he could understand his own faults. What happened next made many gasp. Something unthinkable, something no one thought possible. The deep blue aura with white flashes suddenly seemed to receive a great boost and its pushing power grew enormously. The black aura battled, but gradually began to freeze and its power began to give way. Crow's face changed greatly as he saw this and disbelief shone in his desperate eyes. On the other hand, Lilith's face was as cold as frost as her ruby eyes filled with murderous intent stared at the person before her. Battles of the soul were extremely dangerous. These battles represented a battle between the soul of two existences where the victor could snatch the soul power of the other. None of those present expected things to escalate to this point. None of them expected Crow to get so angry but at the same time, none of them expected Lilith to not only back up her words with such ferocity but also to have enough power to back her up. Unfortunately, no matter how much they wanted to stop this madness, a seventh order existence was not capable of stopping a battle of the soul unleashed by beings within the same scale of power. Just as a small part of the black aura was frozen and the ice joined the deep blue aura with white flashes to attack, an exasperated voice rang out. All right, that's enough. Bang. An incredibly heavy aura fell from the sky, perfectly hitting the spot where Lilith's and Crow's auras collided. The explosion caused the stone table that was barely resisting to finally collapse and break into two pieces. Crow took 2 steps back while holding his chest with a slightly altered expression. Lilith also took 2 steps back. However, her indifferent expression did not change even when she received the following message in her retina. You have absorbed part of the soul power of 7th order Crow level 852. You receive strength plus 200, agility plus 120, stamina plus 45, health plus 95, magic plus 201, mana plus 280. Just absorbing a small and insignificant portion of Crow's soul power had caused Lilith's stats to grow to levels similar to what Baizeman would get if he defeated second-order beings while he was still a first-order being risking to suffer fatal injuries to kill the enemy. If he knew this he would probably cry tears of blood. However, if he knew that the seemingly simple confrontation Lilith was going through was just as deadly as a physical battle, his thoughts would change in an instant. B1N Realm was the platform where this chapter was initially revealed on N0V3L.B1N. You two, look what you have done. That table was built with starstone taken from inside a constellation and its history goes back over 2,000 years but it was destroyed just like this because of you. Everyone's eyes, including Lilith's and Crow's, followed the voice only to see a black portal appear in the center of the room. A handsome man beyond redemption stepped out of the portal bringing with him a frighteningly chilling aura. When they saw the man who appeared in the room after passing through the portal, everyone on the scene immediately bowed in respect. To make these proud higher existences who had overcome and broken the chains of mortality bow, the identity of this man who had just appeared definitely could not be simple by any means. Even those seventh order existences inside the Great Hall were no exception. Lilith looked at the man who had just appeared and studied his appearance for a moment. Waist-length golden hair, his complexion was slender, his arms looked frail, his skin was as white as the clouds in the sky and his eyes were of bright emerald green. This man's appearance was beautiful enough to be mistaken as a woman. This man was none other than Lucifer, the founder and leader of the demonic army. One of the most terrifying and powerful existences in the entire universe. The extent of his power was unknown, but it was unquestionable that normal seventh order existences presented no challenge to him. All of you just sit down. Ah. Lucifer waved his hand in just as he was about to order everyone to sit down, just as he did at every meeting. His eyes fell for the second time on the table destroyed in two halves. Your Majesty. Crow raised his head and looked somewhat embarrassed. Crow, Lilith, how am I supposed to be rewarded for this? Lucifer said in a serious voice. However, his voice was so soft that it was hard to take him too seriously. This table was snatched from under the nose of that little god of heaven's army and it was one of my war trophies. This. Crow looked at his space storage ring for treasure but soon stopped. What thing could he have that someone of Lucifer's caliber didn't? Probably nothing. Just then, Lilith raised her head and said with a faint smile, Your Majesty Lucifer, how about I get you some new pajamas? The people inside the room looked at Lilith with weird expressions. However, they then looked at Lucifer's current attire and for a moment they didn't know what to think about it. New pajamas. Lucifer's eyes lit up when he heard this. The current one he was wearing was a cloth shirt with sleeves so long that you could barely see his fingers. In addition, he was also wearing a pair of sleep pants made of cloth and even wore a pair of black fluffy slippers on his feet. What are these pajamas you speak of made of? Lucifer asked curiously as he stared at Lilith as if he feared she would disappear in the next instant. Seeing the clear interest of one of the most powerful existences since the moment the universe was born for some clothes to sleep in, the higher existences inside the big hall blushed as they recalled embarrassing events of the past. On one occasion, when the major factions of higher existences gathered together due to certain circumstances, Lucifer appeared wearing the exact same pajamas he was wearing at the moment. Although no one laughed, it was obvious that they were holding back the urge to burst out laughing. This event became something that none of the members of the demonic army wanted to remember. However, that event served to prove to everyone how much Lucifer loved comfortable clothes. Lilith smiled slightly and said nothing. Instead, she gently caressed the ring on her ring finger and with a quick flash, a change of clothes floated before her. You can feel its texture personally. She said as made the clothes float towards Lucifer gently. There was an unadorned white t-shirt, a pair of grey-colored baggy pants, there were even a pair of white-colored bunny-eared slippers to match the shirt. Lucifer took the clothes in his hands and began to feel the texture. The sparkle in his eyes became more prominent as he felt the softness of the shirt and pants. I want you to give me 5. No, 10. 10 of these and I'll forgive you for breaking my table. Lucifer said in what he thought was a deep voice as he looked at Lilith, casually putting the pajamas away in his own space storage. They all looked at each other in silence, not knowing what to say about it. Even the corner of the beautiful Fire Sorrow's mouth twitched a couple of times as she looked at Lucifer before sighing quietly and secretly shaking her head. The look in her eyes said that somehow she already expected something like this to happen. Lilith chuckled and casually pulled out several sets of pajamas and even other types of clothing. She sent them all flying gently towards Lucifer as she calmly said, Your Majesty, you can have all of these as compensation. Lucifer's eyes lit up and he hurriedly began to inspect the clothes one by one. Although he had several personal tailors with great talent in clothes made of great materials, Lucifer really liked to have clothes of all kinds made of different materials. This particular clothing was the first time he had seen it. Versace, Nike, Adidas, Umbro. Lucifer muttered several words that no one understood. Lilith barely held back the urge to laugh at the thought of the kind of expression XIETIAN might make if he saw the fearful and terrifying demon humanity often spoke of, acting at this moment as if he were a child who discovered a new toy. All those clothes had been taken by Lilith while visiting different stores on Earth when she was bored. There were multiple marks and various types in her space storage ring, however, most of them were sexy clothes for herself. So far, only XIETIAN had seen Lilith wearing such clothes. Realizing her thoughts, Lilith blinked in surprise and a complicated light shined in her ruby-colored pupils. Each time and without her noticing, her thoughts inadvertently moved to XIETIAN. This made her not know what to do about it. With this, your debt is settled, Lilith. Lucifer put everything away in his spatial storage and his gaze towards Lilith softened a bit. It was as if he was looking at a good friend instead of a subordinate. Thank you for your kindness. Lilith bowed slightly and said calmly. Lucifer's personality was one of the reasons why Lilith decided to join the demonic army rather than any other higher existence faction. Since he was someone quite carefree, she wouldn't have so many strings attached, and that was precisely what she needed. Lucifer nodded and then looked at Crow, causing Crow to shudder slightly. What about you? Do you have any good clothes for me? Lucifer said in a lazy voice. Hearing this, everyone felt like spitting out 10 liters of blood and dying right there. Even the corner of Crow's mouth trembled a couple of times. However, when he looked inside his spatial storage item, his face turned black. He did indeed have clothes in there. But the problem was that those clothes were all incredibly valuable treasures. Humph. Lucifer snorted, causing the temperature to plummet. Crow, Lilith already settled her debt, but there is still half a broken table left to pay for, and since you are also guilty, naturally you must compensate me. True, true. Hellscar nodded heavily and said loudly, Crow, since you entered His Majesty's house and destroyed his furniture, it's only natural that you pay for it. Crow almost spat out old blood when he heard Hellscar. With no choice, Crow gritted his teeth and pulled several pieces of clothing out of thin air. There were pants, there were t-shirts, there were coveralls, there were boots, shoes, etc. But the most incredible thing of all was that each piece was at least a rank 5 item. The defense of these pieces of clothing was high enough to save someone's life countless times before the durability of the item dropped to 0. Lucifer waved his hand and a wave of mana sent the clothes flying in his direction. Under Crow's red eyes, Lucifer inspected each item of clothing one by one before nodding indifferently as he said, even though they're not as good as Lilith's, I'll let it go for today. Then he simply put everything away as if nothing had happened. Crow felt his heart almost explode as he watched everything disappear before his very eyes. Even if he had several subordinate tailors, finding natural treasures of rank 5 and above was not easy at all. Lilith's expression was indifferent and regardless of the thoughts of others, she didn't seem to care at all. It was as if the demonic army was one group and she was another group apart from them. Then, let's begin the meeting, Lucifer said calmly as he waved his seemingly boneless hand in front of him. Swoosh. A giant round table appeared floating a few inches above the floor and then with a loud bang it fell heavily. This. Fire Sorrow's eyes widened as she looked on as the broken table disappeared and an identical but completely undamaged one replaced it in an instant. Lucifer sat comfortably in the chair that appeared to be a throne with black wings on the back and seeing everyone still standing looking at the table said in confusion, "What's happening, everyone? Sit down quickly." Crow blinked coming out of his surprise and as everyone sat down he stammered, "This. Your Majesty Lucifer. About the table." "Oh, this table." Lucifer leaned his head on the table and said lazily, "This table was also found in that constellation over 2,000 years ago. I have like 20 of those with me. He has like 20 of those tables." Fire Sorrow forced a smile and shook her head. N0, Val, B, J, N, was the platform where this chapter was initially revealed on N0V3L.B, J, N. Crow felt the world before him spin and his blood pressure rose several folds in an instant. He was on the verge of fainting. He was furious. If it wasn't for the fact that the man before him was someone he respected and held in high esteem besides the fact that he couldn't beat him, Crow felt that he would have definitely torn him into a million pieces. After taking a deep breath to calm himself down, Crow finally managed to get his mood back to normal but with some difficulty. After all, he was an existence that had lived for several millennia. "Before your Majesty begins, I would like to apologize to everyone for my indecorous act," Crow said in a soft voice, returning to being his elegant former self. Then, he looked at Lilith and said in an apologetic voice, "Lilith, I'm so sorry about earlier. I lost it for a moment because of my feelings for you." Lilith didn't even look at him. In fact, she didn't look at anyone. She looked like an extremely proud and arrogant swan with her neck up in the sky. Crow shrugged and didn't pursue the matter any further. He still firmly believed that what Lilith said earlier was a lie, not believing at all that among the higher existences there existed a man as impressive as the one she described that Crow himself did not know. Of course, Crow would never have thought that far from being a higher existence, the man of which Lilith talked about was just a young man in his early 20s in the process of completing his mission of breakthrough to the Second Order. Such a thought never crossed his mind. "Since the previous charade is over, let's get this started so I can go to sleep once and for all," Lucifer said in a sleepy voice. The eyes of the various existences of 5th, 6th, and 7th Order flashed weirdly. Apparently, the leader of the demonic army was not too surprised by the fact that Lilith had just defeated Crow, who was more than a few levels above her and even a whole stage above her, in a battle of the soul. "So, let's begin with this crap," Lucifer said as he yawned with tears in his eyes. "Your Majesty, vocabulary." Fire Sorrow said in a stern voice while in her heart she smiled bitterly. True. Lucifer nodded and leaned back, letting himself fall onto the back of the throne-like chair. "Well. Then let's begin with this meeting." Everyone straightened their backs when they heard this. It was extremely rare for Lucifer to summon all the major powers of the demonic army in one place. The only time something like this happened was when they were all supposed to come to this castle to report the progress of the different higher worlds that each of them guarded. However, such a meeting had already been held 4 months ago, so it would be another 8 months before they should meet again. Just taking into account the aforementioned was enough for everyone to know that the matter this time was serious, and while several of them had their own guesses about the main topic of this meeting, none of them spoke up and waited for the leader to continue. Well. I guess most of you already know what I'm going to say," Lucifer said trying to sound serious, something he failed to do due to the lazy look in his eyes. "That old codger. I mean the god of heaven. He's been a bit noisy recently, interrupting my sleep sessions repeatedly. It seems that the world Petra was destroyed not long ago and some pigeons, that's not right. Some angels were sacrificed along with the world itself. The existences inside the hall, regardless of whether they had the qualifications to sit around the large round table or not, managed to ignore some parts of Lucifer's dialogue as they were used to his manner and carefree personality. They all immediately understood the matter in question and several nodded with looks that suggested saying, as expected. "What the hell have we got to do with all this nitty-gritty?" Hellscar said noisily with a confused expression on his face. "If instead of wasting your time trying to challenge Doomroar you had done your duty, you would probably already be aware of this information that has by now traveled among the 8 major factions, Hellscar." An elegant lady wearing heavy plate armor and with 2 swords sheathed around her waist interrupted. This lady stood approximately 6 feet tall, making her considerably tall among females whose appearance was human. Her hair was black, short in a bob style, and there was an aura of power between her eyebrows. Her beauty was different from the typical beauties and was more of a brave type beauty, which in conjunction with her hardened expression made her appear extremely tenacious. "Valiant, do you think I have time to waste with these sort of stuff?" Hellscar asked as he looked wide-eyed at the lady who had just interjected. "It's clear anyway that those scared pigeons are just lying." "No, they're not lying," replied Valiant, whose power was that of a 7th order existence and the 4th most powerful in the demonic army, leaving aside Lucifer. "How do you know?" Hellscar shouted and was about to pound the table with his big fists, but remembering the scene from before he stopped in mid-swing. "You're noisy, Hellscar." Valiant ignored Hellscar's shout casually and Lucifer muttered under his breath as his eyes threatened to close at any moment. "Why do you always have to shout?" The leader of the demonic army muttered before saying in the middle of a yawn, "Fire Sorrow, you do it." "Okay." Fire Sorrow nodded and then pulled out a strange device from somewhere. The primary upload of this chapter happened on B1NN0 Vel. The device was strange looking, it looked like a small round-shaped smart floor cleaner. Fire Sorrow set it down in the middle of the table and then injected some of her mana while mumbling some words in a language that obviously didn't belong to Earth. Flash. A faint flash of light shone from the top of the strange circular device, and a moment later that small flash grew until it became a sphere. The sphere continued to grow in length and width before finally stopping when it reached about 50 meters of diameter. Soon, a strange but at the same time familiar 3D image appeared inside the sphere of light. The scene shown was undoubtedly the universe. Distant stars could be seen shining in the distance, and there was even a large planet whose colossal size took up most of the image. None of them knew what part of the universe was it, however, they all gasped as their eyes came into better focus. The colossal-sized planet did not move, it did not rotate on its own orbit like all planets. Worse yet, the planet seemed to be sealed by a thick layer of purplish-black ice similar to obsidian rocks. Even more striking, a powerful dark energy was seeping from deep within the ice layers, so anyone looking at it for the first time would immediately think about the demonic army. Firmament fragment. Hellscar's eyes widened and he unconsciously shouted those two words as he abruptly stood up. Everyone fell silent as they stared at the image displayed by the strange device. However, even though they said nothing, the look in their eyes made it clear that they all agreed with Hellscar's words. While rubbing his head because of Hellscar's shout, Lucifer said in a low, soft voice like that of a child, Well, it can only be a firmament fragment, and it must be a pretty powerful one at that. After all, there shouldn't be anyone with the power to seal a higher world just like that. Judging by what was visible to the naked eye, the world Petra was finished in an instant. Fire Sorrow gently bit one of her long purple-painted fingernails and muttered, even the will of the world and all higher existences were slaughtered in a heartbeat. Even if it was Lucifer himself, he probably did not possess the ability to do such a thing. At least not using only his natural power. This was because while he was capable of destroying the world Petra, doing so with a single attack was inconceivable and insane. If higher worlds were so easy to destroy, the universe would have lost all of its worlds years ago during the countless wars waged by each faction in order to obtain more resources and natural treasures. Bloody succubus Lilith. Valiant suddenly looked at Lilith and broke the silence that had formed after Fire Sorrow finished her words. Lilith raised her head and said casually, "Do you need something, Valiant?" Valiant was not intimidated by the icy stare that Lilith's ruby eyes were sending at her. Her expression remained unperturbed as she said in a tone of voice that was neither high nor low, "If I'm not mistaken, aside from those unusual attacks with your sword, you also control the ice element practically to perfection, don't you?" Everyone's gaze fell on Lilith upon hearing these words, and remembering the battlefield 5 years ago, they unconsciously nodded in agreement with Valiant. Half a decade ago, a great battle was fought between the 8 factions of higher existences for the sake of taking control of a new world that had just entered the 5th stage of evolution, successfully becoming a higher world. This had been a very important battle, as the higher worlds could go for centuries and even several millennia without the appearance of one. Since it was impossible to reach an agreement and everyone wanted the treasures that the new world had to offer, the war was inevitable as always when it came to natural resources. That was the first war in which Lilith took part, as she had only been a member of the demonic army for 10 years. It was also in that battle that she earned the title of Bloody Succubus, which made countless beings tremble with fear when they heard it, and the survivors of that fierce and deadly war never wished to meet her again. Ironically, and despite the fact that she received the title of Bloody Succubus, most of the enemies that fell before Lilith did not drop even a drop of blood, as they were either completely frozen in ice statues or received mortal wounds that were sealed as soon as they appeared. At Valiant's question, Lilith's indifferent expression did not change at all and replied coldly, "So what with that?" This was only the 11th time they had all met Lilith, except for a few chance encounters as they roamed the universe. None of those present knew her too well, and she couldn't be said to be particularly close to anyone either. Valiant, on the other hand, was a veteran general in the demonic army, a dignified and mighty 7th order existence who had been with Lucifer almost from the moment the faction was established. The difference in status between the two women was huge, and if it was in the past, Lilith's arrogant words might have made some people angry. After all, it was a tactful rule that the new ones had to respect the old ones. This was so in the factions, and it was also so in the Earth jobs. It was just that the current Lilith possessed the qualifications to talk to Valiant as an equal. Although it was brief and lasted only a few moments, the battle of the soul between Lilith and Crow was more than enough for everyone to understand that not only was her charm and beauty impressive, but her soul power was of extremely high quality. Although they still weren't sure if she could really overcome a 7th order existence in combat with her 6th order power, it was undeniable that Lilith was a genius among geniuses and elite among elites. Since no one wanted to be on bad terms with someone like this, no one gave Lilith a bad face. Moreover, there were also a vast number of men present who were secretly in love or fascinated with Lilith. Valiant didn't seem to mind Lilith's tone either. Her expression and glance didn't change at all when she said in the same flat and neutral tone of voice as before, "No, it's not much. I was just wondering if you could show off your skill one more time for all of us to see. It's been roughly 5 or 6 years since the last time." Despite Valiant's words, everyone understood that she was suspicious of Lilith to some degree, and that was why she made such a request. However, some people looked at Valiant with weird eyes. "Are you suggesting that I am more powerful than His Majesty Lucifer?" A faint smile bloomed on Lilith's lips, and without waiting for a reply she said easily, "Well, I guess it doesn't matter anyway." Then, under the watchful eyes of all present, Lilith circulated her mana, and with a simple thought, a rune in her soul flashed brightly. The frost spread at the speed of light with her at its center, and before most could react, the entire hall had been frozen. The elegant floor had been sealed in deep black ice, the ceiling, the walls, the plants, decorations, the table, and even the chairs on which everyone were sitting, everything became ice statues without losing their shape. Excellent control over mana. Fire Sorrow couldn't help but praise, and a glint of appreciation shone in her eyes as she looked at Lilith. Lucifer lazily opened his previously closed eyes and murmured, "Just saying, but if the plants died, you'll have to give me more clothes." The corner of everyone's mouth twitched a couple of times when they heard their leader's clear murmur, but no one said anything about it. "Is that enough for you?" Lilith asked casually as she looked at Valiant. Wonderful magic." Valiant praised honestly. While Lilith's dark energy was there, the power behind her ice-like magic was completely different from the divine power exuded by the ice that had wiped out the world Petra and its inhabitants. Moreover, while the color was similar, that was all, similar but not the same. The color of magic could not be altered, so at the very least it was clear that Lilith had not done it herself, and Valiant's doubts flew out the window. "Valiant, isn't it clear that a firmament fragment was used?" Even His Majesty has said so. Hellscar bellowed aloud, why are you gunning against the bloody succubus? Are you jealous of her beauty? Chill, I prefer women like you. Valiant didn't even look at him and her expression didn't change at all. With a single thought from her, the black ice that sealed the entire room quickly receded, and in a few blinks of the eye everything had returned to normal. The warm temperature, the decorations, the plants, the table, the chair, everything was perfect as if nothing had happened. Seeing that not even a leaf of the plants inside the room was falling or damaged, a glint of disappointment flashed through Lucifer's eyes as he said quietly, what a pity. All right, you guys don't need to doubt the bloody succubus so much. Lucifer straightened himself in his seat with some difficulty and gently waved his hand as he said lazily, just as it could have been her it could also have been anyone inside or outside this room. Has your majesty figured anything out yet? Fire Sorrow seemed to notice something as she asked with a slight frown. Something like that. Lucifer nodded softly and said quietly, in a galaxy distant from this point, there is a constellation that is not visible from every point in the universe, unlike the vast majority. That constellation was named Ice Goddess because of how especially low the temperature is in that area of space, you can even see the frozen stardust. The gist of the matter here is that a few years ago that constellation was brimming with power, which suggested that the firmament fragment with the will of that existence was still there. However, not long ago, the constellation's power began to slowly decay. In other words, your majesty suggests that the culprit of the events that happened on the world Petra must have used the power left behind by the will of that existence. Crow inquired with a frown. If that's the case, then it's basically impossible to find out who the culprit was. Fire Sorrow sighed and gently rubbed her temples as she said, if the will left behind by that ice goddess or ice god possesses dark energy, then even the angels themselves could be the culprits of this. While it made no sense for the angels to destroy one of their worlds from which they obtained vast amounts of natural treasures every year, let alone slaughter their own just like that, what Fire Sorrow wanted to convey with her words was that literally, anyone could be the culprit. Lucifer nodded and then said with his eyes closed, so, no need to overthink it. This bullsh. That's not right. This meeting is simply for the purpose of calming the white-feathered ones down a bit. They themselves also know that our demonic army might not be the culprit and probably someone is trying to incriminate us. Bang. Hellscar finally couldn't help but hit the table hard. Fortunately, he restrained himself and this table had been forged using a treasure called Starstone which made it extremely sturdy, or else it would have collapsed immediately. Damn. He shouted out loud and the walls of the room shook, those fucking feathered bastards are really asking for it. Do they think we're scared of them and that they can intimidate us or what? Lucifer had already covered his ears the first moment he finished speaking as if he knew what was coming next. He looked with tired eyes at Hellscar and there were even slight dark circles under his eyes as if he hadn't slept for several nights. It's the opposite, you stupid ape. Fire Sorrow sighed and said in a complicated voice, it's because we're stronger than them that they try to give us some trouble and that's also why none of the other factions said anything despite the circumstances. Hellscar's face changed when he heard Fire Sorrow's words and instead of feeling proud at the fact that the current demonic army was more powerful than the Heaven's army he looked more gloomy than before. In fact, everyone seemed to have awakened from a dream and the look of the vast majority changed. Some for the worse, others simply sighed as they looked down at their own hands. Well, however it goes. Lucifer stood up and stretched his body, making his bones crack softly. This meeting ends here. All of you scram wherever you came from. Remember we will meet again in a few months. As everyone stood silently without saying a word, Lucifer seemed to think of something and said out of nowhere, bloody succubus, you stay in the castle. Fire Sorrow can probably give you a tip or two on a variety of stuff. Lilith frowned slightly for a second but the next instant she was back to normal. While she was an amazing talent, she was still relatively young and there were many things she still didn't know and many more in which she was inexperienced. Having an extremely powerful and experienced mage like Fire Sorrow whose age was at least a dozen millennia old would definitely be good for her growth. At the same time, Lilith could also take the opportunity to get more information about the universe to help that man who was currently far away on the small blue planet called Earth struggling hard to grow up quickly. Understood. Thanks in advance. Lilith nodded and bowed to Fire Sorrow before leaving the room as she thought about what Zeman might be doing and if he was missing her or not. Inside the hall, only Lucifer and Fire Sorrow stayed. Neither of them said anything and after a few minutes, Lucifer walked towards the huge window more than 20 meters high that overlooked the back of the castle. From there, he could see how Lilith was heading to the training ground that had been built with materials strong enough to withstand the attacks of the Seventh Order's existences for a certain period of time. These types of materials were rarities among rarities since as long as they were given time they could regenerate on their own. Your Majesty? Fire Sorrow inquired puzzled as she looked at the back of the lazy leader of the demonic army. Lucifer looked thoughtful as he stared at Lilith's seductive back and her shapely hips that swayed tantalizingly with every step she took. His eyes held not the slightest lust and his mind held not the slightest impure thought as he muttered under his breath, Fire Sorrow, how long has it been since the bloody succubus joined our faction? Fire Sorrow didn't understand the reason behind Lucifer's question but answered anyway, if this subordinate doesn't misremember, Lilith joined our demonic army a little less than a decade ago. Lucifer's head tilted to one side as if he was too sleepy and without energy to stand up straight. However, Fire Sorrow knew him well enough to know that while Lucifer appeared to be a lazy fool, anyone who underestimated him would not live to tell the tale. Approximately 10 years. Space rift. The weakening of the ice goddess constellation. The destruction of the world Petra. Hundreds of thoughts flashed simultaneously in Lucifer's head as he watched Lilith disappear beyond his line of sight. How could someone who reached his position, the position of a total supreme of the universe, be anyone normal? Lucifer was not only powerful, his intelligence was nothing to scoff at. Fire Sorrow, I want you to search around the world Petra, said the leader of the demonic army suddenly. Excuse me. Fire Sorrow looked at him blankly. If I'm not mistaken, there must be about 2 or 3 galaxies beyond the galaxy the world Petra is in and the soul record had not yet reached that area, Lucifer said in a lazy voice. Find out if the beings in those areas began to evolve or not. This. Oh okay. Fire Sorrow looked puzzled but in the end, nodded anyway. A leader's command was absolute command and Fire Sorrow really respected the man in front of her a lot. Therefore, even though she didn't quite understand what was going on, she decided to carry out the task. About Lilith. Teach the bloody succubus everything you know, Lucifer said calmly. The more the better. Don't hold back. With the bloody succubus talent, she will be able to become more powerful in a short time. After you finish training her, you can start with the task I just gave you. That's fine with me. However, there is something I don't understand, Your Majesty. I hope you can help me clarify my doubts. Fire Sorrow hesitated for a moment before making such a request. Tell me, Lucifer replied with laziness in his voice. You suspect Lilith? More than suspicious. I'd say I'm 90% confident that the destruction of the world Petra was caused by the bloody succubus. Lucifer said casually, his voice unaltered. Fire Sorrow's expression changed slightly as she heard this. After a moment of silence, she asked quietly, since Your Majesty is so sure, then why? You want to know the reason why I don't lock up the bloody succubus and force her to talk or something similar? Lucifer finished what she wanted to say. Yet. Well. Fire Sorrow nodded with a slight frown. Lucifer didn't answer right away and instead looked up at the sky. His bright emerald eyes focused on the two nearest stars that glowed red and orange like two suns. He seemed to be remembering or thinking of something far away. To be honest, it will be a pain in the ass to do anything against the bloody succubus. I'm afraid she might let the devil slip out. He said words that left Fire Sorrow even more confused than she already was. Release the devil? From what Fire Sorrow understood, Lucifer was the devil himself. Lucifer didn't give too much explanation either and instead said again in a sleepy voice, Go, Fire Sorrow. Also, if you find a race of humans on any of those worlds that started evolving recently, I want you to see if you find anything strange on any of them. I'm afraid that might take me some time. Fire Sorrow said with some mental exhaustion. Even if it was her, she could not cover such vast distances in such a short time, and carefully studying the races would take even longer. Even weeks or months would not necessarily be enough time for her. You just need to do it. If you find any anomalies, just inform me. You don't need to intervene or anything similar. Lucifer concluded before falling silent. Seeing him waving his hand as if dismissing her, Fire Sorrow bowed and walked away without another word. Lucifer remained silent in the same spot as his eyes flashed uncannily. Then, he took a step and stepped through a black portal, appearing in the middle of outer space. As he gazed into the emptiness before him, his lazy appearance disappeared for an instant. It only lasted a moment, but those eyes filled with sleepiness turned deadly serious and sharp as a mortal sword as he gazed into nothingness. Just like a joker, it can bring salvation or destruction. However, when the joker appears, the game is destined to end faster than planned. He muttered under his breath before his mouth fell open wide as a yawn escaped from what seemed to be his very soul. With tears of exhaustion in his eyes, he said quietly, well, whatever it may be, I plan to see it all through to the end. Lilith, that's an interesting name. Who cares, it's not like this has anything to do with me, and as long as things get a little more fun it will be enough. Ah, shit. So sleepy. Soon, all was silent in the place where one of the most powerful beings in history stood not so long ago was now empty once again. As she waited for Fire Sorrow to arrive in the training room, Lilith had no idea that Lucifer had practically seen right through her. While she was very smart, cunning, and her plans perfect, Lucifer was a monster who, despite his youthful appearance, had already lived hundreds of thousands of years. To him, she was literally a baby, and from the moment she joined the demonic army, something she had wanted to hide was seen by the leader of the faction. Fortunately, Lilith was right about one thing: Lucifer was not an overly controlling person. As long as he knew what was going on, he would be more than happy to watch everything from the side with his eyes narrowed due to his seemingly endless sleepiness. If it were any other faction leader of higher existences, she probably would have run into a lot of trouble, as they all always wanted stability and to have everything that happened under their control. Planet Earth, China. I finally have some free time. Bai Zimin scrubbed his hands impatiently as he pulled out various items he had stored away. Soon, his king-sized bed was filled with different shiny objects, scrolls, papers, stones, etc. Because of everything that had happened during the last few days, only now he had time to take a good look at his spoils of war after defeating the goblins. Although he already had a rough idea of what was to come, he had only just taken a quick glance at the items he had collected. Besides, looking at them inside the vehicle wasn't comfortable at all, so he didn't do it on the way back to the beginning village as well. Bai Zimin decided to do so now before finally capturing Baekun Camp once and for all. From now on, he would have to pick up the pace if he wanted to finish his breakthrough quest to Blood Mystic within the time limit. The first thing Bai Zimin did was to separate the treasures he had obtained for their type. The skill scrolls went to one side, the sheepskin scrolls went to another side, the soul stones to a different one from the previous two. Next, Bai Zimin separated the treasure orbs depending on their color. He had received treasure orbs of red, orange, yellow, and finally green, 4 different colors. Although most of them were red, his mood did not waver at all. It took him about 5 minutes to do all this. However, he was not finished yet, because after separating them by the type of treasure they were, Bai Zimin also had to separate them by their quality, just as he had done with the orbs. Starting with the soul stones, Bai Zimin separated them depending on whether they were unclassified, first order, or second order. Following the soul stones, he began to work with the skill scrolls. The total time it took him to do everything was roughly about 10 minutes. As he looked at the different mountains on his bed, he nodded in satisfaction. The origin of this chapter's debut can be traced to N0, Vel, B, J, N. While it seemed like what he was doing didn't have any meaning, in reality, that wasn't the case. By separating the spoils of war by the quality, he wouldn't have to go through the description and statistics of each treasure one by one too carefully, and could focus mainly on what he knew would be of use to him. After all, for the current Bai Zimin, a normal grade treasure was no longer of much use. As if to prove this point, he took one of the red-colored orbs and gently clenched it. A pair of gloves appeared in front of him, and as he took them in his hands he whispered softly, "Combat gloves, +8 strength. Can turn a normal punch into a killing punch." That was all. Even the description of the item was bland and indeed exaggerated. Bai Zimin shook his head and put down the normal grade gloves next to the red-colored orbs. Ignoring that pile of orbs, he focused on the much smaller amount of orange orbs, rare grade treasure orbs. The number of rare grade treasures was around 60. Compared to the approximately 180 normal grade treasures, the difference was remarkable. However, 60 rare grade treasures was a huge sum from the current Bai Zimin's point of view. If I had all these treasures at the beginning of the apocalypse, so many things would have been so much easier. He didn't know whether to feel good about himself or whether he should feel bad as he muttered such words. Clearing his mind of such meaningless thoughts, he began to break the orange treasure orbs one by one. Approximately a minute or two later, in front of Bai Zimin were 58 rare grade treasures. There were Xianyuan swords, there were triple bolt crossbows, there were compound bows, there were full coats, combat dresses, earth bracelet, blazing ring, etc. All of them granted around 20 and 30 stat points each, being the combat dresses and the full coats the ones that granted more stat points in total but only 5 points to each one. The other treasures such as Xianyuan swords and the like awarded points to a single stat or maybe two, but the quantity awarded was higher in comparison. What caught Bai Zimin's attention a bit was that he did not find items similar to his spiritual earring. Although it was also a rare grade treasure, it definitely had to be a rarity among its kind, since even after breaking open more than 50 orbs not even one appeared. All these treasures will be used to raise a new troop of soul evolvers. Bai Zimin decided the fate of all these normal and rare grade treasures right then and there. Unlike a nonsense monster like Bai Zimin, 99.9% of soul evolvers in his faction were just normal soldiers, of which 99% of them gained 2 stat points every time they leveled up, and that was all since they defeated only enemies of equal or lower level than them. What did this mean? Simple, they all had normal, average stats, with nothing to highlight. Simply put, treasures that increased plus 5 stat points were incredibly valuable to them, as it was no different than getting a boost of several levels on a hit. The only reason why Bai Zimin preferred to use forging equipment was because the defense granted by armor and the physical or magical attack power of weapons was far more useful to him than receiving 20 strength points or any other stat. After all, enemies of his level could not threaten him at all, and only those peak second order existences could, just maybe, represent some threat to him. As for rare treasures, these were, as the name implies, rarities. These types of treasures should not appear in large quantities. It was just that thanks to Bai Zimin being an anomaly, as Shang Guanbing Shui constantly referred to him, as well as Lilith, his faction and his subordinates could enjoy benefits that they normally could not. Bai Zimin estimated that the power of his troops would increase by no less than 200% when all these treasures were handed over. After finishing with the orange orbs, Bai Zimin moved on to the bright yellow orbs. 5 magic grade treasures. He murmured with enthusiasm in his voice. Magic grade treasures were of great help even to him. Although there were few opportunities so far where he had required their use, this was only because not many enemies that required the activation of such treasures had appeared. Bai Zimin estimated that perhaps only total peak second order or possibly third order existences could force him to have to make use of some external power in order to win. With 5 flashes of yellow light, 5 new objects appeared before his hopeful eyes. First, Bai Zimin picked up a jet black earring that caught his attention. The reason why this small object caught his attention more than the rest was because it somehow looked ominous and domineering. Then, he looked at the information in the object. Mystic earring, magical treasure grade when equipped, automatically increases the user's magic by plus 50 points. One time every 2 days you can use the attached skill Magic Blast. Magic Blast drains 95% of the mana remaining in the user's possession at the moment of activating Magic Blast and increases the magic stat by 8% equivalent to the absorbed mana. The magic attack power of your next attack increases in relation to the absorbed mana and the increase of the magic stat, where 200 points equal x1 the previous power and its maximum is x5. Bai Zimin's hand trembled slightly as he read the information from the small black earring and almost let it fall to the ground. Really powerful. Powerful and dangerous. Bai Zimin exclaimed to himself. The mystic earring was an object that could literally be called a double-edged sword. It was an item that possessed a skill that after being activated would immediately drain the user's mana reserves almost completely, thus leaving the user not only with a severe headache and feeling nauseous due to the sudden consumption, but would also cause the user to have just enough mana to activate 1 or maybe 2 other skills, even none at all depending on how much mana the earring user's mana reserve had. Imagine losing your ability to activate or sustain any skill in the middle of a death fight or in the middle of the battlefield. It wasn't much different than being dead. Unless you had an amazingly powerful physique that allowed you to fight as an equal against your enemies, you would definitely die. If in an online role-playing game you suddenly lost all your mana in the middle of a duel against another player, you would definitely lose the fight unless the difference between the two sides was big enough to ignore the damage the enemy's skills could inflict on you. Simple as that. However, in exchange for putting you in such a dangerous situation, the mystic earring would reward you with a tremendously powerful attack power. Bai Zimin thought of many ways to use this skill, and just imagining the outcome sent a massive shiver down his spine. I'd better be careful with this. He whispered with a hint of fear in his voice as he pierced his right ear. Now, both of his ears had earrings in them and there was no room for any more. While the soul record allowed 2 Xianyuan swords to be wielded at the same time, the increased stats would only be sent by one of the 2 swords. Still, the sharpness and lethality of the weapon would be there. However, 2 bracelets, earrings, or any other accessory of the same type would have no effect on the user. Also, for some reason, the soul record was actually similar to the systems that were often seen in video games. Simply put, Bai Zimin could not fill his ears with earrings even if he was willing to look like a punk, and he could not fill himself with necklaces or bracelets even if he was willing to look like a tribal chieftain. Just imagine it as if you had already used up all the equipment slots and your character's status window was full. Bai Zimin continued talking to himself, still not quite used to not having Lilith at his side to chat and joke with. Come to think of it, don't I have too many double-edged swords in my body? Bai Zimin's eyes widened wide at such a revelation. Gravity manipulation, blood berserker's wrath, the recently acquired mystic earring. At this rate, wouldn't he end up dying one day because of his own skills? Bai Zimin smiled bitterly at the thought of this and shook his head. Soon, Bai Zimin's attention was drawn to an object that, when he saw it, almost caused tears to fall from his eyes. So beautiful. So bright. So magnificent. He stretched out his trembling hands and then caressed them tenderly, almost sobbing with emotion. Boots. Finally he had gotten new boots. Even now, Bai Zeeman continued to wear the damn boots he had received in college. Normal grade treasure boots that barely boosted his agility by plus 10 points. Even if these boots only gave plus 5 more agility points, he would already be satisfied with that. Come on baby, make daddy happy. He said words that would probably get the attention of a certain succubus if she were present. Boots of Ending Sorrow, magic grade treasure when equipped, automatically increases agility by plus 25 points. Despite their extremely light and elegant appearance, they hide a very sad story behind them. One time every 7 days you can activate the skill Ending Sorrow Speed. Ending Sorrow Speed, for 50 minutes increases the user's agility by plus 100 points. As a consequence of the boost, the user will not be able to move its legs for 24 hours after the deactivation of the skill. Seeing the boost of plus 25 points of agility, Bai Zeeman was so happy that he wanted to scream. After all, it was a net gain of plus 15 points of agility once he replaced his current velocity boots. However, when he saw the fierce punishment for using the special skill of the boots, Bai Zeeman finally understood the reason behind the item's name. This made his urge to scream still there, but instead of wanting to scream out of joy, he wanted to scream out of anger. But when Bai Zeeman finished reading the item's information, his face froze and his lips moved on their own as he muttered, "Note, if the user's agility stat is higher than 500 natural points, the side effect of the skill Ending Sorrow Speed can be ignored." Bai Zeeman looked at his natural agility. 772. A big smile appeared on his face to the point where all his teeth shone under the glare of the sun coming through the window. Ha 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 ha. He finally put his hands on both sides of his waist and began to laugh as if he had lost his mind. From heaven to hell and then to heaven again. That was how he was feeling right now.